Chapter 30, Starless Void. Sunny was expecting to first look at the place where his arrival to the dream realm was going to take place from above, just like it had happened at the beginning of the first nightmare. Back then, time had magically moved in reverse, giving him an opportunity to see hints of what he was going to face. Instead, immediately after hearing the greetings of the spell, Sunny found himself blind and drowning. As he instinctively tried to open his mouth to scream, salty water rushed inside, making him choke and twitch. More than that, he couldn't see anything. No, it's not that he couldn't see, it's just there was no source of light around. Usually, darkness wasn't a problem for Sunny, but for some reason his sight wasn't working anymore. Maybe the seawater he was submerged in was blocking it. If it wasn't for the special space perception that the affinity to shadows gave him, he would have been completely disoriented. With its help, though, he barely managed to understand which side was down and which side was up. Luckily, Teacher Julius's lessons had included swimming. Swearing to thank both the old man and Master Jet once he came back, Sunny forced himself to stay calm and began to swim upward. In a few long and tense seconds, his head broke through the surface of the water. Sunny was finally able to draw in a deep, hoarse breath. Breathe, breathe, you're still alive. After sucking in enough air to soothe his burning lungs and compose himself to a certain degree, Sunny carefully spun in the water, trying to take in his surroundings. What met him was an endless jet-black expanse of undulating waves. Above them was an empty black sky. There was no moon, no stars, just a dark vastness of repressive nothingness. Sunny blinked a few times, cold dread taking hold of his heart. This is a sea, an ocean. Was I dropped in the middle of an ocean? No, it couldn't be. There had to be solid ground somewhere nearby. As he was gripped by a momentary panic, a remote sound suddenly drew his attention. Sunny turned around and saw a triangular dorsal fin moving in his direction. Luckily, it was still hundreds and hundreds of meters away. Wait, if it's so far away, then how come I can see it so clearly? Despite being submerged in water, Sunny still felt like there was suddenly cold sweat all over his body. By his estimation, that dorsal fin was at least 5 meters tall. It was rapidly approaching, growing visibly larger with each second. Damn you, spell. With eyes full of horror, Sunny spun again, desperately trying to find something, anything, to save him. And there, a short distance away, he finally noticed a black mass protruding slightly above the water. Not wasting even a second on thinking, he started to swing his arms and legs, swimming in the direction of the black mass with a considerable speed. However, no matter how fast he swam, the giant shadow of the unknown creature was closing the distance between them much faster. A small part of Sunny's mind managed to preserve its rationality even when faced with this boundless primal fear. Not allowing himself to slip entirely into panic, Sunny tried to think, and then silently commanded his own shadow to wrap itself around his body. Instantly, his speed increased twofold. Just seconds before the unknown colossus got to him, Sunny reached the black mass, stretched out his hands, and pulled himself out of the water. He rolled away from the edge, scratching his skin on the uneven rocks, and jumped in fright when the whole surface underneath him shuddered, as though something massive had collided with it. As Sunny backed out, terrifying jaws appeared from the water, with rows and rows of giant teeth, each one as long as he was tall. He opened his eyes wide, understanding that the rock he had climbed on was not tall enough to save him from the monster. Why is it even trying to eat me? I'm too small to be considered a filling snack for something this enormous. However, before the monster had a chance to attack, a colossal tentacle suddenly broke through the water and rose into the air like some strange black tower. Before too long, it fell down, entangling the owner of the giant maw and pulling it back under the water. Sunny lost the feeling in his legs and plopped on the ground, his mouth opened. His whole body was shaking. A few seconds later, the dark sea was calm again, as though nothing has happened. The indifferent waves continued to move silently under the lightless sky. So it wasn't trying to eat me, he realized, frozen. It was trying to run away. A few minutes later, Sunny was pretty sure that nothing was going to devour him, at least not immediately. With that certainty, he was finally in a state of mind to stop trembling and explore his surroundings a little. Black mass he climbed onto turned out to be a single stone platform of around 12 meters in diameter. Its surface was mostly flat, covered with grooves and somewhat dry. Due to the regular shape of its edges, it seemed more like something man-made than a natural formation. But then again, here in the dream realm, it was hard to be sure that something man-made was actually made by humans, as opposed to. Better not to think about it. The platform wasn't connected to anything, existing as a tiny island in the sea of darkness. There wasn't anything else above the water for as far as Sunny was able to see. After discovering that fact, he also realized something else. It was that he was wet, cold, and completely naked. Oh. In his defense, the clothing situation was the last thing one would think about when trying to save themselves from abyssal monsters. Also, it's not like someone was here to witness his stark paleness and private bits. Still, it was sort of cold. Sunny summoned the puppeteer's shroud and watched as dark gray garments covered his body. It even came with a pair of high, soft-soled leather boots. Clad in gray fabric and lusterless leather, he suddenly felt much safer. Not to mention warm. After that, Sunny sat down in the middle of the platform, as far away from water as he could, and tried to remember the unique characteristic of every explored region of the dream realm he could think of. Unfortunately, none of them matched this starless, dark void. Of course not, he thought with a bit of resentment. Even if some unlucky humans had ever come here, I doubt that they were able to return to the real world alive. Not with those things hiding underwater. Not yet desperate enough to leave the platform and try to swim away in search of land, Sunny decided to wait and see. Maybe something was going to change as time went by. With a soft sigh, he habitually looked for his shadow. However, due to the total darkness that surrounded him, it couldn't really be seen. He just barely felt its presence. This must be a paradise for you, right? All this gloom and not a star in sight. The shadow, of course, did not answer. Anyway, good job earlier. With a nod, Sunny lay down, using his hands as a pillow. Not thinking about much, he stared into the black sky and waited. The sound of the undulating waves was, actually, quite relaxing. After a while, he closed his eyes and listened. Minutes merged together, growing into hours. Suddenly, Sunny caught a slight change in the sound of the sea. It was as though something was shifting. He opened his eyes and noticed that one corner of the sky was slowly turning gray. Soon, a glimpse of a pale sun could be seen rising above the horizon. A new day had come to the starless void. And with it, the dark sea suddenly surged. Chapter 31, Low tide. The black, opaque water suddenly surged and seethed, as though a living creature desperately trying to avoid the pale light of the coming dawn. Sunny slowly rose and, after some thought, carefully approached the edge of the stone platform. Looking down, he blinked, and then kneeled to make sure that what he saw wasn't an illusion. The sea seemed to be receding. Slowly at first, and then faster and faster, the water level was dropping. The circular stone formation he had been taking shelter on used to barely protrude out of the waves, but now there were meters and meters of wet rock between him and the restless surface of the sea. As the sun climbed up, the monstrous ebb tide continued. Soon, Sunny found himself standing on the edge of a tall cliff, with a 100-meter drop separating him from the churning waters. Beneath him, the rock formation broadened and changed shape. However, from his vantage point, it was hard to determine what that shape was exactly. At that time, the dark surface of the water began to be punctured here and there by sharp crimson blades. As it dropped even further, it was as though a crimson forest was slowly rising from the black depths. The trees were made of something resembling coral, growing chaotically into each other and stretching toward the sky. They were colossal in size, with irregular protrusions entwining and merging together, looking monumental and eerie in the black and red reality of the sunlit void. The labyrinth formed by this strange reef stretched as far as Sunny could see, broken here and there by protruding cliffs, sudden chasms, and distant natural features. Half an hour later, utterly shocked, Sunny stared down and realized that the sea was completely gone. If not for the black seaweed left hanging on wet rocks and scarlet pillars of coral, he would even doubt if it was ever there. The small circular island had turned into the peak of a strange, towering, irregularly shaped cliff. Looking down, he felt his head spinning. By then, the night had already fully retreated, letting morning finally take its place. I'm not seeing things, am I? Sunny thought, pinching himself. What the spell was that? Despite the sudden disappearance of the dark sea and its hidden monsters, Sunny was in no rush to climb down from his circular stone platform. Firstly, he felt that if the sea was able to disappear, it was surely able to come back, perhaps at any moment. Secondly, he did not know what dangers the coral labyrinth was hiding. Perhaps there was something even scarier than the owner of the giant tentacle down there. But that did not mean that he wasn't going to explore. Coming back to his spot in the middle of the platform, Sunny sat down and commanded his shadow to separate itself from his body. Then, taking control of it, he approached the edge of the platform and nimbly slid down. Habitually moving from one shadow to another, he began the descent. At this moment, Sunny was glad that shadows had no weight and were not affected by gravity. While the shadow was busy climbing down, Sunny yawned. Say, don't you think that you need a name? Although his shadow was already too far away to hear him, they still could communicate through their shared connection. Of course, the fact that it could did not mean that it would. The shadow was sort of taciturn, mostly because it didn't have vocal cords and was unable to speak. Plus, its temper wasn't that great. How about shameless? No. What about shady? Also no. And what about something simpler like what? Well, do you have suggestions then? All right, we'll shelve this conversation for later. By the time he was done with this short monologue, the shadow had already reached the bottom of the cliff. The range of shadow control was not limitless, but it was just barely enough to explore their nearest surroundings. Entering the labyrinth, Sunny found it to be extremely disorienting and convoluted. The paths between coral pillars were sometimes broad, sometimes narrow. They twisted and turned without any logic, often leading to dead ends or even back to where he started. More than that, some paths entered inside the coral mounds, turning into dark tunnels. Labyrinth was vast and multi-layered, making Sunny's head hurt after multiple fruitless attempts to memorize the layout of the nearest pathways. In the end, he sent the shadow up, forcing it to climb on top of the crimson forest and start jumping from one sharp coral blade to another, knowing full well that he himself would not be able to do the same. Soon he circled the strange cliff and froze, scared by the sight of what was happening in its shadow. There the corpse of the giant shark-like creature that had briefly pursued him the previous night was laying on the ground, the pillars of coral around it shattered and broken. More precisely, half of it was there, with grotesque innards spilling out of the terrible wound and stretching far away into the distance. The other half was gone, as though it had never existed. Round the corpse, hundreds of smaller monsters were scurrying, tearing away and devouring its flesh bit by bit. Each of them was about 2.5 meters tall, looking like a weird mix of a demonic crab, a centaur, and a nightmare. It had 4 pairs of long, segmented legs that ended in side-like protrusions. At the front, a human-like torso was protruding from the carapace, also clad in thick chitinous armor. The head, if it was even the appropriate word, was situated directly on top of the torso, with no neck in between. It had 2 narrow eye slits and a viscous-looking mouth with several slimy mandibles. Instead of hands, the monsters had 2 enormous pincers. Currently, they were all using those pincers to tear off chunks of meat off the desiccated corpse and stuff them into their mouths. From time to time, a fight for an especially juicy piece of meat would break out, ending up in a few monsters being torn apart and quickly devoured by the victors. Sunny swallowed, both because the sight of heavily armored, powerful monsters made him nervous, and because looking at them feasting, he suddenly felt very hungry. Each of them seems like trouble, and there are hundreds of them. His luck, like always, was awful. At least I don't have to wonder why the labyrinth feels so empty. All the inhabitants are having a party. Feeling a little bit comprehensive about turning his shadows back to the monsters, Sunny commanded it to look back and study the cliff he was taking shelter atop of. Something about it was making him feel uneasy. The shadow turned around and looked up, taking in the sight of the strangely shaped cliff. It took Sunny a few minutes to shift his perspective and recognize it for what it was. That's a finger, that's a hand, that is a sword. He blinked. It's a statue. Indeed, the cliff was man-made. It was an ancient, colossal statue at least 200 meters tall. The scale of it was so massive that it boggled the mind. From what Sunny could see, it depicted a knight clad in an elaborate plate armor, with 7 shining stars carved into his breastplate. In his hands he was holding a gargantuan sword, pointing it to the ground. However, the most striking thing about it was that the giant stone knight was missing his head. In fact, the roughly circular platform Sunny was standing on turned out to be the top of his neck, and by the looks of it, the head wasn't missing by design. It was as though something or someone had violently tore it off at some point in the distant past. Sunny walked around the platform, looking down from all sides, but didn't notice the head lying anywhere near. What on earth is this place? Without any hints to find the answer, he led his shadow back to the giant's neck and settled at the western edge of it, studying the feasting monsters. He didn't move until the sun was about to set. Just as Sunny expected, as soon as the sun touched the horizon, a deafening rumble could be heard coming from somewhere below. The monsters instantly stopped their feast and scurried away, some hiding inside the coral pillars, some simply burying themselves in the soft soil. A few minutes later, the first streams of black water appeared in the labyrinth. Their volume quickly grew, and soon an apocalyptic flood devoured everything around. The sea was returning with the approach of the night. Sunny stared at this unimaginable process, thoughts churning in his head. In an hour, the circular platform was the only thing above the dark waters once again. Chapter 32, Making a Choice with an Empty Stomach and a Head Full of Thoughts, Sunny returned to the center of the platform and sat down. After a while, he beckoned to his shadow and said, "Wake me up if anything happens." Then he closed his eyes and tried to fall asleep. His consciousness quickly slid into the sweet embrace of darkness, giving Sunny some well-needed rest. In the middle of the night, however, a sudden impulse stirred him awake. Sunny jumped to his feet, his groggy mind full of tense apprehension. He was afraid that the owner of the giant tentacle had come back to finish the job. Or maybe some other horror from the depths had sensed him and decided to snack on human meat. However, the sea was quiet and calm. He didn't hear any abnormalities around the knight's statue. "What is it?" Sunny whispered, addressing the shadow. The shadow silently pointed him in a particular direction. Turning his head, Sunny squinted. He quickly understood why it was a good idea to wake up. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to see. Out there in the distance, a few kilometers away, a small orange light was shimmering in the darkness. Its reflections were rising and falling with the movement of waves. It was too far away to make out any details, so Sunny just stared at it for a while. Pretty soon, the light disappeared. Other sleepers, natural phenomenon, or some monster laying a trap. Memories of nightmarish deepwater creatures immediately came to his mind. Shaking his head, Sunny lay back down and attempted to return to his slumber. However, this time sleep was escaping him. Pangs of hunger were still not unbearable, but slowly becoming more and more intense. The thirst, however, was worse. In the end, he remained awake up until the sun rose again, sending the dark sea in retreat. As soon as the morning came, the pincer monsters crawled back from their hiding spots and rushed to the giant carcass to continue their feast. Sunny watched them for some time and then walked to the opposite side of the platform to take a look in the direction where he had seen the mysterious light the previous night. At a considerable distance from the headless statue, 5 or 6 kilometers away, the ground rose naturally and formed something akin to a hill. On top of that hill, an especially massive coral pillar rose to the sky. From the looks of it, its upper branches were just high enough to stay above water in the night. Various ideas stormed into Sunny's head, but at the end of it, only 2 questions were really important. First of all, would he be able to find the way through the labyrinth and cover that distance during the day? And more importantly, should he even attempt to do it? After all, there was no indication that the source of the mysterious light was something beneficial, as opposed to dreadful and deadly. Not having enough information to make a choice, Sunny settled back to study the monsters. He did, however, send the shadow to investigate as far into the labyrinth as the range of shadow control allowed, hoping to chart at least the beginning of the path that could potentially lead him to that hill. Logically speaking, he was as safe atop the headless statue as he probably could be in this strange place. The only problem was, he was going to die soon because of thirst or hunger. Both problems were solvable if he were to venture down. He could desalinate the seawater in a number of ways taught to him by teacher Julius, with materials that were present pretty much everywhere in the dream realm. He could also prepare traps and hunt a pincer monster to eat. With their massive size, just one of them would be enough to feed him for weeks. He could easily see such a routine, hunting by day, returning to the statue at the approach of the night. It was probably his safest choice. However, this way of doing things lacked one vital element, the potential for improvement. It was well suited for keeping Sunny alive, but had no way of giving him hope. If he was destined to spend the rest of his life in the small area surrounding the headless statue, devouring monsters and trembling at night in fear of being devoured by something bigger in turn, well, he would rather just jump down and end it right now. That pretty much meant that the only choice left for him was to try and reach the source of the orange light, and if Sunny was really trying to attempt it, he had to do it before the pincer monsters were done consuming the giant carcass. That way, at least, the surrounding segment of the labyrinth was going to be free of them. Firm in his choice, Sunny decided to leave the headless statue the next morning. He would spend the rest of today exploring paths through the labyrinth and preparing himself mentally. With that, he closed his eyes and concentrated his perception on the moving shadow. In the night, a sudden storm descended upon the dark sea. Sunny was stirred awake by the shadow in time to prepare himself for the crushing winds and the pelting rain. Usually, rain always put him in a bad mood, but this time he was too thirsty to think about anything except for fresh water. Staying low so as to not be blown over the edge of the platform, Sunny cupped his hands and waited until they became filled with rainwater. Then he raised them to his mouth and greedily drank. Strikes of lightning illuminated everything above the churning sea. If anyone were to see Sunny now, they would have noticed a wide grin on his face. The storm continued to rampage for several hours. Sunny crouched in the middle of the platform, enduring its rage. More than once, a tall wave would crash into the headless knight's neck, threatening to wash him away. But Sunny held tight to the deep grooves in the stone surface of the platform, sticking to it like glue. By morning, when the storm finally dissipated, all of his muscles were sore. But there was no time to waste. As soon as the monsters came back to the carcass, with a few stragglers quickly following behind, he slid over the edge of the platform and began to nimbly climb down. Sunny had to thank wilderness survival classes once again, since he had been taught the basics of rock climbing as well. Teacher Julius was adamant about giving his student a crash course in all possible forms of traversal. Additionally, Sunny had already scouted the optimal way down and memorized the best holds and indentions to grab onto with the help of his shadow. Soon his feet finally touched the ground. Despite the fact that leaving the safety of the headless statue was going to put him in considerable danger, Sunny instantly felt his mood improving. Remaining passive for the last couple of days did not suit his character well. Now, even if his plan were to end in failure, at least he was going to go down doing something that he had decided to do. Trying and failing was better than not trying at all. Black mud was deep enough to slow him down, but not to the extent he had been afraid of. With some practice, Sunny was soon able to walk at an acceptable speed. What's more, as long as he stuck to the shadows, his steps were light and silent, producing no squelching noises from the mud. He headed for one of the paths that were supposed to lead him to the distant hill and entered the cool shade of the crimson labyrinth. Immediately, a strange feeling enveloped his mind. It was as though the world beyond the labyrinth did not exist anymore, and all that was left were its twisting, dark paths. This thing almost seems endless. Shaking his head, Sunny sent the shadow to scout ahead, hoping to be notified of any latent danger in advance, and began to move forward. His life now depended on whether or not he would reach the distant hill before the sun began to set. He didn't even want to think about what would happen if he were still inside the labyrinth once the dark sea came back in an unstoppable flood. Shadow moved ahead of him, not meeting any hurdles. Sometimes it would climb high to scout the direction of different paths, allowing Sunny to choose the optimal route most of the time. However, he still had to backtrack a considerable distance once or twice, ending up either in a dead end or on a path leading in the wrong direction. Despite that, everything seemed to be going smoothly. Sunny even had time to carefully study the interior of the labyrinth, noticing more details of its composition, as well as a frightening amount of unrecognizable bones hiding in the mud beneath his feet. Because of how well things were going, he lowered his guard a little. His arrogance was also to blame. With his extensive preparations and skillful control of the Shadow Scout, Sunny subconsciously patted himself on the shoulder and assumed that everything was going to be fine. That's why when the mud directly in front of him started to move, he was a fraction of a second late to react. In the next moment, a massive pincer shot out of the ground and tore through the air, threatening to cut his body in half with one crushing strike. Chapter 33, Carapace Scavenger Crap. This was the only thought in Sunny's head as he awkwardly fell backward, allowing the pincer to close right in front of his face with a loud clack. The jagged, chitinous blades were so close that he could clearly see bits of mud sticking to their surface. Sunny landed on his back, narrowly avoiding the unexpected strike. The good thing was that he managed to avoid being injured or even killed. The bad thing was that he was sprawled on the ground, unable to quickly create distance between him and the attacker. The massive pincer was still hovering above. Just as this realization dawned on Sunny, he desperately rolled to the side. In the next moment, the pincer lunged down, sending small tremors through the mud. If not for his quick reaction, Sunny's chest would have been caved in by that blow. He was just beginning to stand up when the pincer swiped sideways. Luckily, Sunny was ready. Instead of trying to dodge or block the attack, he went with it, letting the pincer collide with his outstretched hands and cushioning the blow. As his arms screamed in pain, Sunny used the force of the blow and allowed his body to be sent flying through the air. This way, at least, he would get out of the pincer's range. He might not have been taught how to fight, but one thing he knew very well was how to fall. Instead of breaking his neck or having the breath beaten out of him by the landing, he braced his body and nimbly rolled before stopping some distance away from the ambushing monster. I take it back, Sunny, though, remembering his sarcastic critique of heroes' battle rolls. Rolling is an integral part of any respectable monster fighting technique. Then he looked up, trying to ascertain the situation. In front of him, the attacker had finally shown itself. It burrowed from under the mud, casting a vast shadow over kneeling Sunny. Its tiny eyes were full of rage, hunger, and malice. It was one of the pincer monsters he had spent so much time observing. Towering over him at almost 3 meters in height, the bulky creature moved its mandibles and produced a jarring, piercing screech. Why aren't you devouring the giant carcass with the rest of your buddies, you crab bastard? However, the answer to Sunny's indignant plea was rather obvious. The monster seemed to be in a rather bad shape. Half of its 8 side-like legs were broken, and there were cracks in its thick carapace, each oozing with viscous azure blood. Additionally, he was missing one of its 2 pincer arms, which seemed to have been torn off entirely at the shoulder. If not for this pathetic state, the creature would have had no need to hide in the mud, hoping to catch easy prey. It could have just followed the other monsters and joined on the feast. Sunny was just unlucky to stumble directly upon its ambush. He had relied too much on the scouting abilities of his shadow, forgetting that it wasn't much more observant than an awakened human. It was also weightless and inaudible. That's why the monster did not react when the shadow had passed over its trap a minute earlier. On the other hand, Sunny could also consider himself lucky. By the same logic, he would not have been able to dodge the creature's sudden attack if not for its crippled, slowed state. But pondering on his luck could wait for later. Right now, Sunny had a far more pressing thing to do, namely try to survive. Get back here, he ordered the shadow and jumped to the side. In the next second, the space he occupied a moment before was torn apart by the attacking monster. Its heavy pincer crashed into the side of a coral pillar, sending crimson shards flying in every direction. Sunny caught his balance and continued moving. He was hoping that the bulky, heavily armored, wounded creature would not be able to match his speed, but unfortunately it turned out to be surprisingly agile. Its side-like legs pierced the mud behind him, and the pincer was already flying through the air again, threatening to decapitate the young man at any second. Sunny ducked, dodging the pincer, and finally caught a second of reprieve. His eyes darted around, desperately searching for something to use as a weapon. Almost instantly, he noticed a long, smooth, sharp bone left behind by some unknown creature sticking from the mud. Without slowing down, he bent down and grabbed the bone, pulling it out with one forceful tug. The bone was almost 1.5 meters long, ending in a narrow, sharp tip. It was almost like a spear. The problem was, even with the added length of this makeshift spear, Sunny's range of attack was still shorter than the monster's. He also doubted that it was capable of piercing the hard carapace. In short, he had to get close and aim for one of the cracks in the creature's armor. However, he didn't dare to. At that short of a distance, the monster could easily crush him into a paste by using just its weight and hulking frame. A crazy idea entered Sunny's mind. Bit shocked, he momentarily couldn't decide whether it was the product of audacity or foolishness. Either way, he wasn't insane enough to actually consider it. At that moment, the pincer lashed out again. This time, Sunny was a little late to evade, and as a result, a sharp pain pierced his left leg. It was grazed by the edge of the pincer. The puppeteer's shroud held, not allowing the monster to draw blood, but the force of the impact was enough to throw Sunny tumbling to the ground. There was no time to recover. As his eyes opened wide, Sunny understood that it was time to act crazy. So instead of trying to dodge, he stopped moving and allowed the monster to grab him across his torso with the pincer. Immediately, a terrible pressure descended on his ribs. Sunny felt as though he was going to be split apart, but his armor, received from defeating an awakened tyrant, resisted the crushing bite of the monster's pincer. Every muscle in his body tensed, delaying the moment when his insides would be turned into mush. In the next second, Sunny's shadow fell from above, wrapping itself around the puppeteer's shroud. With the protective properties of the armor enhanced, he was able to better resist the pincer's pulverizing embrace. Sunny and the monster appeared to be at an impasse. The young man couldn't free himself from the monster's grip, while the monster could not kill the prey by cutting it in halves with its pincer. They stared at each other, then an insane fire ignited in the creature's eyes. It clicked its mandibles and raised Sunny in the air, bringing him closer to its mouth, obviously intent on biting his head off. "Why is everyone trying to eat me? Am I that tasty?" Sunny didn't struggle as the monster brought him close to its mandibles. He knew he only had one chance to live. In the last moment, Sunny allowed the shadow to flow from Puppeteer's shroud onto the sharp bone he was still clenching in his hand. Then, he gathered all his strength, leaned forward and thrust the bone forward with as much power as he could. Guided by his hand, the dark bone spear shot forward and pierced through the creature's tiny eye, sinking in deep. The other eye of the monster narrowed. Gritting his teeth from the unbearable pain in his ribs, Sunny twisted the bone, trying to do as much damage to the creature's brain as possible. For a couple of seconds, nothing happened. Then, he felt the pressure on his body diminishing. The pincer opened, letting Sunny fall down. As he hit the mood, the hulking monster crashed to the ground too. The bone spear was still sticking from its head, bathed in the streams of azure liquid. Sunny moaned and drew in a raspy, painful breath. "You have slain an awakened beast, carapace scavenger. You have received a memory, azure blade. Your shadow grows stronger." Chapter 34. Only Steel remembers. Sunny was sprawled in the mud, trying to catch his breath. The subtle voice of the spell echoed in his ears. "Your shadow grows stronger." Immediately, he felt a slight change. His body grew a little bit stronger, his vision a little sharper, his skin a little smoother. The change was minimal but apparent. What was that? He had a guess, and it was easy to confirm. Sunny summoned the runes. Shadow fragments, 14,000. Previously, he only had 12 of the mysterious shadow fragments, with no knowledge on how to acquire more. Now it seemed that the process was automatic. He only had to kill an enemy to absorb a part of their shadow and enhance his own core. More than that, the number of fragments he was able to receive wasn't directly correlated to the number of slain enemies. After a bit of thinking, Sunny came to a preliminary conclusion. Dormant soul cores gave him 1 fragment, while awakened ones gave 2. However, only enemies he defeated directly, more or less, counted. Ling the Mountain King's larva, a dormant beast, had given him 1 shadow fragment, finishing off the veteran slaver, a dormant human, another. Mountain King itself was an awakened tyrant, which meant that it had 5 awakened cores. With each giving Sunny 2 shadow fragments, he ended up with a total of 12. And now, after killing the carapace scavenger, he had 14. Interestingly, he didn't receive any fragments from the deaths of Shifty, Scholar, and Hero, even though they perished as a result of his machinations. It seems he had to finish an enemy off with his own 2 hands to absorb a part of their shadow. Well, or at least by summoning an ancient dead god. The process was quite similar to how normal awakened increased their power, with the only difference being that the steps of extracting and consuming the corresponding material, soul shards, were skipped in favor of instant absorption. That meant that shadow fragments could not be stored, and subsequently could not be bought or traded. He won't have an opportunity to receive them as a reward for completing missions, providing services, or selling various spoils. If Sunny wanted to grow stronger, his only option was to fight and kill. No peaceful life for me, I guess. Previously, Sunny thought that he at least had the choice to choose a relatively safe path. Many awakened never left the confines of human citadels and never faced nightmare creatures, choosing instead to perform various jobs in the dream realm, just as they would in the real world. They received payments in the form of soul shards, which were simultaneously the fuel of one's progression and the universal currency inside the citadels. Sunny was never set on pursuing such a life, but not even having a choice was sort of irritating. Luckily, there was a bright side too. Without the need to use soul shards to strengthen his core, he would be able to spend everything he earns freely and without concern. After all, after he kills an enemy and absorbs the shadow fragments, the soul shard would still be there, ready to be collected and exchanged for something Sunny might need in the future. That would effectively make him twice as efficient in terms of earning and spending, which was not a small advantage. Additionally, there was the matter of the shadow core. Since both Sunny and his shadow were tied to it, strengthening the core would not only increase Sunny's power, but also enhance the shadow. So if he were to use it to further empower himself, the actual effect would be stacked, producing a 2-fold enhancement. so for each shadow fragment he collected, Sunny would actually be able to rip twice as much benefit as an awakened would from a soul shard. Not bad at all. Ah, the future was bright, provided he survives and gets the opportunity to even have a future, of course. Sitting up, Sunny moved his eyes and found the cluster of runes describing his memories. Azure Blade, had he finally gotten a weapon. Memory Azure Blade. Memory rank awakened. Memory type weapon. Memory description, on this forgotten shore, only steel remembers. Oh, interesting. Not very informative, but interesting. Sunny summoned his new weapon and a sharp, light sword immediately appeared in his hand. It was about a meter long, including the handle. The blade was straight and single-edged, ending in an angular tip. It was forged out of azure steel with a beautiful layered pattern. Deep inside the steel, white sparks could be seen. The crossguard was minimalistic and simple, offering almost no protection to the wielder's hands. If Sunny knew his way around cold weapons, he would have called it a Tang Dao. However, he had no idea about such things. All he could gather was that the blade was single-edged, which meant that it was probably meant for slashing and cutting as opposed to piercing, and that the handle was long enough to accommodate two hands. Also, the sword was pretty. He summoned the shadow and made it wrap itself around the azure blade. Immediately, the steel became bluish-black with a scattering of white sparks. It looked like a starlit night sky. Sunny stood up and waved the sword a couple of times, getting accustomed to its weight. The sharp edge whistled as it cut the air. Well, now I finally look like a real awakened. After that, he cast a gaze at the corpse of the carapace scavenger and grimaced. This part was not going to be pleasant. After some time, he managed to break open the cracked carapace and cut away a few strips of tender, pink meat. He also did not forget to extract the radiant crystal from the beast's chest, the soul shard. Without much hope, he tried to absorb the shard, remembering how it was supposed to be done. Just as he expected, nothing happened. They're really of no direct use to me. With a shrug, Sunny places the shard and the meat in a makeshift rucksack he weaved from black seaweed and looked at the sun. Day was still young. He still had a good chance of making it to the distant hill before the sea came back. However, his left leg was banged up in the fight with the scavenger beast, so walking wasn't as easy as it was before. He gritted his teeth and began limping. Hours passed. Due to his bruises and increased vigilance, Sunny's progress slowed down considerably. He was sweating and grinding his teeth, feeling pain with each step. What's worse, the further he reached into the labyrinth, the more confusing and entangled the paths became. Even with the shadow's help, he constantly had to backtrack and struggled to move in the right direction. Crab. If nothing changed, Sunny would not reach his goal, which meant that he'll be crushed to death by the returning sea. Not allowing himself to think about dying, Sunny tried to walk faster. However, he couldn't be too hasty. Making a wrong turn would have taken precious minutes away from him, so he had to choose the way carefully. Additionally, missing to notice another ambush could end his life directly. Curses. Just when he was beginning to feel desperate, his shadow suddenly saw something that momentarily sent Sunny into a stupor. Some distance further down the path, beyond a few turns, the corals widened, creating a small clearing, and in the middle of that clearing, someone was walking across the mud. First thing Sunny saw was fair skin, a lot of skin. The tall, lithe girl was only dressed in a makeshift skirt and a crude brassiere, both made out of seaweed. However, it didn't seem to bother her. With a calm expression, she stopped and looked back. The wind was playing with her short silver hair. It was Nephi's, the changing star. In one hand, she was holding the end of a strange, golden rope. And on the other end of the rope, Kasha, the blind girl, was carefully following behind. Chapter 35, a shadow, a star and an oracle gray sky above, black mud below, an endless sea of crimson in between. On this dreamlike backdrop, two beautiful girls were walking across the labyrinth. One was delicate and fragile, with blonde hair and cerulean, aimless eyes. She was dressed in a simple tunic, with leather sandals on her feet and a cloak the color of sea waves draped around her shoulders. The other was tall and lithe. She had silky silver hair and clear gray eyes. Her revealing clothes were crudely made out of black seaweed, leaving her fair skin and athletic build exposed. She was poised, alert, and barefoot. A golden rope connected two girls together. Wow, what a sight, Sunny thought. He suddenly regretted that he was not an artist. The picture just begged to be made into a painting. Wait, why am I thinking about that? I found people. His heart skipped a bit. If Nephi's and Kasha were here, then the orange light from before, most likely, had something to do with them, which meant that they knew how to get to the tall hill. Which meant that Sunny didn't have to be crushed to death by the high tide. So what do I do now? He wasn't the best at ingratiating himself to other people. In fact, he was the polar opposite. People usually instinctively avoided him, and that was in normal circumstances. This time, however, he had spent a whole of 4 weeks making sure that everyone in the academy hated his guts. Good job, Sunny. Still, he was at least useful. In this situation, an additional body was already a great boon when facing hungry monsters. And he wasn't just anyone. His ability to scout ahead alone was worth a lot. Surely they'll understand that, right? With a heavy sigh, Sunny stepped into shadows and hurried to the clearing. He reached it in a minute or so, hiding and observing the two girls before making a final decision. Helping herself with the wooden staff, blind Kasha slowly approached the middle of the clearing and extended her hand, finding Nephi's and touching her on the shoulder. "Why did you stop?" Nephi supported the blind girl and glanced at the sky. "It's getting late." An awkward pause hung between two girls. After some time, Kasha asked, "So you think we should turn back?" Nephi's blinked and cleared her throat. "Yes." Sunny was a bit amused by their exchange. "What is she, a strong, silent type?" Then he returned to his dilemma and grimaced. "How do I approach them? Damn, why is this so hard? It's not like I'm trying to ask them out on a date. I mean one of them, both of them. What am I thinking about? Just go and say hi." But then if he suddenly appeared out of the shadows, not at all like a creep, how high was the probability of them getting spooked and attacking him before noticing that he was not a monster? Wait, why would they arg? To hell with this. Deciding on the safest approach, Sunny commanded his shadow to abandon its hiding place and move to a spot where Nephi's could clearly see it. He could clearly sense the shadow rolling its eyes as it obeyed the order. As soon as the shadow started to move, Nephi suddenly snapped her hand sideways. Immediately, a long sword appeared in it, cutting the air as it assumed a defensive position. Before the shadow could even take 2 steps out of its hiding spot, it was already pierced by Changing Star's gray eyes. The shadow froze, it seemed a bit startled. Kasha took a step back. "Neph, what is it?" Nephi's didn't answer immediately, carefully observing the shadow. Then she simply said, "There's a shadow." Kasha's doll-like face paled. "A shadow, scavengers." The tall girl tilted her head a little. "No, it's a human shadow." This was clearly not what Kasha expected to hear. With an expression of surprise, she asked, "A human shadow, what is it doing?" Nephi's hesitated. After a while, she answered in a flat tone, "It's waving at us." After a whole minute of silence, Kasha finally found the words to react. "What?" "I said it's waving." "Yes, I know, I mean, why is it doing that?" Nephi's opened her mouth, then closed it again. "I don't know, maybe it's a distraction to lure us into a trap." At this point, Sunny decided that it was time to talk. He inhaled deeply, then said in a friendly tone, "Actually, I just sent it ahead to make sure that you don't stab me with that sword, before realizing that I'm human." Immediately, Nephi's turned her head, pinpointing the exact location where Sunny was hiding in a blotch of shadows. Her sword slightly shifted, aiming at the new threat. "If you're human, why are hiding in the shadows like a creep?" "God admit I'm not a creep." Sunny shoked, but his flaw was merciless. He had to provide an answer, and a truthful one at that. "I mean you're Changing Star, Nephi's. To be honest, I'm a little afraid." Nephi's did not answer. Because of her hard-to-read face, it was almost impossible to determine whether she believed him or not. However, he included her true name in his answer for a reason. If he was some monster pretending to be human, he wouldn't have known it. Luckily, Kasha was more expressive. "Are you the boy who sat with me in the cafeteria?" Sunny smiled. Meanwhile, Nephi's glanced at the blind girl. "Do you know him?" Kasha nodded. "I recognize his voice. His name is Sunless. He was in second to last place in the rankings, right above me." The tall girl frowned as if trying to remember. Then she asked, "The pervert?" The smile disappeared from Sunny's face, replaced by exasperation. "Oh, come on." Kasha hesitated and didn't answer. "Hey, I'm not really a pervert, you know. I just, said a few things to a few girls. It was all a misunderstanding." Nephi's was silent for a few seconds, and then, finally, dismissed her sword. "Okay, you can come out." Sunny limped out of the shadows, summoning his own back. It flowed to his feet and reattached itself, visibly shaking. The bastard was laughing at him. Stopping a few meters away from Nephi's, he raised his hands, showing that he didn't mean the girls any harm. Changing Star gave him an inquisitive look. "What happened to you?" She was referring to his limp, bruises, and overall banged-up look. Sunny sighed. "Carapace scavenger." Nephi's raised an eyebrow. "You managed to get away alive." "You bet I did." Sunny subconsciously straightened his back. "I didn't get away, I killed it." To prove his point, he gestured at his rucksack, full of delicious monster meat. Nephi's looked him over again, reevaluating her opinion of him. Now there were hints of approval in her eyes. Carapace scavengers were only beasts, but they were still awakened. With the addition of their mighty physique and natural armor, defeating one was not an easy feat for any sleeper, who all had a dormant core, let alone someone from the very bottom of the ranking list. Come to think of it, it was even a bit too outstanding. Sunny lowered his eyes. It was already wounded. Nephi's shrugged. "A kill is a kill, you did well." After that, she fell silent, as though not planning to say anything else. Sunny also wasn't sure what to say. Luckily, Kasha came to the rescue. Are you seriously injured? He shook his head. No, it's just that my ribs and leg are bruised. I'll be fine in a day or two. My armor is pretty resilient. He wasn't worried that they might be tempted to kill him to get the puppeteer's shroud. That was because memories were destroyed at the moment of their owner's death, so they only could be transferred voluntarily by a living person. Well, there was always torture and blackmail, but he doubted that any one of the two beautiful girls would stoop to that. Sonny cleared his throat. Before stumbling on the scavenger, I was heading for the tall hill with the massive coral pillar on top, but after the fight, my speed decreased. Now I'm worried about not making it in time. Do you perhaps know the way? Kasia smiled. Actually, we spent the last days on that hill. We were just about to go back. Nephi's didn't say anything, looking at the sky. Sonny licked his lips. Well, can I come with you? They're not going to say no, right? The blind girl turned her head to her companion, a clear question written on her face. Nephi's lowered her eyes, staring at Sonny. After a while, she said, No. What? Problem? No problem. What's wrong with you, princess? Can't you speak faster? Feeling his heart beating wildly in his chest, Sonny smiled. Well, all right. Chapter 36, Bonfire. The rest of the way to the tall hill did not take a lot of time. With Nephi's leading the way, taking all the right turns at all the right places, there was no need to explore the labyrinth and backtrack after encountering a dead end. Additionally, there were no scavengers around. In fact, they could have moved ever quicker if not for Kasia, who walked slowly even with the help of her staff. Guided by the golden rope, she carefully explored the ground ahead before taking each step. The uneven paths of the Crimson Forest were not an ideal surface for a blind person to walk on. Sonny didn't say much, periodically casting an incredulous glance at the strange pair. No matter how he looked at it, Kasia seemed to be dead weight. Perhaps it was cruel to say, but in the merciless reality of the dream realm, misguided kindness was a sure way to end up dead. For meeting and observing the girls, he still had hoped that Kasia's terrible flaw hid an unexpected and powerful aspect, but from what he saw, it wasn't the case. If she couldn't even walk properly, what kind of power was there to hide? Nothing could outweigh the ruthless fact that the blind girl couldn't protect herself, and thus would only drag her companions down. One had to be a fool or not fond of living to allow that to happen. So, which one of these descriptions suited Nephi's? Somehow, he felt that neither did. Sunset was not far off when they reached the hill. After climbing it and approaching the massive growth of coral, Nephi's dismissed the golden rope and immediately summoned it again. This way, it was untied and appeared in her hands in a neat bundle. Ah, so it's a memory. Sonny wondered what qualities the magical rope had. Soon, his curiosity was satisfied. Right in front of his surprised eyes, the length of the rope suddenly began to increase. Soon, it was thrice as long as it was before. Nephi's calmly tied both ends of the rope into loops and then threw one of them into the air, accurately coiling it around a prominent protrusion near the top of the coral pillar. Then, she tested if the rope would hold, swiftly climbed up and waved from above, giving Sonny the signal to follow. After hesitating for a second, Sonny approached the rope and grabbed it. He couldn't help thinking that this would be the perfect opportunity to cut his head off. With him helpless while climbing and Nephi's standing on the top of the pillar, the vivid picture appeared in his mind. Stop being paranoid, Sonny thought, trying to calm himself down. It's not that he was sure of changing Star's impeccable moral qualities. Instead, he was certain of one thing. If Nephi's really wanted to kill him, she wouldn't have needed to wait for an opportunity. She could have just cut him into ribbons whenever. Simultaneously scared and reassured by this though, Sonny nimbly climbed up and joined Nephi's at the top of the coral mound. He then turned around and watched curiously, wondering how Kasia was going to get to them. The blind girl dismissed the wooden staff and approached the rope. Then she caught it in a hand, traced it down to the loop at the end and placed her foot inside. As soon as she was done, Nephi's grabbed the rope and started pulling, lifting Kasia little by little until she had reached the top. She only had to grab Nephi's hand and make a step to join them. How efficient. Coral Mound was much larger than the circular stone platform of the giant knight's neck. In fact, it was almost like a small island. At the highest point of the island, hidden behind some coral blades, the girls had made a little camp. There were piles of seaweed to sleep on, strips of scavenger meat drying under the sun, and a fire pit. Sonny pointed to the makeshift fire pit. Was it you 2 nights ago? I've seen an orange light in the distance. Kasia's face darkened. Yes, this was the first time we made a fire, but it turned out to be a really bad mistake. Nephi sighed. Sonny raised an eyebrow, surprised. Why? The blind girl touched her hair and turned her head to Nephi's. At night, any light will attract monsters. We were attacked by scavengers first, and then. She paled and didn't finish, but she didn't have to. The memory of the colossal tentacle was still fresh in Sonny's mind. It seemed that he was lucky to meet these two when he had. If not, he was certainly going to make a fire tonight to roast some scavenger meat. Oh, I see. Nephi's looked at the sky and cleared her throat. It should be fine now. We still have time before the sun sets. After that, she got busy making the fire. Kasia simply sat on a pile of seaweed and waited. Not knowing what to do, Sunny lowered himself to the ground and let his tired, bruised body rest. After a while, he said, "I have fresh meat in my rucksack. Do you have water?" Kasia smiled. "Yes." After that, she extended an arm to him. A second later, a beautiful bottle made of patterned blue glass appeared in her hand. "That's a memory I have, it's always full." Sunny took the glass bottle and looked at it with envy. "An endless supply of water, huh? Sure beats my super loud bell." "Thank you." He brought the bottle to his lips and greedily drank the cool, delicious water. Indeed, no matter how much he drank, the amount of water inside did not seem to decrease. "Is it really endless?" Kasia touched her hair again. Not really. If you turn it upside down and let the water flow, it will stop in half an hour or so, but then it will be full again pretty soon." At that time, Nephise was already done making the fire. Without looking up, she took Sunny's rucksack and opened it. Immediately, the soul shard rolled out. The tall girl looked at it, then at Sunny. Then she put the shard back in and pulled out the meat. Sunny became tense, preparing a misleading answer, but Nephise did not ask, so he pretended like nothing had happened and continued his conversation with Kasia. "It's still a great memory. Getting drinkable water is not an easy task." Kasia nodded and smiled, pleased by his words. Soon, the rich smell of roasting meat permeated the air. At the same time, the sun was beginning to approach the horizon. A loud rumble came from somewhere beneath, and first traces of the black water began to appear between crimson walls of the labyrinth. Sunny looked east, where the skies were already growing dark. Then he uncomfortably shifted. "Do scavengers come all the way up here?" Nephise turned the meat and nodded. "Yes, but only at night. In the day, most of them seem to disappear." Sunny grinned, having an idea of why there weren't a lot of monsters in the labyrinth in the day. "That's because they all gather near the place I had been spending my time recently. You should have seen it, the tall cliff to the west of here. Well, it's actually a statue." Kasia opened her eyes wide. A statue, but for you to survive, it should be." "Yes, it's a giant statue of a knight, at least 200 meters tall. He's missing his head, so I hid on top of the neck. Anyway, the day we were sent here, two sea creatures fought each other near that statue. When the water receded, I saw an enormous carcass lying there, with hundreds of scavengers slowly tearing it apart." Nephise nodded. "That would explain the lack of nightmare creature in the day. How long?" Sunny blinked. "How long what?" Changing Star stared at him for a few seconds, making everyone feel uncomfortable. "How long until they are done devouring the carcass?" "Oh, 1 day more, 2 at most." Nephise turned away, took the meat away from the fire, and then quickly extinguished it. "There's definitely something wrong with that girl." 3 of them ate in the dimming light of the twilight. The meat was juicy, tender, and indescribably delicious. It was better than anything Sunny had ever tasted, even back in the Academy's cafeteria. Of course, his excruciating hunger played a part in that. From time to time, they would pass the glass bottle to each other. When they were finished with their meal, the dark sea was back, and the night was upon them. Everything was consumed by absolute darkness. Of course, Sunny could easily see both Nephise and Kasia. Under the cover of the night, Changing Star remained pretty much the same. The blind girl, however, allowed her true emotions to show, thinking that no one would see. She seemed much more lost, lonely, and frightened than she did in the day. As if trying to resist these feelings, Kasia said in a bright voice, "How about we formally introduce ourselves? I'm Cassie." Nephise glanced in her direction and shrugged. "Neph." Next, it was Sunny's turn. He exhaled, glad that they didn't ask his name directly. Most likely, he would still have been able to provide his human name. However, it also might have depended on the wording of the question. Relieved, he smiled and answered, "I'm Sunless, but you can call me Sunny." Chapter 37. Getting to know each other. Sunny was slowly growing fond of having conversations in the dark. Without the burden of light, people were more relaxed and honest. It reminded him of the frequent blackouts that used to sweep through the city when he was a little kid. His family had no choice but to huddle together and spend a few hours doing nothing but talking to each other. Now these dark hours had become some of his most precious memories. He was silent for a few moments and then said, "Since we're going to be depending on each other, should we share what abilities and memories we have at our disposal?" This was a logical suggestion. If they were going to fight side by side, knowing each other's strengths was more or less vital. Still, he noticed Nephise glancing in his direction with a guarded look on her face. Luckily, he was obscured by darkness. "I'll start," Sunny said, both to show his sincerity and to reveal information about himself in a controlled manner. If he took the initiative to talk, he still had to tell the truth, but how much and to what extent was still for him to decide. If they were to ask and he had to answer, however, things would become unpredictable. "My attributes give me an affinity to shadows. I also have a slight affiliation to divinity. Lastly, I am prone to finding myself in unlikely situations." Cassie listened carefully and then lowered her head as though embarrassed. He is telling the truth, not that we doubted your honesty. Why not? I spent so much time earning the reputation of a pathological liar. Sonny cleared his throat and smiled, hiding his nervousness. Really, that's good to know, but why are you so sure that I am being honest? The blind girl shifted a little. Well, that's my ability. I can see people's attributes. Sometimes I also receive, visions. They can be about the future or the past. I mean, that's what I think. It only happened a couple of times. Sonny swallowed, but then relaxed. So she is an oracle of sorts. Luckily, her insight is limited to attributes. Otherwise, I'd be in real trouble. Still, I'll have to be careful around her. He finally realized how the blind girl had known about his birthday. The question was whether she had seen it in a vision of the future or in a vision of the past. If it was the former, was it safe to assume that he would certainly be able to celebrate at least one more birthday? Or did knowing the future actually affect it and changed it? For example, after learning that he was definitely going to survive, Sonny might have naturally relaxed and lowered his guard. Then he would die as the result of it. It surely seemed possible, right? That's assuming that the future could be changed, but maybe it wasn't then. Feeling his head hurting, Sonny decided to avoid this line of thought for now. Instead, he hid his inner turmoil and said in a friendly tone, "That's a good ability. Speaking of abilities, you have already seen mine. My shadow can move independently and explore. It can't affect the material world, but we share sight and hearing. That way I can spot danger before encountering it. The shadow is fast and stealthy. It can go anywhere and is almost impossible to notice. Oh, I can also see in the dark." He smiled, expecting the girls to understand and appreciate the utility of his shadow scout. Their reaction, however, was a bit strange. Nephi slowly turned her head in his direction, while Cassie became a bit pale and raised her hands to cover her chest. "Oh, what?" Nephi frowned and said in a flat tone, "Have you ever used your ability in the academy?" Sonny blinked. "What a strange question." "In the academy, sure, of course. Why?" "Oh, right, they think that I'm a pervert." Crab. Before the girls could say anything, he hurriedly raised his hand and blurted, "But I have never used it to do anything improper. You have to believe me." Fortunately, it was the honest truth. However, both Nephi and Cassie looked skeptical. Sonny gritted his teeth. "I had more important things to do than whatever you're thinking about. I spent almost every waking hour learning how to survive." Nephi raised an eyebrow. "I haven't seen you in class, even once." Sonny chuckled. "Of course you didn't. While you were busy wiping the floor with other sleepers, I was studying wilderness survival." It was Changing Star's turn to blink. "Wilderness what? There is such a course." Cassie seemed equally puzzled. "Yes, there is. It might seem like an afterthought for most people, but for an outskirts kid like me, who never went to a fancy school or saw a private tutor, learning how to survive in the wilderness is the difference between life and death. Without it, I would have drowned the moment we were sent to the dream realm." On a rare occasion, Nephi looked completely bewildered. She rubbed her wrists and stared thoughtfully in his direction. "I see, I didn't know." Sonny grimaced and struggled to keep the venom from sipping into his voice. When he finally spoke, his tone was light and amiable. "That's okay, it's natural for someone of your status not to know." When he mentioned her status, a strange smile appeared on the Changing Star's face, but in the end, she didn't reply. Sonny continued. "Anyway, that's my ability. As for memories, I have 3. One is an armor, one is a sword, and the last one is a really loud bell." Now it was their turn to share. After a short pause, Nephi spoke. "My attributes give me an affinity to light and fire, as well as a strong affiliation to divinity. I have 2 memories, a rope." While she was speaking, Sonny was looking at Cassie, trying to read her expression. From what he saw, Nephi was telling the truth, but also not the whole truth. And judging by how hard the blind girl was trying to hide her true feelings, the secret hiding among Changing Star's attributes was not at all trivial. "Interesting." "And a sword, the rope is very sturdy and can change its length. The sword is very sharp and can protect its wielder against soul's attacks to a certain extent. My ability can be used to heal." Sonny didn't miss the wording of the last part. Can be used to heal. Does this mean that its main purpose was something else? He was pretty sure that Nephi would not reveal all of her cards just like him. However, healing abilities were extremely rare. Having one that could heal but was not limited to healing, that would be simply unheard of. But then again, she was Changing Star, one of the few people in history to receive a true name in the first nightmare. If Sonny were to consider his own aspect ability, nothing seemed impossible. "I wonder what's her aspect rank is." Outwardly, he pretended to be excited. "You're a healer, that's great. Having a healer among us is incredible luck." Cassie nodded and smiled. "Neph is also an amazing fighter. You should have seen her dealing with those scavengers." "Well, I also did not actually see it, but it sounded very scary." Sonny didn't need anyone to tell him how formidable of a warrior Nephi was. He had seen it with How's own 2 eyes, sort of. Actually, they were his shadow's eyes. Well, whatever it had instead of eyes. Meanwhile, Cassie sighed. "It's my turn. My attributes are nothing special. I guess I have an affinity to revelations and fate. My abilities, like I told you before, it's not very useful. About my memories, I have three: the bottle, the wooden staff, and this armor. You already know about the bottle. The staff can create wind. The armor is actually of the awakened rank. Nef gave it to me when we met. It has a very powerful protective charm. So she's not only carrying Cassie on her back, she even gave away her only clothes. An awakened rank armor at that. What is Nephis thinking about? The blind girl turned away and added after a while. I used to be a pretty decent fencer before. Now I can't really fight. Last two sentences were obviously related to her flaw. Sunny and Nephis, however, both chose to keep their secret, despite the fact that knowing your companion's flaw was also important for cooperation and having each other's backs. Sharing something like that demanded a very high level of trust. Right now there was no trust between them, and even if there was, Sunny did not plan to ever share his flaw with anyone. Nephis, too, seemed to have a lot of secrets. After a while, he said, "Good, that's good. I think we have enough tools to survive, provided we use them right. I guess it's time to sleep." In the darkness, Nephis tilted her head, listening to his words with a distant look. "All right, I'll take watch first." Sunny decided to be helpful and said, "Actually, my shadow doesn't sleep. It can wake us up if something happens." Changing Star slowly smiled. "I'll take watch first." Feeling a bit of coldness in her voice, Sunny sighed and shrugged. "Suit yourself. What are you going to watch, huh? You can't even see anything. Whatever. Just don't blame me when something giant swallows us in the middle of the night." Then he suddenly shuddered. "Wait, that was not a death flag, right? Right, of course not. No way." Chapter 38. Questions in the dark. Sleep was avoiding Sunny. For a while he sat silently in the darkness, listening to the calming rumbling of the waves. In this rare moment of respite, memories of the past few days came flooding into his mind. However, he was too tired to seriously think about anything. He was warm, full, and relatively safe. For now, that was more than enough. Soon, the rhythm of Kash's breathing changed, indicating that she fell asleep. Nephis was guarding the camp, motionless and, as always, a bit distant. With her silver hair and fair skin, she looked like an alabaster statue. Sunny sighed. He struggled for a bit, and then said quietly, "Hey, can I ask you a question?" Nephis glanced at him and shrugged. The lack of an audible response clearly indicated that she remembered about his ability to see in the dark. "Sure. Would it be too personal?" Sunny hesitated. "I thought you legacies come into the spell with a whole inherited arsenal of memories. I mean, that's supposed to be your main advantage. How come you only had three?" Nephis was silent for a few moments. "Actually, I only had two. The rope came from Cassie." He raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I see." Realizing that her answer wasn't really an answer, Nephis thought for a while and added, "He lost most of our memories when my father passed away. The ones that remained were sold one by one over the years to keep the family afloat. This sword and armor came from my first nightmare." So that's how it was. Sunny realized that the fall of the immortal Flame Clan might have been more thorough than he had thought. Still, something about it didn't make sense. Surely, with your clan's reputation and standing, there were other ways to make money. Without any strong reaction, Nephis simply said, "There were other reasons." Then she unexpectedly turned her head in his direction. "Can I ask you a question in return?" Sunny swallowed. "Yeah, go ahead." Nephis tilted her head. "How did you know that I'm a legacy?" "What, that's it?" "Simple, I heard Castor mention it. He was scolding other sleepers to make them treat you with respect." She gave him a nod and turned away. What thoughts were hidden behind her calm gray eyes, Sunny did not know. Some time had passed before he gathered enough courage to ask the question that he really wanted to ask. Before doing it, though, he made sure that Cassie was sound asleep and lowered his voice. "Can I ask another question?" Without getting a negative response, he continued, "Why are you burdening yourself with her?" A corner of Changing Star's mouth curled up slightly. "Why wouldn't you?" Sunny gritted his teeth, feeling the flaw pushing the truthful answer out of his mouth. No. To be honest, he wanted to believe to the last moment that the answer would be yes, but one of the things he had lost after the nightmare was the ability to lie to himself. Truth was merciless. It's not that Sunny did not pity the blind girl or didn't want to help her. It's just that he knew with certainty that it was simply not something he could do. He was barely able to save himself, let alone carry a helpless person across the dream realm. If he tried, they would just die together. Still, he couldn't help but be a little disappointed in himself. Nephis, however, did not seem to judge him. She showed no reaction at all. After a few moments, she simply said, "Because I want to." Because she wants to. That was not the response Sunny expected to hear. He was pretty sure that she would either lecture him about virtue and compassion or disclose some obscure way to make Cassie's seemingly weak ability incredibly useful. However, she did neither. Nephis expected him to believe that she was putting her life in danger, to the point of sacrificing an awakened armor-type memory, because that was something she simply wanted to do. Ridiculous. At first he dismissed her response as a non-answer, but the more he thought about it, the more disturbed he felt. Because maybe it was actually the truth. Due to the circumstances of his life, Sonny had never really done things because he wanted to. Most of the time he was doing them because he needed to. It was never a question of want. It was always a question of must. For him, this was a basic rule of life. But was it really, or was it just a matter of perspective? Nephi's had certain advantages in her upbringing, but they weren't as ample as he had imagined. She had no wealth and no arsenal of relics to empower her. However, she did have a mentality that was different from Sonny's. It wasn't impossible for her to have the audacity to disregard need in favor of something as frivolous as desire, and do things that a normal person like Sonny would never do. Like helping a blind girl simply because that was what Nephi's wanted to do. Perhaps that mentality was the greatest advantage of all. Perhaps that was the real barrier that separated legacies from the rest of them. That was a lot to think about. However, before Sonny could gather his thoughts, Nephi suddenly spoke again. My turn. Does she mean it's her turn to ask a question? Indeed, that was what she meant. Changing Star once again turned to Sonny and after a long pause suddenly asked, Do you know the legend of Odysseus? What sort of a weird question is that? Bewildered, Sonny shook his head. Then, remembering that she couldn't see him, he said, No. Nephi sighed and turned away. A few moments later, she softly said, Odysseus was a hero in an ancient war. In the legends, some humans back then had powers akin to the awakened. Achilles with an aspect of indestructible body. Diomedes that was so ferocious even the god of war was wary of him. Ajax who was as strong as a giant. Odysseus was not the strongest and not the bravest. However, he was the most cunning. Sonny blinked, staring at the silver-haired girl. Where did this come from? Why is she suddenly so eloquent? Meanwhile, Nephi's continued. In the end, Odysseus's cunning ended the war and he prepared to sail home. However, the gods cursed him to endlessly wander the seas, never to return. Over the years, he survived one horror after another and lost all of his companions. Then, shipwrecked, he found himself on an island where the beautiful fairy, Calypso, lived. Changing Star's ethereal, strangely wistful voice resounded in the darkness, creating an enthralling atmosphere. Sonny couldn't help but listen with the utmost attention. Calypso fell in love with Odysseus and invited him to her palace. For many years they lived together in harmony. The island was like a paradise, filled with all kinds of wonders, delicacies, and delights. As long as loving Calypso was by his side, Odysseus was even immortal. But the longer he stayed, the more time he spent sitting on the shore, looking at the sea with bleak eyes. Nephi smiled. In the end, Odysseus built a makeshift boat and abandoned the island, leaving all its delights, the beautiful fairy, and even his immortality behind. So my question is, why did he leave? Sonny blinked. What kind of a mind game was that? He even considered that Nephi's was mocking him, but it didn't seem to be the case. It looked like she was sincerely interested in the answer. Weirdo. He thought for a bit and then said without too much conviction. Maybe it was because he was far away from home. A fleeting smile appeared on Nephi's face. Far away from home, all right. After that, she turned away and lowered her head, becoming like a statue again. It seemed like their conversation was over. Grumbling internally, Sonny lay down and tried to fall asleep. However, the image of bleak-eyed Odysseus kept appearing in his mind. After a while, he whispered, Well, did he make it back home? Soon, Nephi's replied. Yes, he returned to his wife and son, and they lived happily ever after. Satisfied, Sonny smiled and turned on his side. When he was already half asleep, he heard Changing Star's quiet voice once again. This time, it was barely audible and aimless, as though not directed at anyone. Odysseus was the first human to break the will of gods. In the morning, Sonny and Nephi's were the first to get up. While the sun was rising and the sea was retreating, they made a fire and began preparing a simple breakfast. With Cassius still asleep, they did not talk to each other much. It was like the last night's conversation did not happen. However, after some time, they somehow ended up discussing the plan for the next few days. Nephi's had some ideas. With what you told us about scavengers crowding to the west, the logical step would be to start moving east as soon as we can. Of course, north and south are also acceptable, but that won't put as much space between us and the enemy. Sonny nodded, agreeing with that logic. You have explored to the east a little, but not enough to confidently make it to the next high point in a day. That's why the best course of action would be to spend today scouting a path to that group of cliffs over there and move the camp tomorrow. He sighed. Do you have any idea where we are? Would there be a human citadel to the east? Nephi shook her head. I've never heard of a region that fits the characteristics of this place. In any case, we have to move to find out more. We'll either find a citadel, encounter an unconquered gateway, or die. East is as good of a direction as any. Plus, it's the safest because there's a horde of monsters to the west. At that point, Cassie suddenly sat up straight. Her eyes were wide open and her face was a little pale. She looked nervous and excited. Nephi's frowned. Cassie, what's the matter? The blind girl turned to them and smiled. A vision, I had a vision. Like a prophetic dream, Sunny thought, trying to come to terms with this new reality of someone being able to see the future, or the past. Meanwhile, Changing Star stretched her hand, as though prepared to summon her sword. Are we in danger? Cassie energetically shook her head. No, it's not that, people. I saw a castle full of people. She smiled and pointed with her finger. I don't know how far it is, but I'm sure that it's in that direction. Sunny and Nephi's looked at each other, not knowing whether to be glad or petrified. Cassie's small, delicate finger was confidently pointing west. Chapter 39, Journey to the West. In the ensuing silence, the smile slowly disappeared from Cassie's face, replaced by confusion. Feeling the sudden tension, she asked, what's wrong? Sunny sighed. No, nothing is wrong. It's just that that direction is the one we wanted to avoid. After some thought, he added, That's where I came from yesterday. There's a lot of scavengers down there. The blind girl's face fell. Oh, Nephi's, who was quietly listening to them, gave him an indecipherable look and finally spoke. Tell us more about the castle. A shadow of the previous excitement returned to Cassie's eyes. With a serious nod, she began describing her vision. I dreamt of a vast ruined city built of weathered stone. It was surrounded by tall, impregnable walls. Various monsters were wandering its narrow streets. In the center of the city there was a hill, and on that hill stood a magnificent castle. She smiled. But there were no monsters in the castle. Instead, it was full of people. I'm sure that they were awakened. Some were guarding the walls, some were going about their lives without a care in the world. There was food, safety, and laughter. Well, that sounds great. If this castle really existed, then all of their problems would be solved. Sunny cleared his throat. Did you see anything else? Cassie frowned, trying to remember. Then her face cleared. Yes, I saw Sunny leading me through the gates of the castle. That means we will make it. A brilliant smile appeared on her doll-like face, beaming with so much joy that Sunny couldn't help but curl his lips. Inwardly, however, he was stuck on a certain detail of Cassie's vision. It was that, when talking about reaching the castle, the blind girl only mentioned the two of them. Was there some meaning behind it? Sunny turned his head a little and secretly glanced at Nephi's, trying to discern if she had picked up on that little discrepancy, too. Changing Star, however, was as enigmatic as ever. Without showing much emotion, she thought for a while and then slowly nodded. Okay, then we will go west. While the sea was still retreating, they had their breakfast and then spent some time planning for the journey and preparing to abandon the temporary camp. In the process, Sunny had a chance to get to know the girls a little better. It was then that he came to a sudden realization, which almost made his head explode from bafflement. That mind-blowing realization had to do with Nephi's. Back when they first met in front of the academy's gates, Sunny had formed a certain impression of the confident, distant girl. Later, her behavior and the different revelations about Changing Star's past only served to reinforce that impression. Nephi seemed to exist a bit apart from the world. She was mysterious, aloof, and rather cool. Her taciturn character and strange speech patterns made people interacting with her feel unnerved and rattled, often revealing more than they had been planning to. The less she talked, the more she seemed to know. That silent, indifferent confidence was arresting, and sometimes even oppressive. However, that impression turned out to be completely wrong. The actual truth behind the matter had nothing to do with being cool and aloof. After talking to her a bit more and observing their interactions with Cassie, Sunny almost fainted when he realized that Nephi's was simply an incredibly, ridiculously, painfully awkward person. It was as though she had no idea how to talk to people. Every time she tried to convey something, she would either use the wrong words or stumble in the middle of the sentence and fall silent. Her tone never matched what she was trying to say. Often, she would forget to put correct intonations in her speech, making questions sound like statements or vice versa. Added to that was the fact that, like many introverted people, Nephi's was not in a habit of openly showing her emotions. It's not that she didn't have feelings, it's just that she was really bad at emoting them. As a result, her face always looked cold and neutral. That's why, most of the time, she simply chose to talk as little as possible or not to talk at all. All of that added up together, then multiplied by her general weirdness, was ultimately responsible for creating the false image of a mysterious, unapproachable ice princess. When in fact, she was just shy and completely inept in communicating with people. After coming to that realization, Sunny tried with all his might, but still failed to stop himself from staring at Nephi's with wide eyes. He just barely managed to not let his jaw hang open. What the hell, that's not in line with how a protagonist should be. In his mind, Nephi's had definitely been the type of person to be the main character of any event. At the center stage, there were always confident, strong people like her and Castor. People like himself and Cassie, on the other hand, were relegated to exist far away in the background. Now, however. No, that line of thought was also wrong. The fact that Changing Star had problems with expressing herself and lacked social skills did not mean that she was not strong. In fact, it might have meant the opposite. She still achieved everything that she had achieved, but with the added layer of adversity. She was still dangerous. At that moment, Nephi's finally noticed that Sunny was staring at her. She looked at him and after a long pause, asked in an emotionless tone, "What?" He blinked, extricating himself from this sudden flood of thoughts, and cleared his throat. Nothing. I was just going to ask, when are we setting off?" Nephi's appeared to be thinking. After a while, she turned away and said, "Soon. You really can't manage more than one word, can you?" Utterly bewildered, Sunny hid his emotions and smiled. "It's all right then." In the gray light of morning, they abandoned the tall hill and ventured west, retracing their steps from yesterday. Knowing the path, the small party made quick progress. Nephis was walking in front, her sword arm ready to strike at any moment. A bit behind her was Sunny. This time, the responsibility of holding the golden rope and guiding Cassie along was entrusted to him. Of course, the actual creature, leading them was his shadow. It scouted ahead, carefully observing the labyrinth for signs of danger. The labyrinth was just as it was before, confusing and seemingly endless. Crimson blades of coral protruded from the black mud, creating a vast, tangled forest. However, today something about it felt different. It wasn't long before the shadow stumbled onto a mass of hulking, hungry scavengers. Chapter 40, Weak Point Halt, Sunny whispered, observing the group of scavengers through his shadow. As soon as the word left his lips, Nephis immediately summoned her sword. After studying the surroundings for a second, she turned her head and glanced at him with a question in her eyes. Kasha, meanwhile, froze in place and hesitantly raised her staff. Sunny counted the monsters, 1, 2, 3, 5. Curses. Hulking beasts seemed like the losers of the pack, similar to the one he had killed. However, their wounds were not as pronounced and terrible. Each of them was much more of a threat than the mangled one from before, and there were half a dozen of them at least. "There are scavengers on the path ahead, 6 of them. They're slowly moving in our direction." Nephis cast a gaze forward. There was a calculating look on her face. "They're done with the carcass." Sunny thought for a moment and then shook his head. "No, I don't think so, but maybe there's not enough meat for everyone anymore, so some stragglers had no choice but to leave with an empty stomach." Nephis nodded and gestured to a nearby branching path. "We'll circle around them." 3 sleepers hastily moved forward and changed paths, giving a wide berth to the group of monsters. Tense and grim, they continued walking, trying to stay on course and not get lost in the labyrinth. However, in the next hour, they had to turn in a random direction again and again, avoiding other scavengers. The distance between them and the giant statue was not shortening at all. At some point, they were catching their breath near one of the numerous dead ends of the Crimson Labyrinth. They had no choice but to wait, since a large number of creatures was moving past their hiding spot, separated from them by a long length of a twisting coral passage. Sunny sighed and shook his head. "We can't go on like that. At this rate, we'll never make it to safety before sunset." Cassie was the first one to react. Maybe we should turn back." That was a reasonable suggestion. However, Sunny felt reluctant to agree. Nephis shared his thoughts. With a blank expression, she said, "It will only get harder tomorrow." She was right. By tomorrow, there would be even more scavengers flooding the labyrinth. "Then what should we do?" Changing Star tilted her head, thinking. After a while, she turned to Sunny. Fight against dozens of those monstrosities. Was she crazy?" Sunny tried to hide his derision as he spoke. "I know that you're skilled with the sword, but have you forgotten that each of those things is a whole rank above us? We won't survive in a fight against many." Nephis nodded. "We avoid large groups, cut down smaller ones." After a moment, she added, "If there's 1 or 2 of them, there's a chance." Sunny wanted to retort but couldn't find a good reason. In the end, he gave up. "Fine." Nephis stared at him for a while, then she suddenly asked, "Have you studied the corpse of the scavenger you had killed?" What was that supposed to mean? A bit surprised, Sunny shook his head. "No. He was too busy being in pain and trying to make it to safety before the sea returned. And why would he study a corpse?" "Wait, I think Teacher Julius mentioned something." After a short pause, Nephis spoke. "Scavengers have 3 weak points on their bodies. The first one is obvious, it's their joints. Anything that has to be flexible can't be too rigid, so there's gaps in the armor above the joints. By targeting the joints, you can diminish their mobility and attack capacity. So, by studying a dead monster, one could better understand their strengths and vulnerabilities. This idea was so obvious that Sunny admonished himself for not realizing sooner. Meanwhile, Nephis continued. Second one is the same, it's where their torso connects to the carapace. If you manage to accurately hit that spot, you can heavily injure a scavenger and deal serious damage to its body. However, unless you succeed in severing its spine, the wound won't be fatal. It'll still be able to fight for a while. Sunny couldn't help but notice that Changing Star's awkwardness seemed to disappear whenever she talked about things that she felt confident about, like ancient heroes, or killing things. Curious. Last weak point is on their back, approximately at the level where the eyes are. There's a slightly concave, discolored cavity in their armor. It is where several armor plates connect. The chitin there is comparatively thin. If you can pierce through it, you can destroy the brain directly. That will be a killing blow. That is good to know. However, that weak point was too high to be hit by a human. After all, scavengers were more than 2 meters tall. As though reading his thoughts, Nephi's added, "That weak point is very hard to target. Circling around a scavenger is almost impossible due to their size, speed, and the attack range of their pincers." She looked at him and calmly said, "If we stumble on a single scavenger, I'll be the bait. My task will be to make it turn around and then restrain it, exposing the third weak point. Your task will be to kill it." Sunny gulped. "What if there's 2 of them?" As usual, Nephi's paused before answering. "Don't die." It wasn't long before they were left with no choice but to attempt to fight against a scavenger. Behind them, there was a long stretch of the labyrinth with no suitable branching paths for them to turn onto. Ahead of them, there was a small clearing with only one other passage leading out of it. Not far into that passage, a massive scavenger was moving slowly in their direction. Sunny quickly described the situation and waited for Changing Star's feedback. Without much delay, she gave him a nod. "We fight in the clearing." After that, Nephi's gently guided Cassie to the wall of the labyrinth and helped her find a place to sit. "Wait here, we'll be back." After some thought, she added, "Soon." As Nephi's moved to walk away, Cassie grabbed her hand. Her face was pale and tense. "Neph, you be careful, okay?" Nephi's blinked and tilted her head a little. Then she smiled. Sure." With that, she and Sunny hastily headed for the clearing. By the time they got there, the scavenger was seconds from appearing. Sunny's shadow flew out of the passage and reattached itself to his feet. Without having to discuss things with Nephi's, he quickly hid in the shadows and waited there, hoping for a chance to attack. Nephi's, on the other hand, strolled to the center of the clearing and calmly stood there, her shoulders relaxed and her back straight. An elegant longsword appeared in her hands, carelessly pointed to the ground. Not knowing what else to do, Sunny silently repeated her words. "Don't die." A second later, the scavenger walked into the clearing. When his tiny eyes spotted Nephi's, an evil light ignited in them. Without wasting even a second, the massive monster screeched and rushed forward to attack. Its huge pincer shot forward with terrifying speed, tearing the air in its path. Nephi swiftly sidestepped, dodging the pincer, then leaped backward, removing herself from the path of the rushing monster. Simultaneously, her sword flashed in the air, cutting deep into the joint of one of the scavenger's front legs. Azure blood spattered on the ground. Of course, this small wound was too insignificant to slow the scavenger down. With surprising agility, it twisted and delivered a crushing sideways swipe. Nephi's, who just barely landed on her feet, had no choice but to deflect the blow with her sword. She managed to disperse most of the impact by holding the blade at the right angle, but the remaining force was still enough to throw her off balance. At that moment, the second pincer came down. Instead of trying to regain her equilibrium, Changing Star went with the fall and somersaulted over one hand, ending up distancing herself from the monster a bit. Her sword lashed out again. The follow-up attack followed almost immediately. However, Sunny did not care about the details anymore. The only thing he cared about was that, through this risky series of dodges and leaps, Nephi's had managed to circle to the opposite side of the clearing, forcing the scavenger to turn its back to the shadow in which he hid. "It's now or never." Gritting his teeth, Sunny lunged forward. Before Changing Star finished her last dodge. Before the scavenger's pincer crashed on her from above. Before Sunny had time to become scared. He closed the distance between himself and the monster and jumped with all his might, landing on top of its carapace. Then, he used all of his weight to thrust a hand forward. Azure blade shimmered into existence in his grip and was immediately swallowed by the shadow. A breath later, the dark blade hit precisely into the concave, discolorated cavity in the scavenger's armor. With a crack, the chitin broke, allowing the tip of the sword to sink deep into the scavenger's body. The monster shuddered and then heavily fell to the ground. Sunny was thrown from its carapace, landing in the mud with a roll. That easy. It was already over. As though to answer him, the spell's voice resounded in the air. "You have slain an awakened beast, carapace scavenger. Your shadow grows stronger." Chapter 41, Strength in Numbers. Sunny was sprawled in the mud, looking at the sky. He didn't even have to catch his breath since the whole fight took less than 10 seconds from start to finish. No one was dead, wounded, or even bruised well, with the exception of the scavenger. It was completely out of his expectations. He glanced at the monster's corpse to make sure that it was actually dead, then summoned the runes and took a look at the number of shadow fragments in his possession. Shadow fragments, 16,000. It was actually true. The mighty awakened beast perished just like that, and although Nephi's did most of the work, he was the one to deal the killing blow. Why can't it always be so easy? Sunny got back on his feet and dismissed the azure blade. Then, he remembered the words Master Jet had once told him, no one can survive in the dream realm alone. Back then he noted her advice but didn't really believe it. After all, he had always strived to be self-sufficient, not allowing himself to depend on anyone. In Sunny's mind, this was the true meaning of strength. However, now he was beginning to suspect that this logic was flawed. Indeed, having someone to share your burdens meant the difference between heaven and hell here in the dream realm. If he was alone, fighting against a single scavenger might have been the end of him. Similarly, even though Nephi's was far more skilled than Sunny, it would have been extremely hard for her to defeat the armored monster alone, being that its weakest point was out of her reach. Together, they had accomplished it with relative ease. The whole was greater than the sum of the parts. In other words, there was strength in numbers that surpassed individual power. In that sense, being able to depend on a group was not a sign of weakness, but on the contrary, an important facet of personal strength. Lone wolves would always be at a disadvantage. That was another lesson to learn. It's not like I had much of a choice. He walked over to Nephi's and checked if she was okay. Apart from slight damage to her makeshift seaweed clothes, everything seemed to be all right. She glanced at Sunny. Memory. He shook his head. Nephi sighed. It seemed that she was a bit impatient to get herself a suit of armor of her own. If Sunny was a gentleman, he would have suggested to loan her the puppeteer's shroud for a while, but alas, he wasn't. That armor was extremely valuable and had cost him a lot. Plus, unlike Changing Star, the picture of Sunny wearing nothing but a seaweed loincloth would have been more disturbing than aesthetically pleasing, so he said nothing. Meanwhile, Nephi's headed for the dead scavenger and said without turning her head, "Bring Cassie." With a sigh, Sunny turned around and left the clearing. Soon he approached the place where the blind girl was waiting patiently for their return. Hearing his footsteps, she flinched and raised her head. Sunny. How did she recognize me? Ah, must be the way I walk. Yeah, it's me. Everything is over. Come on, I'll bring you to Nephi's. Using the wooden staff, Cassie stood up and turned to him. Are you guys all right? Sunny smiled. Of course, we dispatched that critter in no time. Didn't even get a scratch. Cassie smiled with visible relief. Good, that's good. Oh, right, the rope. Sunny took the rope and guided the blind girl back to the clearing. On the way, he felt a bit weird. With the delicate girl walking behind him, he couldn't help but think of his little sister. As a toddler, she used to follow him around too, as though they were glued together. As the familiar pain stabbed him in the heart, Sunny gritted his teeth and tried to think about something else. It was all in the past anyway. Back in the clearing, Nephi's was done breaking apart the scavenger's carapace. The shimmering soul shard was already in her hand. Without saying anything, she tossed it to Sunny. He caught the crystal and looked at her with surprise. Why are you giving it to me? Nephi's blinked and stayed quiet for a few seconds. Then she said as a matter of fact, I don't have pockets. Oh, still a bit bewildered, Sunny put the soul shard into his rucksack. But why wouldn't she just absorb it? He opened his mouth to ask the question, but she seemed to realize something and added, We'll divide the spoils later. All right. Nephi's meanwhile turned to Cassie and said after some deliberation, I was careful. Then she smiled. Your shadow grows stronger. Your shadow grows stronger. Your shadow grows stronger. Sunny was feeling somewhere in between of being ecstatic and peeved. Throughout the day, they managed to kill 3 more scavengers, each time with not much risk to anyone except for Nephi's. The process was largely the same. After discovering the monster, he would hide in the shadows while Nephi's would act as bait. Then when the time was right, Sunny would stealthily approach and finish the fight with a precise strike of the azure blade. He was wondering if that was what being in the main hero's party felt like. To anyone else, maybe with the exception of Castor, dancing around a deadly awakened beast would have been a tall task, most likely ending with the dancer's death. Nephi's, however, had managed to do it over and over again seemingly without too much strain. What's more, her performance was based solely on skill, with no aspect ability involved. In that regard, even Castor couldn't have done better. He was swift, calm, and precise. Every move she made was calculated and perfectly timed. She seemed to innately understand the flow and logic of combat, which gave her the ability to roughly predict what actions the mindless beasts would perform in the next seconds. Then it was just the question of physical prowess to evade and even manipulate them to a certain degree. Sunny had always known that skill and experience were more important than raw power, but by watching Nephi's, he vividly understood just how vast the difference between them was. Even though his divine aspect allowed Sunny to exert more strength and speed than Changing Star, in an actual fight, he would never stand a chance. Of course, he was also an important part of every encounter. His role as the finisher was not trivial, and not just anybody would have been able to accomplish 4 kills with 4 strikes. Even though Sunny was not taught any elaborate techniques, he was still a somewhat experienced fighter. He had good physical coordination, combat intuition, and most importantly, a cool-headed mentality. Not to mention the fact that they were only able to ambush the scavengers so effectively due to his shadow scouting them out in advance. All in all, it was an almost equal cooperation. Still, watching Nephai's fight was nothing short of sobering. Trying not to get too dejected, Sunny summoned the runes. Shadow fragments, 22 1000. 8 fragments today, pretty excellent. Currently they were waiting on the edge of the labyrinth path leading directly to the giant statue of the Headless Knight. There was a group of scavengers between them and the statue, moving past without any haste. The sunset was near, but they still had time. Slowly minutes flowed by. At some point, Nephais gave the command to move. Helping Cassie along, Sunny followed Changing Star and quickly traversed the open space between the labyrinth and the statue. Now, they only had to get on top of it. However, it wasn't that easy. Scaling the 200-meter-tall monument would have been hard in normal circumstances, but now, they also had to somehow pull Cassie up. Leaving her behind until they were at the top would not have been safe. In the end, Nephais and Sunny took turns pulling the rope every 20 meters or so. Cassie would hold onto the rocks and wait until they climbed higher, and then the process would repeat. It was slow and torturous, and by the end, Sunny's muscles were sore and almost on fire. But they managed to get to safety before the dark waters washed them away. As the night began to descend, the 3 sleepers sat in the center of the circular stone platform and rested. As they did not bring any materials to make a fire and it was already too late, there was no way to cook food. They ended up chewing on the strips of dried meat, passing the bottle of limitless water around. After some time, Nephais gave Sunny a sign to take out the spoils of today's journey. He took out the 4 shimmering soul shards and put them on the ground. Without any discussion, Changing Star moved 2 crystals in his direction and took 2 for herself. Then, she gave one of hers to Kasha. Sunny watched it in silence. By the time Nephais and Cassie had absorbed their soul shards, he still didn't make a move to take his. After a while, he took another crystal out of the rucksack and moved all 3 to Nephais. The silver-haired girl looked at him with surprise. "Don't you want to grow stronger?" Sunny grinned. "Of course I do, but these won't do me much good right now. It's no secret that you are the main fighting force of our group." He sighed. "The stronger you are, the better our chances of survival will get. Plus, it's not a gift, it's a trade." Nephais raised an eyebrow. "A trade, what do you want?" Sunny deliberated for a few seconds before answering. "It's rather simple. I will give you these soul shards, and all other soul shards I earn on the way to that castle." Then he looked her in the eyes and said, "In return, you will teach me how to fight." Chapter 42, Essence of Combat. Nephais looked at him and contemplated. This time, she remained silent longer than usual. Sunny felt a bit nervous under her gaze, knowing that he was being evaluated. With Changing Star's skill and insight, it wasn't hard to imagine just how much she had gleaned from his battle performance. Both his current level and future potential must have been pretty much laid bare in front of her. Were they enough to make teaching him worth her while? After some time, she took the soul shards and nodded. "Okay." Sunny smiled, congratulating himself on a successful deal. Not only did he receive a lot while not losing much, but he had also managed to create a bit of a favorable impression of himself in the eyes of Nephais and Cassie. As far as performances went, this was a great one. "So when do we start?" Nephais shrugged. Now. Sunny glanced at the sun, which was already almost gone. Were they going to train in complete darkness? It wasn't really an obstacle for him. Changing Star, however. "We will start with some words. That will be enough for today." After hesitating a little, she added, "Cassie, you listen too." Sunny and Kasha turned to Nephais, listening to her like 2 obedient students. Despite the fact that their age was more or less similar, both knew that, in terms of martial prowess, their companion had authority that was as beyond theirs as a dragon's might was beyond that of a worm. Nephais thought for a while and then said, "Mastery of combat can be divided into 2 aspects. One is body and the other one is mind. Training the body is not easy, but it is rather simple. All you need is repetition and experience. In a fight, things happen too fast to consider every detail in the moment. That's why your technique must exist in your muscles and bones, so much so that it almost becomes an instinct." She paused. "You can achieve initial results through repetition. Then it must be cemented through experience. The more battle experience you have, the deeper a technique will be assimilated into your body. There's no other way. 1,000 hours of training won't be as impactful as one real fight. Only those who survive countless battles can be truly in command of the body." That simultaneously made a lot of sense and no sense at all. On the one hand, the principle of improving through practice was quite logical. On the other hand, Changing Star's statement made it seem like all those lofty legacies with their years of training were nothing but harmless children. After all, no matter how good their tutors were, they had no real battle experience. But then again, she did wipe the floor with every one of them, excluding Castor, with no apparent difficulty. So maybe her statement was true. That, however, posed a question of its own. Just what kind of life had Nephais led to possess rich battle experience at the tender age of 18? Should I stop calling her princess? Meanwhile, Nephais continued. Training the mind, however, is not simple at all. That is because once you reach a certain level of skill, the mind is where the true combat takes place. The outcome is often decided before your body begins to move, and to master the mind, the first step is to understand the essence of combat. However, very few people truly do. She looked at them and asked, "What do you think that essence is?" Sunny hesitated. The essence of combat, what might it be? If it was some other legacy, he would have been tempted to say something stupid like honor, valor, or duty. But he already knew that Nephi's did not fit into the image of a noble aristocrat he had in his mind. She wasn't someone who followed empty words. After a minute or so, Cassie finally answered, "Victory." And almost at the same time, Sunny said, "Survival." Changing Star shook her head. "No." Then she rubbed her neck and pierced them with a cold, fierce gaze. "The essence of combat is murder." Cassie flinched and opened her eyes wide. Sunny frowned a little. Nephi's, however, did not seem to care. In the same calm tone, she continued, "At the core of it, there's only this. You are trying to kill your opponent, and they are trying to kill you. In the end, one of you will be killed, and the other one will be the killer. Everything else is just noise." Her words sank deep into Sunny's heart and reverberated there, causing something inside of him to resonate and awaken. Style doesn't matter, weapons don't matter, reason and intent do not matter. The only thing that matters is to be the last one standing. In this way, anything you do in combat must be viewed as only serving one of two purposes, either to kill your enemy or to prevent the enemy from killing you. Nephi's lowered her eyes. "If you can understand that, you will have enough clarity to master the mind." After that, Sunny couldn't fall asleep for a long while. He lay on the cold stone, looking into the darkness and thinking about what Nephi's had taught them. Repetition, experience, clarity. These were the three keys to becoming a fearsome warrior. All three were important, but the last one was the most vexing. Was it really how Changing Star had said? Was there nothing at the core of being a warrior than a cold will to kill? Intuitively, he felt that it was indeed so. This ruthless truth was, in a sense, an amalgamation of all his life experiences. After all, for someone like him, life was nothing but a constant battle for survival. Someone always won and someone always lost. The former got to live for a few more days, the latter, no one cared what happened to them. Of course, life was life and combat was combat. To most people, they weren't one and the same. But what about the awakened? The sole purpose of their existence was to fight against the nightmare creatures. Very few could escape that fate. After coming to the academy, Sunny allowed himself to think that he had escaped the fate of always having to struggle at the edge of survival. But now, it seemed like he had just exchanged one battle for another. This was an uncomfortable thought. However, if he looked at it from a different perspective, did it actually mean that he always had a crucial advantage? Most of those chosen by the spell were forced to somehow adjust to this merciless way of life, but he had always lived like this. Was he actually one of the few perfectly suited to be an awakened? With this thought, Sunny fell asleep. In the early morning, he was awakened by a piercing scream. Chapter 43, Repetition. Sunny was on his feet even before fully waking up. Somehow, Azure Blade was already in his hand. His shadow was hovering beside him, ready to either wrap itself around the sword in case he needed to attack or around his body, in case it was already too late for that. He tried to understand what was going on. Nephi's was nearby, her longsword raised in a defensive stance. Cassie. "Where's Cassie?" Fearing what he might see, giant tentacles reaching for them from the darkness, he looked around. The eastern horizon was just beginning to show the first hints of dawn, adding a tiny shade of gray to the blackness of the world. In that blackness, there were no signs of danger. Finally, he saw Cassie. Blind girl was stumbling at the edge of the platform with a horrified expression on her face. With her blonde hair in a mess, she was stretching her hands out, clearly lost in space. Of course, there were no walls for her to find. The platform was open to the elements, and the only thing waiting for Cassie was a plunge into the dark, tumultuous waters. Before Sunny knew what he was doing, he was already running. That wasn't a very smart thing to do after all. He did not know what had caused Kasha to scream, and if there was some hidden danger nearby. Plus, it was still too dark for Nephi's to see. His sudden lunge could have caused her to lash out with the sword before asking questions. All of these were good reasons to wait and observe first, but in an uncharacteristic and completely irrational manner, Sunny acted before thinking. He caught Cassie moments before she took a step off the platform, and holding her tightly in his arms, dragged the blind girl back. "I got her," Sunny yelled, letting Changing Star know that there was no need to stab him with a sword. And then in a quiet voice, he said to Cassie, "I got you, it's all right, everything is fine, calm down." He felt the girl's body trembling and looked around again, trying to understand what had scared her so much, but there was nothing. Nephi's was listening to the sea for the same reason. After a few seconds, she asked, "Do you see anything?" Sunny helplessly shook his head. "No." He helped Cassie sit down in the center of the platform. While Nephi stood guard above them, he looked the blind girl over to make sure that there were no wounds on her body. Everything seemed to be fine. "She's not hurt anywhere." Changing Star looked down. Although her face remained indifferent, he could tell that she was a bit flustered. After a second or two, she asked in something that might have been her version of a calming tone. It sounded pretty much exactly the same as usual. Cassie, what happened? Magically, that did seem to calm the blind girl down a little, at least enough for her to speak in a quivering voice. Cassie extended one hand and pointed down. The head I saw, oh gods. Sunny frowned and looked at Nephi's. Did she see a vision, the past? The tall girl was silent for a moment. I don't know, it never happened before. Both of them turned to Cassie, not sure what to do. Since there was no apparent danger around, they took turns trying to calm the horrified girl down. However, after that one sentence, she fell quiet and refused to speak again. Nothing seemed to help. After a while, Nephi sighed. Let's leave her be for now, maybe she needs time. Sunny was about to retort, but truth be told, he didn't have any ideas either. In the end, he just nodded. Okay, I'll keep an eye on her. Changing Star, however, had other ideas. As the sun was rising and the surging sea was receding, Nephi chose to give Cassie some space and led Sunny to the edge of the platform. However, she made sure to always have the blind girl in the periphery of her vision. Cassia sat hugging her knees. Her eyes were closed, but small tremors that periodically ran through her body betrayed that she was awake. Sunny's eye twitched. Are you sure it's okay to leave her like this? Nephi's gave him a complicated look. Yes. Then after some thought, she added, Cassie is strong. Sunny wasn't sure how to answer. If Changing Star considered someone to be strong, then they most likely were. However, strong was the last word that came to his mind when he thought about the delicate, beautiful, blind girl. Wasn't she someone who constantly needed their help? But then again, there were different kinds of strength. Cassia was still alive and sane despite her debilitating flaw. How many people could have done the same? If you say so. Then Nephi's made him summon the Azure Blade. After studying it for a while, she nodded and took her longsword out of the air. Despite its size, it was an elegant weapon. The narrow, double-edged blade was much longer than that of the Azure Blade, with an incredibly sharp, symmetrical tip. The whole blade, as well as the simple cross-shaped guard in the pommel, seemed to be made out of silver and reflected the pale morning light. The handle was tightly wrapped in black leather. Putting the two swords side by side, Nephi spoke. Your sword can be used with one hand, but its true potential can only be revealed when held in both. It is created primarily for cutting and severing, hence the higher center of gravity. However, it can thrust as well. Then she gestured to hers. My sword is a bit more versatile. It is created for both cutting and thrusting, and it has a double edge. However, the principle of wielding these two swords is effectively the same. She took the sword in both hands, placing one near the guard and another near the pommel. Then, she performed a downward slash. They are both leverage-based weapons. When held with two hands, one hand pushes. She pushed the sword down with the hand near the guard, while the other hand pulls. The hand near the pommel simultaneously pulled the handle up, giving the blade a tremendous boost in speed. This is how you generate force and perform powerful strikes. Now, your turn. Sunny looked at his sword and gripped it with both hands, mimicking Nephi's pose. Then he raised it and slashed down, making sure to enhance the force of the strike with his lower hand. Changing Star observed him. You need to understand that a strike doesn't come from the hands, it comes from your whole body. Power comes from your feet, your hips, your core, your shoulders, and is only then transmitted to your hands, like this. She demonstrated the downward slash again. This time, Sunny paid attention to the overall stance and movements of every part of Changing Star's body, as opposed to only the sword. He wasn't a novice to fighting. Instinctively, he already knew how to deliver a proper punch, even if before there wasn't a lot of strength in his body. The principles of striking with a sword were largely the same, so Sunny quickly understood the overall concept. He performed the simple downward slash a few more times. After each time, Nephi gave him pointers and corrected his mistakes. Sometime later, she was finally satisfied with his form. Good. Sunny smiled, proud of his achievements. Nephi looked at him thoughtfully and nodded. Now do it 1,000 more times. The smile froze on Sunny's face. 1,000, did she say 1,000? He blinked. Sorry, how many times? Changing Star tilted her head and thought for some time. Well, we don't have much time today, so yes, only 1,000. Ha ha ha, only 1,000 day. Sunny forced himself to sound polite. I see, all right. As Nephi walked back to sit with Cassie, he turned to the sea and raised his sword. 1. The azure blade whistled as it cut the air. He raised it again. 2. Push and pull, this is how you generate force. 3. Strike with your whole body, not just your hands. 4. As Sunny raised his sword and slashed down, over and over again, only one thought eventually remained in his mind. Repetition, experience, clarity, repetition. By the time he was done performing 1,000 strikes, Cassie was finally ready to speak. Chapter 44, Cassie's dream. With pretty much every muscle in his body sore, Sonny walked over to the girls and fell on the ground. After catching his breath, he looked at Kasia. "Cassie, do you feel better?" Several seconds later, the blind girl slowly nodded. "That's a relief." He shifted and hesitated for a bit. Kasia didn't look too well. Her face was still very pale, with a distant, dazed expression on it. Her body at least was no longer trembling. Sonny wasn't very good at talking to people, let alone placating them. He wasn't sure what to say. He cast a gaze at Nephi's and sighed inwardly. Who knew that one day he would turn out to be the most sociable person for as far as the eye could see? What a joke. "Can I have some water?" Cassie turned to him and scowled as though confused by the question. Then, she suddenly gasped and opened her eyes wide. Oh, sorry, yes, of course." She summoned the limitless water bottle and offered it to Sonny. He took it with a grateful smile and greedily drank a few gulps before giving the bottle to Nephi's. Eventually, it returned to Cassie. "You drank some too." After she did, he awkwardly patted the blind girl on the shoulder. "Everything seems to be fine now. Did you dream of another vision? You can tell us if you want." Cassie hesitated for a bit before saying, "I don't know, maybe it was just a nightmare." Sonny and Nephi's exchanged glances. They both doubted that what Cassie saw was a simple nightmare. After all, people usually did not dream in the dream realm. The blind girl, meanwhile, continued. "I don't really remember, it's all in fragments." Sonny carefully considered his words, not wanting to pressure Cassie too much. "You can just tell us what you remember. Maybe we'll be able to make sense of it together." Kasia sighed and tentatively nodded. After a long pause, she finally found the courage to speak. "First, I saw a boundless darkness locked behind 7 seals. Something vast was churning in the darkness. I felt like if I directly saw it, I would lose my mind. As I watched, terrified, the seals broke one after another until only one remained, and then that seal broke too." She trembled a little. "After that, I don't know. It was as though my mind shattered into 1,000 shards, each shard reflecting its own image. Most of them were dark and scary, some I have already forgotten. The other." Cassie fell silent, remembering. "I saw the human castle again, only this time it was at night. There was a lonely star burning in the black skies, and under its light the castle was suddenly consumed by fire, with rivers of blood flowing down its halls. I saw a corpse in a golden armor sitting on a throne, a woman with a bronze spear drowning in a tide of monsters, an archer trying to pierce the falling sky with his arrows." Finally she looked up, her face full of horror. "In the end I saw a colossal, terrifying crimson spire. At its base, 7 severed heads were guarding 7 locks, and at the top, a dying angel was being consumed by hungry shadows. When I saw the angel bleed, I suddenly felt as though something so precious that it can't be described with words was taken from me." Her voice became quieter. "Then I felt so much sorrow, pain, and rage that what little remained of my sanity seemed to disappear. That was when I woke up, I think." Nephi's and Sonny remained silent for a while, trying to make sense of what Cassie had told them. Even if Nephi's had an idea, she didn't show it. Sonny, however, was totally lost. He couldn't even begin to decipher the hidden meaning behind the vision, if it even was one. Previously, Cassia's vision about the castle was pretty much straightforward. It showed her a human fortress and even the direction in which it was situated. This time, however, her dream was disjointed, full of weird symbolism and vague, uncertain images, much more like a charlatan's prophecy than a vision gained through an aspect ability. Finally, he sighed. "Maybe it actually was just a nightmare. Your previous visions weren't like this, right?" Cassie silently shook her head. Sonny scratched the back of his head. "Well, people don't usually dream in the dream realm, but you do. Perhaps seeing a random nightmare once in a while is a side effect of your ability." The blind girl turned to him, a faint relief written on her face. "You really think so?" He hesitated, trying to find the right words. "Why not? It's a possibility." Inwardly, however, he felt uneasy. Dying angel being consumed by shadows. Why does it sound so ominous? I should try and stay away from angels in the future. Gee, what has become of my life? A sentence like that doesn't even sound insane anymore. With that, they were finally ready to welcome a new day. Some time later, they were sitting on the western edge of the stone platform, looking at the scavengers below. Sonny's shadow was busy scouting a path to the next high landmark. Were there always that many? Sonny glanced at Nephi's and shook his head. No, there were much more. They seemed to be almost done with the carcass. I doubt it will last until nightfall. Which meant that by tomorrow, all these beasts would be roaming the labyrinth, making it hard for the 3 sleepers to make any progress. It would be best to leave today and put some distance between themselves and the horde before the scavengers were done with their feast. However, without scouting a path in advance, there was a chance of not making it to safety in time. Both options were risky. Nephi's frowned, seemingly thinking the same. After a while, she said, "I don't want Cassie to spend another night near this statue. Let's leave now." Sonny thought for a while, then opened his mouth to offer his own opinion. However, a sudden commotion below prevented him from speaking. Down at the bottom of the disappearing sea, amidst mounds of broken coral, the carcass of the giant shark-like monster, the remaining half of it, to be precise, was almost stripped of meat, and between its white bones something was shimmering in the mud. Two extremely large, luminescent crystals. Sunny's eyes widened. Are those? Yes, shards of two transcendent soul cores. Transcendent, two of them. Suddenly he was simultaneously filled with greed and fear. Greed because of how rare and precious transcendent soul shards were. Fear because the giant shark turned to be a corrupted devil, at least. One corrupted devil, if not stopped by a saint or a large number of awakened, could potentially destroy an entire city. Sunny belatedly realized that he was much closer to death on that first night than he had previously thought. Should we wait and listen? He stared at Nephi's and then obediently listened to the distant, barely audible clamor of the scavengers. After a while, he noticed some disharmony in it. Nephi's suddenly tensed up. There. He pointed in the direction of the labyrinth. After concentrating on it, Sunny was finally able to notice two massive shadows stepping out of a particularly wide passage. A second later, the creatures casting those shadows appeared in sight. Sunny gulped. Damn. Monsters looked like the scavengers, but not quite. To start with, they were much larger, towering above the surroundings at more than 3 meters of height. Their carapace seemed to be thicker. It was colored in deep black and scarlet, like an ancient armor drenched in blood. Here and there, vicious-looking spikes were growing out of the carapace, making their every move much more dangerous. Additionally, instead of heavy pincers, their upper arms ended with long, curved, terrifying bone scythes. Sunny felt cold sweat running down his spine. What the hell are those things? Nephi's tilted her head. Monsters, I guess. Nightmare creatures with one soul core were called beasts. They were dangerous and strong, but mindless. If they were able to develop or were created with a second core, they became monsters. Monsters were much more devastating and possessed some rudimentary, warped form of intelligence. They were the next step in a nightmare beast's evolution. And these two seemed to be bigger, deadlier versions of carapace scavengers. Sunny and Nephi's watched as the two monsters approached the carcass. The scavengers were visibly afraid of them, rushing to get out of the way. Those who were too slow were mercilessly thrown to the side or cut apart by the bone scythes. Rivers of azure blood were flowing into the mud. What are they doing? Did they come to absorb the soul shards? Finally, the monsters reached the carcass. Each of them took one of the shards. However, instead of absorbing them, they simply turned around and carried the precious crystals away. The scavengers made way, following the shards with their little, hungry eyes. Sunny blinked and looked at Nephi's. Do we still leave now? Changing Star frowned and hesitated. A few moments later, she shook her head. No, we'll go tomorrow. Then she turned west and observed the retreating monsters. Get your shadow to follow these two back. Chapter 45, Sound of Laughter. Because of the shadow fragments Sunny had absorbed in the last few days, the range of shadow control has increased a little. However, it was still far from being enough to explore deep into the labyrinth. He only got the general direction in which the two large monsters were moving. They were going west. After telling this to Nephi's, there was pretty much nothing else for him to do. In the end, Sunny decided to simply rest. The next day was promising to be full of hardships and danger, so it was in his best interest to let his body recover as much as it could. Sometime later, Sunny was lying on his back, staring at the gray sky. Cassie was sitting beside him, lost in her thoughts. Nephi's was meditating. At least that's what it looked like. She might as well have been asleep for all Sunny knew. After a while, Cassie turned to him. Sunny. He tilted his head to look at her. Yeah. The blind girl hesitated. Do you think we'll be able to return home? Sunny glanced at her and furrowed his brow. A few seconds later, he turned away and looked at the sky again. Sure. Cassie smiled. You really think so? Why? What's with all these questions? He sighed and tried to find the right words. Because of her. He pointed at Nephi's, knowing that Cassie won't see it. There was no one else on the stone platform, though, so it was pretty obvious who he was referring to. I'm also not someone to die easily. In fact, I'm willing to bet that you couldn't have found a better duo of sleepers to escort you across the dream realm. If anyone can survive this, it's us. So, yeah, I think that our chances of making it back are pretty high. Cassie suddenly giggled. Aren't you a little too full of yourself? You were in the second to last place. Sunny shrugged. That's only because someone smart told me to keep a low profile. Otherwise, I would have ranked higher. Then with a grin, he added. Much higher, third to last at least. Blind girl couldn't help but laugh. The melodic sound of her laughter made Sunny feel much better. He had not heard anything like that ever since coming to the dream realm. It was nice to see that people were still able to preserve a bit of mirth even in this hellish place. Come to think of it, this was the first time he heard Cassie laugh at all. Back in the academy, she was always dull and bleak. After this sudden outburst, Cash's expression slowly turned wistful. A few seconds later, she asked, What do you miss the most about home? Sunny tried to think of something, but failed. He wasn't sure that he even had a home in the real world. The tiny room he had been renting previously was nothing but a temporary shelter from the rain. As for the real world as a whole, his life there wasn't that pleasant either. Finally, he said, I don't particularly miss anything. Cassie was very surprised. Really, don't you miss your family? Sunny smiled. I don't have a family. Well, I guess I have a sister somewhere, but we haven't seen each other in many years. Oh, the blind girl fell silent. Several seconds later, she said quietly, I miss my family the most. There was longing and sadness in her voice. Sunny didn't know what to say, so he stayed silent. Mom and Dad must be really worried about me right now. No, actually, they wouldn't be worried. They would be heartbroken. They must think that I'm as well as dead already. Sunny glanced at her and sighed. You seem to care about them a lot. Cassie turned to him in confusion. Of course, isn't it normal? Sunny stared at the gray sky. The wind smelled of rain. After a while, he said, I wouldn't know. In the evening, Nephi's made Sunny perform the 1,000 strikes again. After that, they ate the last strips of dried scavenger meat and took turns sleeping, so that one of them could always keep an eye on Cassie. Thankfully, nothing happened during the night. When the morning came and the dark sea retreated, they prepared to leave the giant statue. Nephi's was the first one to climb down. Before that, she had a few words to say. Day will be different from before. There will be much more scavengers roaming in the labyrinth. We might not be able to create an ambush or avoid fighting several of them at once. She looked at Sunny. If anything happens, your job is to bring Cassie away. We can retreat by using passages that are too narrow for the scavengers. If we get separated, proceed to the high point by yourselves. Don't wait for me. Do you understand? With a somber expression, he gave her a nod. Nephi's returned it. Good, time is of the essence, so let's go. With that, she began the descent. After Nephi's reached a point 20 or so meters below them, she found purchase and waited. Using the golden rope, Sunny lowered Cassie down. Just like while climbing up, they took turns helping the blind girl. Luckily, climbing down the statue was much easier. Soon they reached the ground. Entering the labyrinth, the trio moved forward with haste. The shadow was ahead of them, scouting for monsters and optimal paths. Despite that, their progress was slow and chaotic. They had to constantly change direction to avoid groups of scavengers, often ending up in dead ends or moving further away from their destination. Sunny, who played the role of the scout and navigator, felt his brains slowly starting to boil. At some point, however, they inevitably ended up in a situation where a fight was unavoidable. There was a large group of scavengers at their heels, and a pair of them blocking the path ahead. Neither of the two groups had noticed the sleepers yet. However, since there were no other passages to turn into, it was only a matter of time. Nephi's considered their options for a few seconds. There was a scowl on her face. Finally, she said, If there's only two, we can take them. Sunny looked at her with uncertainty in his eyes. But there's no time to set up an ambush. He wasn't quite sure how they could fight two scavengers at once. Despite how good of a teacher Nephi's was, he only practiced with the sword for a day. Facing against a scavenger alone was risky. Changing Star shrugged. It's almost the same. I'll attack first. You follow behind in the shadows and finish one off once they turn. Then we kill the second one together. The whole plan was based on the assumption that Nephi's could survive under the onslaught of two scavengers, both attacking her simultaneously. Sunny was very impressed by her prowess, but he wasn't sure that it was possible. There was a large probability that Nephi's would die. He still remembered that she wasn't present in Cassie's first vision. But what else could they do? A bit rattled, Sunny gritted his teeth. All right. After a short pause, Nephi's summoned her sword. Then she stepped forward. Chapter 46, Experience. After finding a good hiding spot for Cassie, Sunny and Nephi's proceeded forward to face the scavengers. Soon, they saw two hulking silhouettes in the distance. With her lips pursed together, Nephi's threw over her shoulder. Keep up. Then, like a runner preparing for a race, she got down on one knee, inhaled deeply, and lunged forward. Damn. Sunny dove into the deep shadow cast by the wall of the labyrinth and followed, running as fast as he could. However, the distance between them kept growing. Suddenly, he remembered walking behind Nephi's as they crossed the bridge to the academy. Was it his fate to always follow behind her? Changing Star's running speed was incredibly fast. She was practically flying through the air, like an arrow let loose from a bow. One of her arms was stretched backward, holding the sword with its point to the ground. The other was cutting the air with each stride. It took the two scavengers a couple of seconds to realize what was happening after noticing her. By that time, she was almost upon them. With madness burning in their eyes and viscous saliva dripping from their mandibles, the monsters screeched and charged forward. Nephi's did not slow down, as though planning to ram them with her body. Sunny's heart skipped a bit. 4 terrifying pincers shot through the air. At the last moment, Nephi's fell backward, falling on her side. The inertia carried her forward as she slid through the mud, passing between the scavengers. Then, she twisted her body and stopped herself by plunging the sword into the ground. A bit slower, and she would have been impaled by one of the scavengers' legs. Crazy, she's crazy. By the time Changing Star got back to her feet, one of the scavengers had already turned around. However, Sunny couldn't see what was going on as his sight was blocked by the bulky carapace creatures. He only heard the sound of chitin striking against steel. There was no time to worry about that anyway, since he had his own problems to solve. Due to the insane maneuver that Nephi's had pulled off, the second scavenger lagged a little behind the first one. It was just about to turn around when Sunny finally got close enough to launch an attack. Silently cursing, he ran up a narrow protrusion on the coral wall and jumped, aiming to pierce the weak point at the scavenger's back from above. His shadow was already wrapped around the azure blade. But at the last moment, the scavenger suddenly moved, slightly turning its torso to the right. The blade missed the concave spot where the armor plates connected and instead hit one of them square in the center, sliding helplessly across adamantine chitin. Crap. Instead of killing the beast with one decisive blow, Sunny ended up dealing no damage at all. What's worse, he landed right on top of the scavenger, practically hugging it from behind. In the next moment, the scavenger shook its carapace, throwing the irritating human off. Sunny flew sideways and crashed into the labyrinth wall, feeling breath being knocked out of him. Suffocating and disoriented, he fell gracelessly into the mud. Not good. By some instinct, Sunny rolled to the side. Something tore past him and hit the wall, sending pieces of crimson coral flying through the air. Then he was lifted into the air and thrown backward. But by that time, however, he had already come to his senses. Twisting his body, Sunny managed to land on his feet and take a few steps back without falling. In the next second, his sword was in front of him, held in both hands just like Nephi's had taught him. The scavenger was already charging at him, with a menacing fire burning in its eyes. Repetition experience. Shadow flowed from the azure blade to his hand, then spread to his arm, shoulder, and then finally covered his whole body. Sunny instantly felt stronger, faster, more resilient. But was it enough? No. To survive, he would definitely also need some luck. One pincer flew at him from the right, the other from the left. There was no time to retreat or dodge sideways, so instead, Sunny did something that made every instinct in his body scream in protest. He jumped forward, closing the distance to the charging monster. The pincers clashed together with a loud crack behind his back. Instinct or not, it was the only logical step. After all, the attack range of his sword was much shorter than that of the scavenger. He could only fight back by getting close. Before the beast had time to react, Sunny did what he had recently done thousands of times. His muscles moved even before his mind gave the command. With one fluid motion, he raised the sword over his head and slashed downward, pushing with one hand while pulling with the other. His whole body moved in concert to deliver a powerful blow. The azure blade whistled as it cut the air. Then, it hit the joint of one of the scavenger's front legs and cleaved right through it, severing the limb entirely. Blue blood sprayed everywhere. Sunny had less than a second to be amazed. I actually did it. But there was no time to be distracted. Due to the loss of its front leg, the scavenger lost balance for a moment, careening forward and down. However, he had 7 other legs. This wasn't going to last long. Coincidentally, though, at this exact moment, his other front leg slid in the mud, bringing the monster even further down. Sunny did not waste this chance. Taking a step forward, he thrust the azure blade up, pushing it into the scavenger's mouth. A severed mandible fell to the ground as the monster impaled itself on the sword with its own weight. The massive body of the nightmare creature convulsed before falling still. It was dead. Sunny slowly exhaled, only now feeling the pain in his chest and at the back of his head. He carefully touched it and grimaced. His hand came back wet with blood. At least I'm alive. You have slain an awakened beast, carapace scavenger. Your shadow grows stronger. You have. With no time to listen to the spell, Sunny tugged on the sword to dislodge it from the monster's head and hurried to help Nephi's. However, it was too late. The other scavenger was lying in the mud, clearly dead. His limbs were still twitching, indicating that the fatal blow was delivered just moments ago. It seemed like Nephi's had managed to sever its spine by piercing the weak spot at the base of the beast's torso with her longsword. He couldn't see the silver-haired girl behind the bulky carcass. As Sunny approached it, he heard the sound of rugged, strained breathing. Then a shaky voice came from behind the scavenger. Don't come any closer. In the deathly silence of the battle's aftermath, Changing Star's voice sounded strange and subdued. Sunny suddenly felt as though someone had squeezed his heart in a fist. Steeling himself, he took another step forward. Nephi's was standing in front of the dead scavenger, trying to catch her breath after the intense fight. There was a bloody gash on her shoulder. However, it didn't look life-threatening. Sunny's attention, though, was instantly drawn to something else. It seemed that at some point during the fight, the tall girl's makeshift seaweed top came apart, leaving her naked above the waist. She was covering her chest with one arm. Behind the arm squished the supple fullness of her. Sunny flinched as though someone had stung him and hurriedly turned around. His face was burning. Without thinking about it, he even made his shadow look away. An awkward silence followed. After some time, Sunny forced himself to speak. Are you all right? Nephi's was slow to answer. Yes. Good, good, I'll go fetch Cassie then. All right. Feeling as though an army of monsters was chasing him, he walked forward on stiff legs and then quickened his step, barely holding himself from running. Her fault, it's her fault. She should have communicated things clearer. Trying to get the vivid image out of his head, Sunny hurried to the place where Cassie was waiting for them. By the time they returned, Nephi's had already fixed her top and was wearing it as though nothing had happened. However, Sunny couldn't help but feel that the look she gave him was somewhat weird. Forget it. After checking the wound on his head, Changing Star said, It's just a bleeder, nothing serious. Tell me if you feel dizzy and nauseous or have a strong headache though. Since Sunny had none of these symptoms, he kept quiet. Nephi's looked down at his clothes and sighed. Memory. He opened his mouth to say no, but then fell silent. Come to think of it, when he killed the scavenger, the spell did say something else after informing him about the absorbed shadow fragments. At the time, he was too busy to pay it any attention. Let me check. He summoned B runes and quickly found the cluster representing his memories. Memories, Silver Bell, Puppeteer's Shroud, Azure Blade. Nothing new. Then what was the spell talking about? Suddenly he noticed a new set of runes in the neighboring cluster. His eyes widened. Echo's Carapace Scavenger. Chapter 47, Echo, Echo, it's an echo. Sunny couldn't believe his eyes. Echoes were an extremely rare type of reward that Awakened could receive after slaying nightmare creatures. Chances of getting one were very low. In the real world, an echo could be sold for an unimaginable amount of money. That's because they were much more precious than memories. Without delaying it much further, he dove into his sea of soul. There, very few things had changed. A lonely black sun was still hanging above the calm, silent waters. It was orbited by spheres of light that represented his memories. This time there were 3 of them. Just like before, Sunny couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was stealthily moving just beyond the periphery of his vision. However, this time he didn't pay it any attention. He wanted to see his echo. It too was represented by a sphere of light. However, this sphere was much larger and hovered further away from the shadow core. With a thought, he commanded it to descend. The sphere slowly floated down and touched the dark water. As Sunny came closer, walking on the surface of the sea, its radiance slowly faded away, revealing the monster contained within. A hulking, menacing carapace scavenger was calmly standing in front of him. There was no madness in its eyes or any feeling at all, for that matter. After all, it wasn't really alive. It was just an echo. Shining runes appeared in the air around the scavenger. Echo Carapace Scavenger. Echo Type Beast. Echo Core Awakened. Echo Attributes Strong, Armored. Echo Description, a cursed soldier of the Fallen Legion. Before Sunny knew it, a wide grin appeared on his face. That scavenger was now his. It could be summoned and used to fight against his enemies, carry heavy cargo, or perform other tasks. What's more, it was a whole rank above its master, which meant that it was much stronger, more resilient and fearsome than a dreamer with a dormant core should normally possess. With this echo by their side, many things would become easier. Following an impulse, Sunny raised a hand and brushed it against cold, black chitin. He just wanted to touch his new possession. However, the moment his palm touched the scavenger, a strange thing happened. The soul of sea suddenly surged a little, and a new set of runes appeared. Transform Echo into a shadow. Sunny flinched and snatched his hand back. What the hell is that about? He had never heard anything about transforming echoes into something else, let alone shadows. Then again, he had never heard about shadow cores and fragments too. It seems my aspect holds more secrets than I thought. Sunny licked his lips and hesitated, then he cautiously said, Yes. However, nothing happened. A moment later, the runes changed. Not enough shadow fragments to perform a transformation. Shadow fragments required, 24,100. He frowned, disappointed. I see, so there's another use for the fragments. They can either enhance my own core or do something weird to echoes. How do I know which use is more beneficial without knowing what a transformation actually does? An echo was plenty useful by itself. Sunny felt that it would be wiser to concentrate on strengthening himself, at least for now. I'll experiment with it later. With that, he left the Sea of Soul. Since he had spaced out for quite a bit, Nephi's was looking at him with a silent question in her eyes. Sunny grinned. I got an echo. Her pupils slightly widened. Cassie, on the other hand, was more expressive. An echo? You actually got an echo? Yes. Since the larger group of monsters was now minutes away from catching up with them, Sunny didn't waste any time and summoned the scavenger. A hulking beast immediately appeared in front of him, seemingly sewn together from tiny sparks of light. Soon, its black chitin became fully corporeal. Following Sunny's command, it shifted a little and raised its mighty pincers. Nephise observed the echo with an unreadable expression. Then, a corner of her lips slightly curled up. Good. Sunny looked at her with a smile. I think we can task it with carrying Cassie. Outside of battle, it will help us the most. The blind girl's mouth fell open. Carry me like a mount. He chuckled and slapped the scavenger on its carapace. This bad boy can fit a petite girl like you with no problem at all. Trust me, I've been clambering these things a lot for the past few days. It's actually quite spacious on top of them, especially if they're not trying to kill you. Cassie hesitated. Well, okay, if you think it's for the best. Sunny and Nephise helped the blind girl to climb on top of the echo. Then, they used the golden rope to create makeshift reins for Cassie to hold onto. After quickly retrieving soul shards from the dead scavengers, the sleepers hastily left the passage, narrowly avoiding another battle. With Cassie riding comfortably atop the scavenger, their overall speed dramatically increased. Sunny and Nephise were jogging in the front, hoping to recoup the time lost in the first half of the day and reach the high point with an hour or two to spare. From time to time, they had to take detours to avoid fighting groups of carapace monsters. However, with a monster of their own by their side, the mood and mental state of the three sleepers were much better. For the first time since coming to this place, Sunny felt somewhat calm. Of course, this calmness didn't last long. At some point, he noticed that the wind had picked up a bit. Almost simultaneously, Cassie asked them to stop. Nephise and Sunny looked at her with deep frowns. It seemed that they both had a bad premonition. What is it? The blind girl let go of the reins. Do you hear anything? They looked at each other, then shook their heads. No, why? Cassie scowled. Help me get off this thing. After they helped her, she stood motionless for a while, listening. Her scowl deepened. Then the blind girl cautiously kneeled and put her ear to the ground. What did you hear? Cassie licked her lips. It's murmuring. Suddenly, a drop of water fell on Sunny's face. He raised his head and looked at the sky. Their dark, stormy clouds were gathering with unnatural speed. Pretty soon, they were bound to cover it completely, including the sun. And when that happened, his eyes widened. Chapter 48, The Storm. We need to move now. As Nephise turned to him, Sunny grabbed Cassie and helped her stand up. His face was even paler than usual, and there was a panicked look in his eyes. Now help me get her back on the scavenger. The silver-haired girl raised her head and looked at the sky. Soon her expression darkened. Without saying anything, she did as he had asked. Cassie seemed a bit disoriented. She grabbed the reins and helplessly turned to her friend. Neph, what is going on? Changing Star glanced at her. When she eventually spoke, her voice sounded heavy. A storm is coming. Meanwhile, Sunny sent his shadow to climb on top of a tall pillar of coral and looked ahead, trying to understand how far the cliffs they were aiming for were. From the look of it, there was still a considerable distance to go. However, the giant statue was already much further away. Going back now would have been suicide. He turned to Nephise. We're about 3 or 4 kilometers away from the cliffs. Do you think we can make it? She scowled. If we take the most direct route, maybe. Sunny hesitated, then asked. What about the monsters? Changing Star looked ahead and gritted her teeth. We'll have to cut through. That's it, that's the plan. As he was fruitlessly trying to come up with some devious trick to save them, Nephise turned her head and glanced at him, puzzled. What are you waiting for? Run. As they darted forward, heavy drops of rain were starting to fall on the ground. Strong winds were howling between the coral blades, sending bits of mud and seaweed flying. With storm clouds gathering in the sky, sunlight dimmed, and a cold twilight descended upon the labyrinth. Sunny was running with all his might, as though his life depended on it, because it actually did. He was leading their small group, choosing the straightest path toward the cliffs with the help of his shadow. Nephise was a step behind him. The scavenger carrying Cassie was stomping through the mud with its 8 legs in the back. Without the need to avoid monsters and death breathing down their necks, they moved with amazing speed. Side passages and crimson walls were flashing past them in a blur. There was no need to hold back and conserve strength for the long run. If they were late to reach the cliffs by a minute, their lives would be over. They had to give it their all. Sunny was ready to fight a series of bloody skirmishes all along the way, but to his surprise, the inhabitants of the labyrinth did not give them much trouble. The scavengers seemed to be as panicked as they were. The bulky beasts were busy trying to hide inside the coral mounds or burrowing underground. On the rare occasions when one of them showed aggression, a quick slash of the sword or a threatening clack of a pincer was enough to make the monster change its mind. However, no matter how fast they were moving, the storm was faster. The rain quickly turned into a pelting downpour, each drop becoming a torrent. The winds grew in strength, striking against their bodies with enough force to make them stumble. The light dimmed even further, reducing visibility to almost zero. Finally, a blinding bolt of lightning tore through the darkness, followed almost immediately by a deafening thunderclap. In the next moment, the ground under Sunny's feet trembled, causing him to lose balance and fall. He rolled in the mud and tried to stand up, but slipped and fell again. Someone's arm grabbed him by the shoulder and helped him rise. In the darkness of the storm, Sunny saw Changing Star's face. She opened her mouth and shouted, "Don't stop, run." He almost couldn't hear her behind the roaring wind and rain. By the time Sunny began to move, the dark, salty water was already as high as his shins. He gritted his teeth. The sea was coming back. He couldn't determine where the water was coming from, but with each minute it was rising higher. Soon, it was up to his knee, then up to his waist, making running almost impossible. The speed of the group slowed down considerably. It was then, in a sudden flash of lightning, when they saw a dark mass of stone ahead. They had made it to the cliffs. Almost at the same time, a terrible rumbling sound came from the depths of the labyrinth. Turning back, Sunny saw a colossal, crushing torrent of black water rushing through the crimson forest. Some distance away, a tardy scavenger was caught by it and thrown against the coral walls. The unbreakable carapace of the mighty creature cracked and burst open like a rotten egg. "Curses!" He turned to Nephi's. "Time is up, start climbing." She caught him by the arm. "Dismiss your echo." Sunny didn't know whether the scavenger could scale the cliff. In any case, Cassie wouldn't have been able to hold on if it did. He helped the blind girl get down and then sent the monster back to the Sea of Soul. Nephi's lowered herself to let Cassie climb on her back, then tied them together with the golden rope. Not wasting any time, she gritted her teeth and stepped forward to grab onto the wet rocks of the cliff wall. They began the ascent, rushing to get as high as possible before the black torrent hit. Some time later, Sunny screamed, "Brace!" In the next moment, a wall of dark water hit the rocks mere meters beneath their feet. As Sunny held for dear life, the whole cliff shuddered. A few boulders fell from somewhere high above, missing his head only by chance. Somehow, all three of them were still alive. However, things were far from being over. The black water was still rising, now with frightening speed, threatening to swallow them at any second. They had to keep climbing, and they had to be faster than the surging sea. And he cursed as he searched for the next hold to grab onto. To survive, he had to scale the face of the cliff with crazy speed. However, hastily climbing wet rocks was a recipe for disaster. One slip of a hand, and he would plunge down to be crushed against the cliffs, drown, or be eaten by some giant monster. The torrential rain and hurricane wind made everything even worse. And yet there was no choice. He frantically kept climbing, tearing his skin on sharp rocks. Every muscle in his body was in agony. If not for the shadow wrapped tightly around his body, Sunny would have been long dead. But even with its help, the surging dark water was getting closer and closer. Damn it all. No matter how hard Sunny tried, he couldn't win back any distance. Soon, the water was at his feet. The sea slowly swallowed his legs, then his torso. He kept climbing, now fighting against the weight of the water and the force of the tide that was trying to tear him away from the cliff. But it was useless in the end. When the water covered his shoulders, he felt his fingers slipping from the wet rocks. Sunny tried to hold on, but the current was too strong. He was pushed away like a weightless toy, losing any purchase. No. In the last second, a golden rope fell into the water beside him. Shaken, Sunny grabbed onto it and held with all his strength. The rope drew tight and lifted him out of the water. His feet touched the cliff wall again. Not wasting any time, he resumed climbing with the help of the rope. Finally, a strong hand grabbed him from above and dragged his body over the edge of the cliff. Sunny fell to the ground, struggling to breathe. After some time, he looked at Nephi's, who was lying in a similar position to his right, equally as drained. She was still clutching the golden rope in her hand. Cassie was sitting a few steps away from them. He wanted to laugh, but had no strength for it. They survived. Chapter 49, Natural Element. For a few minutes, Sunny simply lay on the ground, letting the rain hit his face. From time to time, a bolt of lightning arced through the skies, drowning everything in blinding light. Other than that, it was almost completely dark. If not for his attribute, he would have had trouble discerning the shapes of Nephi's and Cassie, who were resting nearby. After some time, however, a feeling of uneasiness entered his mind. Something was off. Sunny scowled, trying to understand where that feeling was coming from. Finally, he realized that it was his shadow. It was trying to draw his attention to something. "Please let me rest, I just want to rest." He was too tired to do anything. Both his body and mind were exhausted. However, the shadow was very persistent. It remained adamant. In the end, Sunny moaned and rolled over on his stomach, then slowly stood up. Nephi's turned her head and looked at him. "What is it?" He grimaced. "I don't know yet, something feels wrong." Cassie shivered and got closer to Neph. Following his shadow's warning, Sunny looked around, trying to find any sign of danger in their surroundings. Even with his vision, he couldn't see anything out of place. The upper part of the cliffs was well above the stormy sea, forming a small island. Its surface was rugged and uneven, with several protruding ridges breaking the line of sight. There was a large space between their group and the nearest ridge. That space was littered, seemingly at random, with piles of dirt and tall boulders. Nephi's got up and summoned her sword. "Do you see anything?" Sunny frowned. Not really. At that moment another lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the small island. His eyes widened. The tall boulders surrounding them were massive and irregularly shaped. They were black in color and motionless. That's why Sunny had not recognized them for what they were at first glance. All around them, scavengers were silently lying on the ground. Sunny froze, suddenly consumed by terror. The hairs on the back of his neck bristled and stood up on ends. 1, 2, 3. He lost count because of panic and gritted his teeth. 7, no, 8 of them. It seemed the 3 humans were not the only ones who thought of taking shelter from the dark sea on these cliffs. He trembled. These cliffs were a death trap. Noticing something on his face, Nephi's tensed. Sunny. He slowly turned his head to her and whispered. Don't speak, don't move, just stay where you are. She followed his instructions without asking for the reason. However, a silent question appeared on her face. Cassie did the same. Sunny closed his eyes and breathed in, trying to calm his panicking mind down. There were no hopeless situations. Every problem had a solution. He just had to think of one. Scavengers did not attack yet. Maybe they were asleep or patiently waiting out the storm, trying not to move in fear of attracting more terrifying monsters. Maybe they simply did not notice the humans. After all, it was unknown how well these creatures could see. Were they able to see in the dark? Probably not, or at least not as well as he could. There was still hope. Sunny opened his eyes and looked at the small island again, but this time his perspective was different. He saw the deep darkness, the clamor of the storm that drowned out most of the sounds, the large distance between the scavenger. This was his territory. It was perfectly suited for a murderous shadow. Didn't he dream of becoming a silent assassin? Well, here was his chance. He just had to execute each step perfectly, crawl through the darkness, strike without alerting the enemy, kill each of them with one precise blow. Rinse and repeat. He already knew their strengths and weaknesses. All that was left was to put that knowledge to practice. And even if he makes a mistake, there were other means to fall back onto. Echo and Nephi's could do their part if he were to land himself in danger. Yes, that could work. It had to. Sunny looked at Changing Star and Cassie. I'll take care of this. Before they could react, he seemed to dissolve into the shadows. Under the cover of darkness, Sunny sneaked forward. His steps were soft and measured, his breathing controlled. He quickly determined the optimal order of attack to minimize the chance of being discovered and proceeded to the first target, a hulking scavenger that was the furthest away from the pack. Hidden in the shadows, Sunny suddenly felt calm and focused. He felt as though he was finally in his natural element. As the looming silhouette of the scavenger approached, he slowed down and circled around his target. The monster did not move, oblivious to the lurking threat that was drawing closer with each second. Sunny held his breath and prepared to attack. He only had one chance. Do it right. With that thought, he silently lunged forward. 1 step 2, Sunny jumped and easily landed on the monster's carapace. The azure blade was already in his hand, its steel dark. A moment later, it plunged into the weak point on the scavenger's back, piercing the chitin and destroying its brain. The quiet crack of the breaking carapace was quickly washed away by the rain. It was done. Sunny felt a sense of triumph appear in his heart and quickly suppressed it. This wasn't the right time to celebrate. 7 targets were still waiting for him in the darkness. He retrieved his sword and jumped down from the scavenger's corpse. Then Sunny frowned. Why was the spell silent? It didn't announce his kill, nor the absorption of the shadow fragments. Feeling his skin crawl, Sunny turned around and looked at the scavenger. At first, he was afraid that the beast was still alive, but that wasn't the case. It was as dead as could be. However, on closer inspection, Sunny noticed something that he had missed before. And when he did, his face paled. Chapter 50, Death Trap. The scavenger was dead. However, it wasn't Sunny's blade that killed it. While circling the target, he was focused on staying unnoticed and not alerting the enemy to his presence before reaching the optimal position for an attack. After that, he only saw the monster's back. That's why he didn't notice the terrible wound that ran from the top of the creature's torso to its segmented legs, obscured by the rain. The unbreakable carapace was cut open like a tin can. The scavenger's flesh and mangled organs could be easily seen through the large gap, oozing azure blood. It streamed down only to be washed away by the storm. Sunny gulped. He might have felt awkward about performing a perfect ambush on a long-dead monster, if not for the fear of whatever had killed it in the first place. Looking around, he hesitated and summoned the azure blade back, then wrapped himself in the shadow. Small island was silent except for the howling of the wind. The rain was still falling down, forming a constant veil that hid away all details and distant objects. A rare flash of lightning sometimes flooded this bleak world with stark whiteness. Then a thunderclap would come, making the skies tremble. With cold fright settling deep into his bones, Sunny cautiously moved to the next scavenger. He could tell from some distance that it was also dead, but had to come closer and make sure. Indeed, he was right. The creature was almost severed in half by the unknown assailant. Its wet innards were lying on the ground in a messy pile. The darkness had long ago stopped being comforting, becoming terrifying and oppressive instead. Sunny shivered. By the time he checked on all 8 monsters and confirmed that they were all dead, he was nauseous and scared out of his wits. When Sunny had first realized that the black shapes were, in fact, scavengers, he thought that the situation was as bad as it could get. Now, he wasn't sure anymore. In fact, he was pretty convinced that things went from bad to worse. Standing near the last scavenger, Sunny observed his surroundings and thought about returning to Neff and Cassie. Maybe the terrifying killer had already left the island. They could just hide and hope for the best. He wouldn't be alone, at least. However, not knowing what kind of danger was hiding in the darkness would drive him insane long before the morning came. Plus, with his fated attribute, hoping for the best was a fool's errand. That's why, although his body was covered in cold sweat, Sunny gritted his teeth and slowly walked toward the ridge that was obscuring the rest of the island from him. Coming close, he started climbing, trying to be as quiet as possible. The ridge wasn't very high, so he was able to scale it without much effort. Sticking close to the rocks, he raised his head a look down. Then he immediately wanted to let go and fall to the ground. Right beneath him, just a few meters away, a dark silhouette was outlined against the rocks. It was much larger than the scavengers, with jagged spikes growing out of its thick carapace. Its chitin was black and crimson, like an ancient armor splattered with fresh blood. Instead of pincers, 2 terrifying bone sides were protruding from the joints of its arms. Each one was long and sharp enough to split a scavenger in 2. Sunny froze, afraid to move. He even stopped breathing. So that's the killer. It was one of those monsters that they had seen retrieving the transcendent soul shards from the giant shark's carcass, or another of their kind. He remembered how the 2 creatures had cut through the horde of scavengers, killing or throwing aside any beast that got in their way. Slaughtering just 7 of them would not pose a problem for something that deadly. Not to mention getting rid of 3 sleepers. Careful not to make a sound, Sunny slowly lowered himself down. His whole body was trembling. Moving his arms and legs with utmost precision, he began climbing down from the ridge, praying not to be heard, sensed, or noticed in some other way. Luckily, the monster remained oblivious to his presence. Reaching the ground, Sunny took a few steps back, still facing the ridge. He had to force himself to turn around. Feeling as though his back was being pierced by invisible needles, the young man stealthily moved in the direction where he had left his companions. A couple of minutes later, he returned to Nephi's and Cassie. The girls were tense and nervous, waiting for his return in the darkness. Before coming out of the shadows, Sunny let them know that he was approaching.
It's me.
Nephi's moved, lowering her sword a little. Her face was a little grim. What is the situation? She said, careful to keep her voice low. Sunny slowly exhaled, finally feeling a bit safer. For the first time, he was genuinely happy not to be alone in this cursed place. There are 8 scavengers around us, but they're all dead. The killer is one of those big monsters we saw, the thing with the crimson pattern on its carapace and sides instead of pincers. It's hiding from the storm beneath a stone ridge not far from here. Bolt of lightning flashed, illuminating everything around. In its aftermath, it looked as though 2 white sparks ignited in changing Star's eyes. Soon, the reflection was gone, leaving them gray and inscrutable again. She tilted her head and whispered, as though talking to herself. An awakened monster. Sunny licked his lips. Yeah, so what should we do? Nephi's thought for a while, leaning on her sword. Then she looked at him and said, Kill it. Sunny stared at her, lost for words. Finally, he collected himself and said the first thing that came to his mind. Are you nuts? The idea of fighting that thing was pretty ridiculous, if not completely insane. Realizing that his words might have sounded a bit rude, he cleared his throat and added, I mean, have you thought this through? How are we supposed to kill that monstrosity? Nephi slowly inhaled. It's not a question of thinking things through, we simply have no choice. She glanced at Cassie, who was listening to them with a pale face, and explained. You can't leave the cliffs before morning, and neither can the monster. However, once the sun rises, it will easily see us and attack. Then our only advantage, the element of surprise, will be gone. If we have to fight it anyway, it's better to be the ones initiating the fight. Changing Star looked around and added. It's not completely dark yet, although barely I can still see. Once the night comes, this won't be the case, so we will have to attack it first and do it soon.
Sunny shook his head.
This still doesn't explain how we are going to kill it. That thing just dispatched 8 scavengers like it was nothing. We are not its opponents. We don't even know its weaknesses. Nephi's frowned. After a short pause, she said, It's just an awakened monster. Sunny couldn't help but stare at her in disbelief. Do you mean just an awakened monster? Have you forgotten that all 3 of us are only sleepers? Dormant humans are not supposed to be able to deal with awakened beasts, let alone monsters. The fact that we can reliably kill scavengers is already abnormal. She looked back at him, undisturbed, and simply answered, But we are abnormal. Sunny stood there with his mouth open, not knowing what to say.
Nephi sighed.
You and I both are not exactly ordinary sleepers, aren't we? Don't try and deny it. Someone ordinary simply would not have survived in this place. He frowned, not happy about her line of thought. Meanwhile, Changing Star continued. You me plus the awakened beast you have as an echo, plus the advantage of a surprise attack. I'm not saying that it will be easy. We might die, but there's a good chance that we won't. She looked down at the silvery blade of her sword and added after a couple of seconds. In any case, as I have already said, we don't have a choice. Sunny gritted his teeth trying to find a logical retort. However, her reasoning seemed unassailable. He just had a really bad feeling about fighting that monster. In the ensued silence, Cassie, who had been quiet all this time, suddenly spoke. You are forgetting about the main advantage we have over that thing. Both of them looked at her, surprised. The blind girl turned to face them and slightly lifted her head. We are intelligent and the monster is not. Her words echoed in the darkness. Sunny sighed. It seemed that a fight with the bone-scythed monster was inevitable. Some time later, he was standing in the darkness, looking at the terrifying creature in front of him. His expression was grim and somber. Tightly gripping the azure blade, Sunny slowly inhaled. The ominous feeling he had before was still there, now stronger than ever. I don't like this. With this thought, he exhaled and raised his hand. Chapter 51. Carapace Centurion monsters did possess some rudimentary intelligence, however, they could not compare to humans. At their core, they were still predators who acted mostly on instinct. Their cunning was beastly in nature and was not that hard to overcome. That gave the three sleepers a chance to leverage their advantage. After finalizing the plan, they made some preparations. A changing star was getting ready. Sunny had retrieved the soul shards from the 8 dead scavengers. After delivering them to the silver-haired girl, he watched as she brought them to her chest and crushed them in her fist one after another, absorbing the essence of each shard into her soul core. After a few minutes, when the changes caused by the absorption were over, Nephi's opened her eyes and slowly inhaled. The sleeper consuming the shards of 8 awakened beasts was equivalent to slaying 16 dormant creatures. While not tremendous, it was still a significant boost in physical ability. Her body had become stronger, faster, enhanced in every way. They were going to need every bit of that strength to survive. Because of how attuned Nephi's was to her physicality, getting accustomed to her new limits did not take long. Very soon, she looked at him and asked, Are you ready? Sunnyside glanced at his shadow, hoping to get some moral support. The shadow pretended to not notice and ignored him. Disloyal bastard. As ready as I'll ever be. Nephi's nodded and turned to Cassie. There was nothing really to say. They had already discussed everything there was to discuss, and empty words could not make the blind girl worry any less. Come to think of it, Sunny wouldn't have wanted to trade places with her, even though out of the 3 of them she was the only one who didn't have to risk her life in combat. Facing the enemy, no matter how terrifying, was better than waiting powerlessly for the outcome, knowing that there's nothing you can do to change it. From that point of view, he was actually the lucky one. Cassie tried to put on a brave face. She turned to Nephi's and forced a smile. Go and kill that thing. Maybe you'll finally get something decent to wear and stop making me feel so guilty. A corner of Changing Star's lip curled up. Okay. After that, she turned to Sunny and returned to her usual serious self. Let's go. A few minutes later, he was standing on top of the rocky ridge, looking down at the deadly monster. The shadow was wrapped around his body, enhancing Sunny's physical abilities. Their plan was pretty solid and had a high chance of working. However, he still couldn't get rid of the ominous feeling that this was not going to end well. I don't like this. With a sigh, Sunny raised his hand and summoned the silver bell. Then he lightly shook it, causing the clear melodic ringing to resound amidst the storm. Immediately, the monster below moved, turning its massive torso around and looking for the source of the sudden noise. As he saw Sunny, a mad crimson flame ignited in its eyes. However, Sunny did not see any of this because he was already facing the other way. As soon as the bell rang, he turned around and jumped down from the ridge without a second of hesitation. The ridge wasn't very tall, but there was still a considerable distance to the ground. Sunny hit the rocks hard and rolled, trying to disperse the force of the impact. As soon as he got back to his feet, he ran, trying to get as far away as possible. A moment later, the ridge exploded behind his back. The monster simply crashed into it with its hulking body, breaking through the layers of rocks as though they were paper. Simultaneously, there was a flash of lightning and a thunderclap, drowning the loud rumble of the falling debris. The creature locked onto retreating Sunny and lunged forward, trying to pierce his body with one of its scythes. Shards of rock were flowing like a torrent from its spiked carapace. Luckily, Sunny was already far enough. Without slowing down, he lowered his body, ran for several more meters, and then turned around. The picture of the monster, who was more than 3 meters tall, rushing at him like a speeding train was enough to make any person falter. However, Sunny stood his ground, raising the azure blade above his head. After all, he was the bait. Half a dozen meters away from him, the monster finally reached their trap. Almost unnoticeable in the darkness and the pouring rain, the golden rope was strung between 2 massive boulders at the height of the creature's leg joints. Earlier, Sunny had lowered his body to run beneath it. Overwhelmed by bloodlust, the monster did not notice the tautly drawn rope and ran into it at full speed. If it was a normal rope, it would, without a doubt, immediately snap. However, the golden rope was a memory, and being incredibly sturdy was one of its attributes. The rocks it was tied to, unfortunately, were quite mundane. They shattered almost immediately. But the damage was already done. With its front legs suddenly jerked backward, the Scythe Slayer lost its balance and crashed into the ground face first, sliding forward on wet stone and leaving behind a shallow trench. Sunny jumped away. The monster was unperturbed. Almost immediately, two bone scythes pierced the ground, jerking its massive body to a stop. In the next moment, unexpectedly swift and nimble for its size, it was already beginning to rise. If it was allowed to stand up, their fates would be sealed. Fortunately, Sunny's echo was faster. The moment the monster fell, it stopped pretending to be one of the dead scavengers, got up and dashed forward. Just as their enemy was about to rise, it jumped on its carapace from behind, pinning the creature down with its weight, and locked its pincers on the creature's arms just beneath the point where the bone scythes began. Despite the fact that the echo was wounded by the spikes growing from the monster's carapace, it succeeded in immobilizing it, at least for a second. A second was enough. As though out of nowhere, Nephis, who was lying in ambush, appeared in front of the monster. Darting between its terrifying scythes, she leaned forward and delivered a devastating thrust with her longsword, putting her whole weight behind it. He didn't know if the awakened monster had the same weak spot on its back as its lesser relatives, the scavengers, had. However, there was no reason to assume that there was no gap between its carapace and torso armor. It was a mechanical issue. Anything that had to be flexible could not be too rigid. The tip of Changing Star's sword plunged into the narrow gap. Then, the sword disappeared into the monster's body, penetrating so deep that its hilt ended up brushing against the chitin. Hell yes, Sunny thought, triumphant. However, in the next second, his expression dimmed. Because the creature didn't even seem to notice the wound that was supposed to be, if not fatal, then at least heavily debilitating. Straining its body a little, it suddenly twisted, throwing the echo off its carapace, and rose to its feet. The bone scythes scraped against the rock as it pulled them out from the ground. Defenseless Nephis was right in front of it, her sword still stuck in the monster's flesh. Oh no! Sunny was too far away to do anything, circling around the massive creature to attack it from behind. The echo was on the ground, still reeling from being thrown off the enemy's back. It didn't seem like it could help either. For the moment, Changing Star was on her own. The scythes pierced the air, aiming for her flesh. At the last moment, however, a pair of pincers locked one of them into an iron grip. That gave Nephis another fraction of a second to react. Letting go of the sword, she dove under the creature's body, hiding in the blind spot of the remaining scythe's attack range. As far as hiding places went, this one wasn't optimal, since all the monster had to do to crush her into a bloody pulp was to lie down. However, in that moment, Nephis had no other choice. This bad. By then, Sunny was already behind the creature. Hoping to buy Neph some time, he brandished the azure blade and slashed down. The sword connected with the joint of one of the monster's rear legs, drawing azure blood. However, unlike how it was in the battle against a scavenger, he failed to completely sever the limb. It was too tough and thick. In the next moment, the leg disappeared from Sunny's field of vision. Crap. As that thought appeared in his mind, Sunny raised his head and looked at the monster. Somehow, it had already turned around and was now facing him, two crimson flames burning with bloodlust in its eyes. Before Sunny could properly react, the sharp tip of a bone scythe hit him in the chest with the force of a siege ram. The only thing he managed to do was to transfer the shadow from his body to the puppeteer's shroud. Because of this lightning-fast decision, the armor held. He wasn't pierced through the heart and impaled on the scythe. However, it was a small consolation. The force of the blow was still enough to make his ribcage cave in and send his body flying through the air like a rag doll. Somehow, Sunny found himself lying on the ground. His body felt weird and he couldn't breathe. Something bitter was flowing from his mouth, making him choke. It was blood. He was drowning in his own blood. Weakly, Sunny tried to move, but his limbs wouldn't listen to him. Only the shadow listened, enveloping his body and delaying the inevitable a little. I'm hurt. With his thoughts moving slower and slower, as though submerged in a dense fog, he looked up, hoping to see the stars. Instead, he saw two burning crimson eyes approaching him from the darkness. Chapter 52, Clarity. In that moment, hovering on the edge of nothingness, Sunny realized that he was about to die. He had to struggle against the fog that permeated his mind, slowing down his thoughts and dampening all emotions. All except for fear. Despite the fact that his body was broken and his mind was paralyzed, some stubborn part of Sunny was still refusing to give up. He wasn't ready to die, at least not without giving his all to survive. He was revolted at the thought of giving the world the satisfaction of the win. That would be so infuriating. Hadn't he told Hero that he was going to survive no matter what, to spite them all? That's right, he might be a shameless liar, but a promise was still a promise. But how was he even supposed to survive? No matter how he looked at it, the situation seemed to be hopeless. As the Scythe Slayer approached, its eyes shining menacingly with bloodthirsty crimson light, Sunny tried to pierce through the fog that enveloped his mind. However, his attempts were aimless and weak. It was hard to find purchase in the fog.
He needed an anchor.
Suddenly, a simple thought caught his attention. It was something that he had repeated 1,000 times, burning it into his mind.
Repetition experience clarity. Clarity.
He remembered what Nephi's had taught him. The essence of combat was murder. Any action performed during a battle served only one of two purposes. It was either to kill your enemy or prevent the enemy from killing you. If he could learn that, he would have enough clarity to master the mind. Back then, he didn't really understand the profound meaning behind the simple word clarity that Nephi's had used, but now, with his mind in shambles, he was finally able to grasp it. Two truths behind the essence and purpose of combat were simple and solid, almost tangible. Even in his half-conscious state, he was able to use them as a stable foundation in the fog. Then, he reformed his mind around this foundation, building it along the stark lines of that truth.
Suddenly, he was able to think again.
What's more, his thoughts were clear and incredibly fast, free of all unnecessary distractions.
This was clarity.
Sunny looked up at the advancing monster, calmly weighing his options. His body was pretty much useless. He couldn't move his limbs at all. The shadow still followed his commands, but it was busy doing an important job, keeping him from dying immediately. Even with its help, he wouldn't be able to last long. But this was a useless thought. He couldn't do anything about it, so there was no sense in wasting time considering it further. With his body immobilized, memories couldn't be used. That left only the echo. The carapace scavenger was going to have to be his only tool to either kill the enemy or prevent the enemy from killing him. Monster was quickly approaching Sunny. Its mandibles moved, viscous saliva flowing down from them in a torrent of transparent mucus. In a flash of lightning, he was able to see and instantly register every spike, every scratch, every abrasion on the creature's carapace. The handle of Changing Star's sword was still protruding from its body, washed in azure blood. What an ugly bastard. Sunny was being hypocritical. Truth be told, with its black carapace painted with crimson patterns and a mighty body specially designed for mayhem and slaughter, the Scythe Slayer looked striking and incredibly menacing. It was almost majestic, in a terrifying, murderous kind of way. Unable to move, he had to look helplessly as the monster closed the distance between them and loomed over Sunny's broken, bleeding body. Its scythes rose into the air, ready to strike down. Looking right into the monster's burning eyes, Sunny thought, "Go to hell, you overgrown bug." The scythe shot toward his body. In the last moment, something massive and furious rammed into the monster from the side, throwing it away. It was Sunny's carapace scavenger. Not bothering with its own safety anymore, the echo entwined itself with the enemy in a chaotic mess of limbs as they rolled on the ground. Despite the fact that it was smaller and weaker, its crazy assault and complete disregard for its own life were enough to give the bigger monster some pause. The echo lashed out with its pincers, ramming them against the creature's carapace in a crazy whirlwind of blows. For a moment, the howling of the wind was drowned out by the clamor of chitin striking against chitin. The Slayer's carapace mostly held, but a couple of cracks did appear on its black surface. However, it was still superior to the scavenger in every way. Even with one of its scythes pinned awkwardly under its body, the monster was more than able to repel the sudden attack. With an angry screech, it sliced with the other scythe, cutting one of the scavenger's pincer arms clean off. Then, it strained its legs and threw the smaller creature away. In the process, the rear leg that was already wounded by Sunny broke off, but the monster didn't pay it any attention. Burning with madness and fury, it untangled its limbs and slowly stood up. Another deafening screech resounded in the howling darkness of the storm, hurting Sunny's ears. Now what, he thought, momentarily lost for ideas. But then something very unexpected happened. As the Slayer moved to finish off the echo, it had to slightly raise and lean its torso back to account for the loss of a rear leg and keep its balance. At that moment, a bolt of lightning landed right in the middle of the small island. With how tall the monster was, the lightning was immediately attracted to the handle of the sword that was still sticking from its body, aimed at the sky at a slight angle. At that moment, Changing Star's longsword suddenly became a lightning rod. Instantly, hundreds of millions of volts of electricity coursed through the Slayer's body. In a blinding flash of light, it was thrown to the ground. Wisps of smoke rose from the cracks in its carapace. In a strange turn of events, arcs of residual electricity danced on the monster's chitin, slowly accumulating on the crimson patterns on it. Under that influence, the crimson pattern changed its color, becoming white and incandescent. Sunny stared at all this in bewilderment. "It's glowing." For a second, he hoped that the monster was dead. But no, a single strike of lightning was not enough to kill a creature like that. Just a few moments after being electrocuted, the Slayer moved, slightly shaking its body. Although it was in a rather bad shape, it was still alive and full of murderous intent. Looking somewhat dazed, the monster gathered its limbs and tried to stand up. Slowly but surely, it was coming back to its senses. The bone scythe scraped against the rocks, helping it rise. However, before it did, Nephise was suddenly right in front of it. Grabbing the hilt of the longsword, she grimaced as the heat burned her hands. Then, she twisted the blade, making the slayer's body twitch, and pulled it out, breaking apart a large portion of its lower torso armor. The monster tried to slash at her with a scythe, but Changing Star was quicker. Dashing to the side, she simultaneously lashed out with her sword. The glowing, white-hot blade caught the creature's arm right below the joint and cleaved through it, sending the terrifying bone scythe flying through the air in a rain of azure blood. The slayer screeched and swatted her away with one of its legs. Nephise was thrown back and rolled on the rocks, losing her grip on the sword. Her eyes momentarily lost focus. The monster, on the contrary, was back to its sense. It seemed as though the sudden pain of losing a limb had shaken it wide awake. Raising to its full height, it opened its ugly mouth and let out a deafening, enraged shriek. Then it lunged toward Neph, with all-consuming hatred burning in its eyes. But it didn't get far. Right as the livid monster was beginning its attack, the battered echo appeared in its path. Its one remaining pincer shot forward, plunging into the wide gap in the armor created by Changing Star's sword. Twisting its arm, the scavenger pushed it inside the enemy's body, wreaking havoc on its innards. In the end, it even lifted the whole monster in the air a little, its pincer going in almost up to the shoulder. The slayer lashed out with its scythe, piercing the echo's chest through. Then it twitched a couple of times and fell still. The scavenger screeched angrily and jerked its pincer, tearing the bigger monster's torso clean off its carapace. Proudly giving the eviscerated enemy one last look, it then staggered and collapsed to the ground. Sunny tiredly dismissed the echo, hoping that it can survive. He wasn't feeling too well. In fact, he was pretty much done for. You have slain an awakened monster, Carapace Centurion. The spell's voice fell uselessly on his deaf ears. It sounded distorted and distant. You have received a memory, Starlight Legion armor. Your shadow grows stronger. I won. Sunny closed his eyes, finally allowing pain and exhaustion to flood his mind. The fog was back, making everything feel like it was happening to someone else. He was tired, and he couldn't breathe. Drowning in blood was not very pleasant. As his conscience began to slip, he heard the sound of someone's hurried steps. And then 2 soft hands gently touched his face. Chapter 53, Immortal Flame. Somewhat surprised, Sunny struggled to open his eyes. As his vision slowly focused, he saw Neph's pale face looming above him. Her short silver hair was wet, sticking close to her skin. She was standing on her knees beside his broken body, caressing his face with her hands. In her eyes, there was a strange expression. It was as though she was frightened, but resigned to something. Her pupils were wide and dark. What? Greeting her teeth, Nephise moved her hands to his collapsed chest and pressed them lightly against it, causing a pulse of pain to radiate through Sunny's body. Then a soft, radiant brilliance suddenly ignited beneath the skin of her palms, reflecting in her gray eyes like 2 dancing white sparks. Almost immediately, Changing Star's face contorted in a grimace of excruciating agony, and she let out a terrible, muffled scream. Her skin became white as a sheet of paper, and as she bit her lower lip, drops of blood soon rolled to her chin. As the radiance grew in intensity, Nephise shut her eyes tightly, tears streaming down her tortured, bloodless face. Sunny, on the contrary, felt like he was in heaven. All pain disappeared from his body, replaced by gentle, all-encompassing warmth. He felt as though he was being cleansed by something pure and sacred. By a white, pristine, purifying flame. Under the influence of the flame, his dying body began to repair itself. His shattered bones were reassembled from the shards. His torn flesh regenerated and became whole again. His collapsed lungs and damaged heart were brought back to life and rejuvenated, instantly turning strong and healthy. Suddenly, he could breathe again. As his chest moved, drawing in a new breath, Nephise flinched away with a harrowing moan. The white radiance beneath her skin dimmed and disappeared, letting the darkness return to its rightful place. Crawling away a few steps, Changing Star stopped, standing on her knees and hands, and violently vomited. Her whole body was shivering uncontrollably, as though on the verge of a seizure. As the shivers died down, she slowly lowered herself to the ground and lay there motionlessly, catching the raindrops with her mouth. Sunny, meanwhile, raised his hands and carefully explored his body. To his surprise, nothing really hurt. It was as though he was never wounded in the first place, let alone almost died. With the help of Nephise and her mysterious aspect ability, he was completely healed. It was a miracle. By the time the storm was over, it was already deep into the night. Sunny, Nephise and Cassie huddled together for warmth and slept as though they were dead, too tired to make someone keep watch. If anything were to happen, the shadow would probably alarm them in advance. If not, so be it, they were just too exhausted to care. Luckily, the rest of the night went without incidents. In the morning, no one was in a hurry to make any plans or suggest leaving the cliffs. They just gathered some meat from the dead carapace centurion and the scavengers, collected the 2 soul shards, and moved to the opposite side of the small island, afraid that the remains would attract some creature's attention. As it turned out, they were right. Not long after the group left the place of the battle, a dark spot appeared in the sky. Soon, it became larger and approached the cliffs, landing near the corpse of the centurion in a whirlwind. Sunny had never seen anything like it. The creature was massive in size, easily weighing twice as much as the carapace monster. Its body was white as a corpse and muscular, like that of a lion. It had 2 mighty paws in the back and 6 in the front, protruding messily out of its wide chest, each ended with long, sharp talons. The neck of the flying monstrosity was covered in long black feathers, as well as its enormous wings. Its head resembled that of a raven, with large round eyes and a terrifying black beak. While they hid behind rocks, the creature feasted on the dead centurion, easily breaking its carapace apart with its talons and beak. Then, satisfied, it grabbed a few scavenger carcasses with its paws and rose back into the air, creating a small hurricane with each flap of its black wings. The creature left the cliffs and flew back the way it came. It was moving west. Following the black dot as it disappeared into the distance, Sunny sighed.
Neff, what do you think that thing is?
Nephise was also looking at the sky. After a few seconds, she lowered her gaze.
I have no idea.
Sunny simply nodded and went about his business. He still had to perform his 1,000 strikes. After making a fire, they roasted the centurion's meat and had a delicious, hefty breakfast. Then, stuffed, the 3 of them lied down and lazily rested. After fighting against 2 scavengers at once, running away and barely surviving the sudden flood, climbing tall cliffs in the middle of a storm and battling an awakened monster, all done in a single day, they deserved some time off. Plus, Sunny needed to sort himself out. Truth be told, he was feeling a bit strange. Reason for this was not his traumatic near-death experience, although it had a lot to do with it. The thing was that, after the unexpected epiphany he had while trying to fight against the deathly mind fog, Sunny felt as though he had been changed. Because the clarity he gained never went away. It was still here at the center of his being. He felt as though his very way of thinking and perceiving the world was now completely different. It was stark, streamlined, and dauntless. Sunny felt that he had become calmer. He was now able to think much faster and act without hesitation. Many things that previously seemed obscure and frightening suddenly became predictable and thus surmountable. It was as though he had discovered an underlying order to the world that wasn't there before. That inner understanding gave him an advantage that was hard to explain with words. In a sense, this change was even more profound than the transformation of his body at the end of the first nightmare. He felt that he had made a big leap in his combat ability and overall power, even though it wasn't tied to the number of consumed shadow fragments or unlocked aspect abilities. Looking at the sky, Sunny wondered if this was how Nephise always felt. Probably mastery of the body, mastery of the mind, right? He was still far away from being a master, but it felt as though he was on the right track. Some time later, Sunny approached the western edge of the cliffs. Nephise was sitting there, her feet dangling over the edge. She was looking west, lost in her thoughts. He sat down beside the silver-haired girl and followed her gaze, trying to guess what she was thinking about. Just like always, he failed. Changing star was hard to understand. Sunny shifted, feeling incredibly embarrassed. Finally, he gathered his courage and said, "You saved my life twice yesterday." Nephise glanced at him and turned away again.
I did.
He hesitated, trying to find the correct words. In the end, he couldn't come up with anything and simply said,
"Thank you."
This time she looked at him a bit longer. Her face was calm and indifferent. "There's no need to thank me. Without you and your shadow, we would have drowned before reaching the cliffs or been torn apart by a large group of scavengers after stumbling on them in the labyrinth." After that uncharacteristically long sentence, she fell silent and added after a while, "We're allies." Sunny nodded, knowing that she was right. Still, Nephise went above and beyond to keep him alive. Even if he had also done his part, not everyone would have gone to such lengths to return the favor. However, he didn't say anything about it, mostly because he could already imagine her answer. Staring right at him, she would stay quiet for some time and then say something like, "I just wanted to," or "It is what it is," in a flat tone, and then there would be an awkward silence. With a subtle smile, Sunny looked away.
A minute or two later, he said,
"It's you flaw, isn't it? The pain you feel every time you use your ability." Nephise was silent for a while before answering. Then she simply said,
"Yes."
Sunny looked at her. Changing Star's profile was calm and distant. The wind was playing with her short silver hair.
"What does it feel like?" She was staring into the distance.
"Like burning alive." He sighed, trying to imagine what kind of suffering someone being burned alive would have to endure. As always, the spell was vile and cruel. "I'm sorry," he said quietly after some time.
Nephise shrugged, not turning her head. "It's just pain."
Sunny looked away, trying to hide his expression.
"Just pain."
These might have been the saddest words he had ever heard. Chapter 54, Spoils of War. For a long while, they just sat quietly together. Nephi's was looking at the horizon, thinking about something only she knew about. Sunny's mind was strangely empty. From time to time, he would cast a glance inside his soul sea, observing the recuperating echo. The scavenger managed to survive its fight against the carapace centurion, even if it was just barely. Now, enveloped in a cocoon of light, it was flowing in the calming darkness of Sunny's soul and slowly regenerating. If an echo managed to retreat into the sea of soul alive, it would eventually recover from any wounds. The holes on the scavenger's carapace were already beginning to close. Its lost pincer arm, however, was not growing back any time soon. Sunny sighed and summoned the runes. He decided to go over the spoils of the harrowing battle. Shadow Fragments 28/1000. Since it was his echo that delivered the final blow, the kill was considered to be his. Thus he received 4 shadow fragments, 2 for each of the Centurion's awakened cores. The shards of the cores themselves went to Nephi's as per their agreement. She decided to consume one herself and give the other one to Cassie. The reward was sizable, but seemed disproportionate to the amount of trouble they had gone through to get rid of the terrifying monster. Ultimately, dormant humans like them were really not supposed to battle awakened nightmare creatures. No way, really, he thought to himself, full of sarcasm. It was just their bad luck that there was not a single dormant creature in this whole damned region of the dream realm. Sunny remembered his lofty plans of hunting weak monsters, while safely protected from all their attacks by his Tier 5 awakened armor, and couldn't help but smile bitterly. Who knew that the puppeteer's shroud would turn out to be merely a minimum requirement for survival, as opposed to a huge, odds-defying advantage? Still, that armor had already saved his life twice, so it was doing its job. Speaking of armor, he lowered his gaze. Memory Starlight Legion armor. Memory rank awakened. Memory type armor. Memory description: born in the all-consuming darkness, 7 valiant heroes made an oath to return light to the cursed land. Time has erased their names and their faces, but the memory of the defiant oath still remains. Teacher Julius would have been ecstatic to be reading this stuff. Old Man used to be an avid explorer and student of the Dream Realm's history before becoming a professor in the Awakened Academy and settling down in one of the most prosperous human citadels. He was still one of the leading researchers in that field, often irritating hunting expeditions with requests to explore this or that ruin. Sadly, Sunny had no idea when they would meet again. He cleared his throat and looked at Nephi's. "Anyway, I have a present for you." She turned her head and looked at him with a bit of confusion. "A present?" Sunny smiled. "Yeah, I forgot to tell you that I received a memory after we finished off the Centurion. Guess what type it is?" He glanced at her expectantly. However, Changing Star did not guess. In fact, her expression did not even show a hint of curiosity. After an awkward pause, Sunny had to look away. "Oh, it's an armor, so give me your hand." Physical contact was required to transfer a memory. Otherwise, he would have preferred to avoid it for as long as possible. There had already been too much contact between them for his mental composure. In retrospect, being invaded by the healing flame was a strangely intimate experience, not to mention the memory of her soft touch. Not that he had been in any condition to think about such things back then. Staring right at him, Nephi slowly held out a hand. Sunny hurriedly grasped it in his own, wishing to be done with this part of the process as soon as possible. Her skin was cool and soft. Trying not to get distracted, he willed the Starlight Legion armor to be expelled from his soul sea. One of the spheres of light disappeared from the Shadow Core's orbit. Immediately, he felt something akin to a spark of electricity moving through his body and into Changing Stars. She blinked and retracted her hand. Then Nephi stood up, walked a few steps away from the edge of the cliff, and summoned the memory. Spinning sparks of light appeared around her. A moment later, they covered her porcelain body and turned into a black, skin-tight bodysuit made out of an unknown, durable material. It looked quite similar to the rubbery seaweed that permeated the area. And intricate pieces of pristine white plate armor materialized over the black bodysuit. First the greaves and vambraces, then articulated pauldrons and rerebraces, then cuisses and sabatons. Finally, a breastplate engraved with 7 shining stars appeared to protect Neff's torso, short enough to pose no hindrance to her mobility. It was followed by a helmet with a white plume. The engraving of the 7 stars was identical to those carved into the giant knight statue's cuirass. The armor looked light and elegant. It was simultaneously functional and flattering, both providing high levels of protection and accentuating the graceful lines of Changing Star's body. A stark contrast of black and white made for quite a striking sight. Nephi dismissed the helmet, letting her silver hair move in the wind. Then she summoned her sword and performed a few tentative pirouettes, testing out the weight and flexibility of the armor. Seemingly satisfied, she then let the sword disappear into the air. Sunny observed all this in silence. When Neff was finally done, he asked, "Well, how is it?" She turned to him. Soon, a wide smile appeared on her face. Beaming with delight, Nephi hesitated and finally said with a bit of embarrassment, "Much better." Sunny heaved a sigh of relief. At least now all three of them were properly clothed. That was good.
Really good.
Not only because changing Star's combat effectiveness would dramatically increase due to the acquisition of a reliable armor, but also because now he wouldn't have to be distracted every time he saw her. Chapter 55, Lucky People. When they returned to the makeshift camp, the first thing that Nephi's did was come up to Cassie.
Hey Cass, guess what?
The blind girl turned to her and smiled. You've finally received an armor-type memory.
Simultaneously, Nephi said, I found something decent to wear.
And she fell silent and stared at her smiling friend. Cassie laughed.
The sound of your footsteps changed. Changing Star blinked.
Ah, I see. Well, it's from the Carapace Centurion. While she was describing the armor to Kasha and letting her touch the mysterious white metal it was forged out of, Sunny relaxed and rested by the fire. Some time later, Nephi's was busy preparing dinner. Sunny was once again lying lazily on the stones and staring into the sky. The sky, like always, was gray and unfriendly. With all three of them equipped with decent armor, they were finally starting to resemble a real awakened cohort. In fact, Sunny thought that their group was rather eye-catching even by awakened standards. In her light tunic and sea-wave cloak, beautiful and delicate Cassie looked like a princess. Lithe and poised, Nephi's was like a noble knight tasked with protecting her. Sunny, however, if he was generous to himself, he would say that he looked like a young squire. But truthfully, he resembled a page boy a lot more at best. If a random stranger were to see the three of them, that stranger would most likely assume that Sunny was either a lowly servant or a feeble ruffian that had been captured by the noble ladies' guard. Well, that'll just add to their surprise when I stab them in the back.
Wait, why would he stab a random stranger?
Ah, who cares? I'm sure there'll be a reason. At that moment, Cassie sat down by his side. Sunny turned his head, looking at the blind girl with a bit of surprise.
She bit her lip.
Nephi's told me that you almost died yesterday. Oh, so that's what this is about.
He shrugged.
Yeah. Then with a silent sigh, Sunny added, but don't worry about it too much. It's not my first brush with death. Although it was, as far as he knew, the closest, the memory still sent shivers running down his spine. Cassie was silent for a while, then she quietly said,
I'm sorry.
Sunny raised his eyebrows. Sorry, what are you sorry for? The blind girl lowered her eyes.
For being so useless.
Sunny frowned and looked away. A second or two later, he said in his usual careless tone,
You're not useless.
Cassie softly chuckled. If I want to walk, I need to be leashed to you or Neff. If I want to eat, I need to wait for one of you to feed me. That's my life now. I can't do even the simplest of things without your help, let alone be of use to either of you in return. Slowly her voice turned raw with emotion. This was the first time Sunny had seen her mask of resolve slip a little, revealing the desperate, angry, frightened face beneath. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, Hey, have I ever told you about my first nightmare? The blind girl shook her head. Sunny half closed his eyes. My first nightmare was as bad as it gets. To tell you the truth, the situation was pretty hopeless. I was a slave destined to die of cold or mistreatment, chained, bleeding, defenseless. What's worse, my aspect turned out to be completely useless. I mean, literally. If I remember correctly, the phrase the spell chosen to describe it was a useless wretch with no skills or abilities worth a mention. Cassie turned her head slightly, visibly drawn in by his words. Then how did you survive? Did things change for the better?
Sunny smiled.
Gods know, in fact, they quickly turned worse. Much, much worse. But what would you know? In a strange twist of fate, my useless aspect turned out to be the only thing that could guide me through that mess alive. In that regard, I was incredibly lucky. He shifted a little and glanced at the delicate girl, noticing a thoughtful frown on her face. But here's the thing about luck. People usually speak about it as though luck is something that just happens to you. It's not. Luck is 50% circumstance and 50% your own ability to grasp it. Luck is something you have to make happen yourself. I fought with everything I had to survive. That's one of the two reasons I'm still here. Saying that, Sunny remembered the cold, dark mountain and shivered. Then, pushing the chilling memories away, he continued. Second reason is the spell itself. I won't go as far as to call it reasonable, but it is fair in its own perverted way. The spell takes with one hand and gives with the other. It was like this with my first nightmare, and it is the same with you. Cassie's frown deepened. Sunny chose his next words very carefully. Eventually, he said, Your flaw is the most debilitating one I have ever seen or heard of. You are right, without help from someone like Neff, it would have been a certain death sentence. And people like her, well, I'm not even sure that someone else like that exists. But
the blind girl gritted her teeth.
But what?
Sunny looked at her with a serious expression.
But that also means that the other side of the flaw, your power, is equally as extraordinary. You just haven't found the way to grasp it yet. When you do, believe me, you'll remember this conversation and feel very embarrassed about how naive and foolish you were.
Cassie's expression changed to one of doubt and confusion.
Do you really think so? She whispered. There was a hint of desperate desire in her voice. However, the question itself almost made him laugh for an obvious reason. Trust me, I'm the most honest person in the world, 2 worlds in fact. Sonny would actually love nothing more than to be less honest, but sadly, he was physically incapable of doing so. Of course, she didn't have to know that. Cassie was silent for a long time, lost in thought. It looked as though she was in the throes of some inner struggle. Sonny almost assumed that their conversation was over, but then she suddenly said in a low, raspy voice, I had more visions than I told you guys about. Chapter 56, the heaviest thing in the world. He blinked, staring at the blind girl with surprise and a bit of apprehension. Her sudden statement really threw him off. Why would she keep something like this secret, and why tell him now? Confused, he asked carefully. More visions, why haven't you told us? Fleeting, tired smile appeared on Cassie's face. She lowered her head and remained silent for a while. Then, closing her eyes, she said, You probably don't know, how could you know, but knowledge can be really heavy. It can be as heavy as the heaviest thing in the world. Then a sad smile appeared on her face. I am afraid that by telling you, I will actually cause the things I saw to come true. Sonny tensed up, alarmed by the implication behind her words. If she was afraid of the visions coming true, then their content must have been pretty bad, and if it was really bad, something terrible was destined to befall them. Sonny had to know about it in advance. That way he would be able to make preparations and deal with whatever happens. As long as he was prepared, many things would become much less dire. However, what if his preparations would become the very reason for that terrible thing to happen, making Cassie's vision a self-fulfilling prophecy? This was the danger of knowing the future. Damn it, my head hurts, I hate this crap. Sonny struggled for a long time, trying to decide if he should pressure Cassie to reveal her visions. Either outcome was going to leave him uneasy, so he was really not sure what to do. In the end, unable to make a decision, Sonny simply remained silent. Cassie also didn't say anything. After some time had passed, she finally spoke. Can you just promise me one thing? It seemed as though this was her attempt to find a compromise between revealing everything and doing nothing. Sonny frowned. That depends on what it is. The blind girl hesitated before speaking. Can you promise that you'll take care of Neff, no matter what? He delayed answering for as long as the growing pain allowed him. When it became almost unbearable, Sonny reluctantly said, I can barely take care of myself. He also didn't trust Neff enough to make a promise like that. He had nothing against changing Star and even liked her quite a bit, but they didn't really know each other. Their alliance was one of necessity, not choice. Who knew what would happen once their need for each other was no longer there? No matter what was too steep of a requirement. Of course, he could have misled Cassie by answering yes. After all, the question was whether or not he could make a promise, not whether or not he would follow through with it. But at that moment, Sonny was strangely reluctant to deceive the blind girl. Maybe that whole honesty thing was slowly growing on him. Cassie sighed and turned away. Suddenly, it felt like something imperceptible about her changed. I see, yeah, that's fair. With that, she summoned her staff and walked away, leaving Sonny in a somber and uneasy mood, just like he had expected. No matter how much he tried to relax after that, his thoughts kept wandering. Eventually, Sonny found himself trying to find connections between various pieces of information about the Starless Void, or the Forgotten Shore, as it was called in the Azure Blade's description. If nothing else, it could distract him from thinking about the latter part of their conversation with Cassie. Also, for some reason, the need to understand their environment suddenly seemed much more vital. His sword, the Starlight Legion armor, the carapace monsters, and the giant headless statue seemed to be connected in some way, but he couldn't quite understand how. Was the statue a monument to one of the 7 founders of the Starlight Legion? A line of runes describing the armor said that their names and faces were lost to time. The statue's missing head would certainly fit that description. Scavenger's echo suggested that the carapace monsters were cursed soldiers of the Fallen Legion. Was that Fallen Legion the Starlight Legion? The fact that he had received the Starlight armor after slaying a carapace centurion was almost a certain confirmation of that theory. If so, why were they cursed? Starless Void, Starlight Legion, what did all of it mean? The 7 heroes were described as being born in the all-consuming darkness. Their oath was to return light to the cursed land. What light did they seek? Starlight. And what was the nature of the all-consuming darkness? Was it the manifestation of the curse that befell their land? And if so, was it the same curse that eventually turned soldiers of the Starlight Legion into carapace monsters? If the curse was still around, was Sonny going to wake up one day with patches of chitin growing over his skin? What a creepy thought. 7 heroes were forgotten, but the memory of their oath apparently still remained. On this forgotten shore, only Stell remembers. That was the Azure Blade's description. Was there a hidden meaning behind these words? Were the memories received on the forgotten shore hiding a secret? Inwardly, Sonny groaned. So many questions and not a single answer. And then there was the main mystery, Cassie's vision, the one she chose to reveal to them. She dreamt of a boundless darkness locked behind 7 seals. Once the seals were broken, the darkness escaped. She also saw a crimson spire with 7 severed heads guarding 7 locks. Were these locks connected to the seals? And was the giant knight's missing head one of the 7 guarding them? Or was he completely wrong about everything, leaping to conclusions and forcing connections where none existed? Sunny sighed, knowing that his curiosity would not be quenched anytime soon. He had too little information to make a proper theory. If so, there was no point in torturing himself right now. Maybe things would become clearer in the future. The word future made him frown. Chapter 57, Use of Weapons in the Evening. Sunny continued to practice with the sword under Neff's watchful eye. With his new insight, every movement felt different from before. After the 1,000 strikes were finished, he sat down to rest and studied the azure blade, tempted to continue obsessing over the abundant mysteries of the forgotten shore. After a while, Sunny asked, "Do you think I'm well suited to use a sword? Should I consider switching weapons in the future?" Neff eyes shrugged. "That depends on your goals. However, the sword is considered to be the king of weapons for a reason." Sunny smiled. "And why is that?" She tilted her head and deliberated for a few seconds. Then she asked, "Do you know how natural selection works?" He raised an eyebrow. "Survival of the fittest, the strongest species survives." Changing Star glanced at him. "Somewhat correct, but actually it's not the strongest species that survive, it's the most adaptable. Otherwise, lions and tigers and bears would have been the ones ruling the world instead of humans." Sunny knew about lions and bears from archival footage, but he had no idea what a tiger was. Probably another extinct predator. Meanwhile, Neff continued, not at all like her usual taciturn self. She seemed to be much more eloquent when talking about subjects she was confident in. Same logic can be applied to combat. A sword is not the most effective tool in every situation. A spear is more useful against enemies with long reach. A war hammer is much better against armor. A mace is easier to maintain. However, swords are the most versatile. She cast a gaze at the azure blade. Sword can pierce, it can cut, it can bash. It can be used effectively at a variety of ranges. It is swift and maneuverable. Every part of the sword from tip to pommel can be used to attack. While wielding a sword, you won't be the best at everything, but you'll be the most adaptable. Neff eyes turned to him. "Do you understand?" Sunny thought for a bit before answering. "I think I do." She gave him a nod and looked away. "But in the end, you must remember one thing. It doesn't matter that much what's in your hands. A sword, a spear, a club, that's just tools. You are the weapon." He sighed and dismissed the azure blade. As always, Changing Star's lesson gave him a lot to think about. "You are the weapon." He repeated it in his mind, feeling as though another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Together, they watched the sun set in comfortable silence. As the night approached, the sea was coming back, flooding the crimson labyrinth like a rush of darkness. Far below them, scavengers were scurrying to find a hiding place. A few of them were climbing the cliffs, hoping to spend the night on the small island. Sunny's shadow was keeping an eye on them. "We're going to have guests soon," he said, disheartened at the thought that their short respite was about to end. Neff eyes sighed. "That's all right, with the higher ground advantage. Dealing with them won't be too hard." Sunny nodded and looked at the disappearing sun. Suddenly his mood turned solemn. Doubt raised its ugly head, plunging his mind into the gloomy embrace of anxiety. Staring into the distance, Sunny hesitated and asked, "Do you think we'll be able to reach that castle?" She glanced at him with no particular expression on her face. "Yes." He turned to her and forced a smile. "Why are you so sure?" In the blood-red blaze of the sunset, Changing Star's calm eyes seemed to burn with heavenly fire. Looking west, she summoned her sword and answered, "If that is our will, who dares to stop us?" Dealing with the climbing scavengers, indeed, turned out to be comparatively easy. Sunny and Nephis just had to ambush and push the bulky creatures off the cliff before they could find stable purchase. He received 4 shadow fragments practically for free, increasing the overall number to 32. Sadly, the soul shards couldn't be retrieved. He spent another day on the cliffs, resting and training. Sunny practiced with the sword while his shadow explored the nearby paths of the labyrinth. With the echo still recovering, their group was not in its optimal condition. That's why there was no point in hastily abandoning their current camp. However, very soon they were going to resume the journey west, moving from one height to another in hopes of reaching the mysterious human citadel. This time they were not going to travel without sufficient preparations. Knowing that a sudden storm can come at any moment, covering the world with darkness and summoning the sea back before sunset, the 3 sleepers decided to thoroughly scout a route before committing to moving their camp to the next landmark. Nephis spent the day meditating. Her eyes were closed. From time to time it seemed as though a soft white glow was radiating from behind her eyelids. However, when Sunny looked closely, it was always gone, making him think that he was just imagining things. He suspected that Changing Star was training herself to endure the pain of her flaw. If so, he wished her luck. Cassie behaved like her usual self, being cheerful and friendly. It was as though their strange conversation had never happened. However, Sonny could feel that something about her was different. He couldn't quite put a finger on what exactly had changed about the blind girl, but she seemed to possess more resolve. It wasn't a bad thing. He spent some time chatting and remembering their time in the academy. Sonny told her about his lessons with teacher Julius and various strange things he had learned from the old man. Her reaction to the idea of studying dead languages of the dream realm was exactly the same as Sonny's initial protest and bewilderment. Soon the night was upon them again. This time no scavenger tried to climb the cliffs, so Sonny and Nephi's could rest easy. However, they still slept in turns, keeping watch over the camp in case something unexpected happens. In the morning, they ate the last of the centurion's meat and prepared to climb down into the labyrinth. It was time to continue their journey. Chapter 58, Survival of the Fittest. Days later, Sonny was sitting on top of a dead scavenger, calmly cleaning the azure blood off his face. Your shadow grows stronger. His sword was still stuck between the plates of chitin armor, trembling slightly as the beast's body convulsed before falling still. Somewhere behind him, the sound of breaking carapaces announced that Nephi's was already digging out soul shards from the corpses of the creatures they had slain. After dozens of such battles, the two of them were nothing if not efficient. Glancing back, he evaluated the scene of carnage. The path between two crimson walls was littered with corpses. Initially, they were simply planning to lure the carapace centurion that had been tracking them for the past few days into this narrow passage to turn its size against the monster. However, things quickly took a turn. Attracted by the noise of the battle, both the scavengers and the weird centipede creatures that were waging war against the Carapace Legion in this part of the labyrinth showed up to join the fight. In the ensuing mayhem, Sonny and Nephi's used the animosity between the two tribes of monsters to their advantage and ended up as the only victors. Not far from him, the Echo was mutilating the corpse of the centurion. Its lost arm had long grown back. Now, the scavenger was tearing pieces of monster meat with its new pincer and vindictively devouring them. Technically, an Echo wasn't supposed to experience hunger. This one, however, had seemingly acquired a hatred for Carapace centurions after their encounter with the massive Scythe Slayer on that fateful stormy night. It had already been 2 weeks since they left the cliffs. In that time, many things had changed, while many remained the same. Moving from one high point to another, they steadily traveled west. With Cassie riding atop the Echo, the speed of the group was dramatically enhanced. Still, they took care to explore paths to their next stop before committing to a day-long journey. This way, the risk of being caught in another storm was minimized, as they could always either reach the next landmark in time or return to the previous one. Their approach to traveling through the labyrinth had also changed. In the past, Nephi's and Sonny tried to avoid the scavengers, resorting to fighting them only if there was no other choice. However, the battle with the Centurion opened their eyes to the fact that they desperately needed to become stronger and do it fast. That's why they began to actively hunt the carapace beasts, taking out any creatures that were either completely isolated or moving in groups of no more than 3. The idea of 2 sleepers consciously seeking out nightmare creatures of the awakened rank was pretty ridiculous, but somehow they made it work. Just as Nephi's had said, both of them were abnormal. Clad in the Starlight Legion armor, Changing Star, who had always been an extremely formidable fighter, was now able to showcase the full extent of her combat ability. Simply put, she was a menace. It seemed as though her silver sword had a mind of its own. Whenever the tall figure in white armor appeared, rivers of azure blood were sure to flow. What's more, Neph's powers grew with each soul shard she consumed. Every increase was barely noticeable, but with dozens of them added up together, the difference was apparent. She was slowly approaching the line between the peak of human physical form and the threshold of superhuman prowess. The same could be said about Sonny, although in his case it was predicated on the timely use of the shadow. His own body had become considerably stronger due to the rigors of the dream realm, but it was still far away from reaching its peak potential. While Nephi's was growing more powerful through the consumption of soul shards, he was quickly collecting shadow fragments. Of course, he wasn't able to get every kill, so their amount was less than that of the shards, but he also didn't have to share them with Cassie, which Changing Star was continuously doing. As the result, the rate of their progress was more or less the same. However, the slow accumulation of power was not the only factor that influenced the rapid growth of their combat effectiveness. Sonny's skill level and battle sense were also improving by leaps and bounds. Under the tutelage of sword goddess Nephis herself, he was quickly learning the ins and outs of wielding the blade. And he was forced to apply these lessons to practice, participating in bloody battles each day with his life on the line. This brutal, merciless reality was, for better or worse, the best training grounds for a true fighter. There was no room for mistakes, only progress, because a single mistake would most likely become his last. One real fight was worth 1,000 hours of training. With experience, Sonny was able to gain knowledge. With clarity, he was able to turn this knowledge into a seed of understanding. But even that wasn't the biggest contributor to the dramatic increase in the group's overall might. The main culprit was, to his endless surprise, teamwork. After fighting side by side for so long, Sunny and Nephis had developed a tacit, intuitive understanding. Without the need for words and signals, they were able to act in unison with each other, perfectly coordinating their attacks and actions to better control the battlefield and destroy their opponents. The importance of this unity was hard to overestimate. With proper cooperation, it was as though their numbers doubled. The effect was immediate and overwhelming, at least as long as they chose their battles carefully. It was nothing short of jolly. With all this added up together, their group had turned from a trio of lost kids into a cohort of well-equipped, experienced, and battle-hardened survivors. Even Cassie was becoming stronger. Apart from the boost she had received from absorbing the soul shards, the blind girl was also slowly learning to live and function with her disability. After all, it was less than 2 months since she lost her sight. Cassie was still adapting to her condition, and she was doing an incredible job, considering the circumstances. She was still unable to help them fight against the monsters, but the burden of taking care of her was becoming less and less heavy. Sunny had also grown accustomed to it, even finding the time spent watching over the blind girl somewhat calming. The goal of reaching the human castle did not seem as impossible as it had before. Now he felt as though they were getting closer and closer. Chapter 59, Shadow of the Crimson Spire. Jumping off the dead scavenger, Sunny retrieved his sword and whistled, letting Cassie know that it was safe to come out. Soon she crawled out of a small opening in the coral wall and carefully put her feet on the ground. Leaning on her staff, the blind girl stood up and slightly turned her head, listening to the light sound of his footsteps. Sunny approached Cassie and took her hand, gently placing it on his shoulder. Then, carefully avoiding puddles of blood, he guided the blind girl to the echo. They talked on the way.
Did those centipedes show up?
During their journey through the labyrinth, they discovered that the scavengers were not the only creatures populating it. Different types of monsters lived in the Crimson Forest, hiding inside the reefs during the night and coming out to hunt once the sun was up. There were sentient colonies of carnivorous worms that attacked from beneath the black mud, flesh-eating flowers that strangled their prey with blood-sucking vines, and weird transparent tentacles that they had once seen dragging a desperately resisting scavenger into a dark, cavernous crevice. They still didn't know what type of creature had been hiding in the crevice. Sunny hoped that they would never find out. In short, the labyrinth was home to all kinds of horrors, every one of them at least of the awakened rank. They were all carrion eaters, living off the remains left behind by the monsters of the Dark Sea. Given the opportunity, they were also more than willing to devour each other, not to mention the 3 juicy humans. Luckily, the Carapace Legion turned out to be extremely territorial and seemed to have the upper hand in this region of the Crimson Reef. While their armor, size, and physical strength made the scavengers formidable opponents, dealing mostly with one type of creature was infinitely better than constantly facing unknown danger. Centipede monsters were the latest enemy of the Carapace Legion they had met. Some of these critters were more than 3 meters long, with glistening red chitin and hundreds of tiny, scurrying legs. They were abhorrently fast and agile, being able to move through mud, climb the coral walls, and even drop on the unsuspecting victims from above with incredible speed. What's worse, their bodies were able to secrete a corrosive black oil that melted through the strongest armor in seconds. The only redeeming quality of the centipede monsters was that their chitin shells weren't very tough and could be easily pierced by a sword.
Sunny answered without turning back.
Yeah, 6 of them and a few scavengers too. We let them fight each other and then finished off the survivors.
Cassie gulped. Were you hurt?
Nothing our armor couldn't handle.
What about the Centurion?
He glanced at the half-devoured carcass and smiled. It's not going to bother us again. This was the second awakened monster they had slain after entering the Dream Realm. Compared to the first encounter, this battle went much smoother. No one died, no one was seriously injured.
The Echo even kept both of its pincers. How many soul shards did we get? Sunny counted. Should be 11.
Now it was Cassie's turn to smile. That's our biggest haul so far, by a lot.
He nodded. Yeah.
However, they had once again failed to receive a memory. Sunny wasn't sure if his bad luck was to blame, but neither he nor Nephis had been able to acquire a single one for the past 2 weeks. It was almost as though the spell had decided that they had already gotten enough.
There can never be enough. He sighed.
One of the games he and Cassie liked to play during camp was to discuss what they would buy after coming back to the real world and becoming rich. However, he had to collect a few memories to auction off first. Otherwise, where would the money come from? Consumed by greed and avarice, Sunny approached the Echo and looked up at it with disapproval.
Hey, you, stop chewing.
The scavenger obediently froze, a piece of meat still hanging from its mouth.
Spit it out.
Shaking his head, Sunny helped Cassie climb to her seat and handed her the reins. This weirdo actually gobbled up almost half of the Centurion. What's up with that? Of all the Echoes in the world, why did I have to get stuck with a defective one? The shadow solemnly nodded, expressing that it completely understood his sentiment. Sunny squinted at it. What a rare show of solidarity. The shadow didn't have any echoes, though.
What defective individual was it stuck with? Cheeky bastard. Cassie laughed. Don't badmouth my steed, he is a great echo, I like him very much. It's a he now, huh? Sonny shook his head again and got to stripping the remaining meat off the centurion's carcass. Then he placed the meat into the seaweed saddlebags attached to the scavenger. He had made these bags himself to increase the group's carrying capacity. After all, the scavenger was supposed to be extremely strong. Not using it to their advantage would have been an oversight. After that, Sonny sighed and got to the least pleasant task, harvesting the oil sacks from the centipede monster's corpses. Each had 2 of them, connected to a special gland. The whole process was more disgusting than dangerous, since the corrosive effect was only achieved after the liquids from the 2 sacks were mixed. They had not come up with a way to utilize the centipede oil yet, but Nephi's insisted on collecting as much of it as possible. She was sure that it was going to be of use one day. At the very least, the oil was highly flammable. Speaking of Nephi's, by the time Sonny was done collecting the sacks, she had already gathered all the soul shards and was standing in front of the echo. He showed her his trophies and carefully placed them in a separate saddlebag. All done. She nodded. Sonny looked at the sky, trying to determine the time. The sun was right above them, high in the gray sky. There was still plenty of daytime left. What do you think? We're right in between the flat hill and the bone ridge. Should we return or try to reach the ridge today? Ground level of the labyrinth was not uniform. Some parts of it were situated higher than the others. Currently they were in one such area. The dark sea was much more shallow here, which meant that there were more natural features that remained above water during the night. That made for shorter distance between them. Nephi's thought for a bit, then said, "Let's push to the bone ridge." He had already scouted most of the way to it yesterday, so there wasn't much danger of getting lost in the labyrinth and not making it on time. With the carapace centurion dead, the unpredictable element that had been making their lives harder for these past few days was also gone. Considering this, changing Star's decision seemed proper. Sonny nodded. Okay. With that, he sent his shadow forward. Some time later, they were approaching the bone ridge. The sun was preparing to set, but there was still enough time to get to safety. Sonny, however, felt alarmed and uncomfortable. This feeling began to pursue him soon after they had left the cliffs. It always appeared close to the evening and persisted until the last minutes of the sunset, then disappeared, leaving him puzzled and uneasy. The further west they traveled, the stronger the feeling became. It was as though something was not quite right with the world during that time, but no matter how hard Sonny tried to understand what that wrongness was, he couldn't. In the end, he decided to share his uneasiness with the group. After listening to him, the girls were surprised. It seemed that they did not notice anything strange. Even Cassie, whose affinity to revelations provided her with an incredible intuition, didn't experience the strange feeling. However, she did suggest a theory. Since Sonny was the only one susceptible to the feeling, it was logical to assume that there was something unique about him that made it possible, and the only difference he had from the girls in terms of perception was his shadow sense. Which meant that the source of the wrongness, most likely, had something to do with the behavior of shadows. Guided by her advice, Sonny was finally able to understand the reason for his discomfort. As it turns out, Cassie was right. In the hours closest to sunset, when the sun was hanging low in the western skies, a vast shadow moved through the labyrinth, affecting his senses and making his skin crawl. The shadow was too distant and colossal to be seen, but he could still feel its presence. When he told Cassie about the immense shadow, she nodded, as though it explained everything. Then she said, "That is the shadow of the Crimson Spire." Chapter 60, Bone Ridge. Back then, it took him a couple of seconds to realize what she was talking about. The spire from your vision, the one with 7 seals. Cassie nodded. Yes, in my dream it seemed to be as tall as a mountain. I could even see it from the walls of the human castle, looming in the distance like a crimson spear piercing the skies. When the sun sets, the spire's vast shadow falls over the castle and stretches east as far as you can see. She was silent for a moment, then added, "The feeling I got when looking at the Crimson Spire was very similar to what you had described, only much more intense." Sonny frowned, trying to remember the exact words Cassie had used to describe her vision. 7 severed heads guarding 7 seals, a dying angel being devoured by hungry shadows, feeling of extreme terror and loss. What was the deal with that spire, exactly? Is it crimson because it's made out of the same stuff as the labyrinth? The crimson coral surrounding them was not, in fact, coral. It's just what they called it based on some resemblance, for the sake of simplicity. The actual nature of the strange material remained a mystery. Cassie hesitated. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe the labyrinth is made from the same stuff as the spire. In other words, the Crimson Spire might have been the source of all this madness. Still, it was just a theory. There was too little information to confirm it. However, Sonny did feel that the spire was, in one way or another, at the center of all things that they had encountered. He just hoped that it wouldn't be their final destination. Knowing the reason behind his restlessness, Sonny was able to endure it much better. He even found a hidden benefit to this situation.
As long as he sensed the shadow of the Crimson Spire, he could pinpoint the direction to the human castle, since it was situated somewhere between their location and the source of the shadow. In a sense, the Crimson Spire had become his inner compass. Get ready. Neff's voice took Sonny out of his reverie. Shaking off the distracting thoughts, he focused on the task at hand. They were getting close to the Bone Ridge. This name came to their minds as soon as they had first laid their eyes on this towering landmark. It was visible from quite a distance, sharply contrasted against the crimson coral and the gray sky in all its ivory splendor. Bone Ridge was in fact made of bone. The skeletal remains of a colossal sea monster lay on an enormous mound of chaotically growing coral, with its arching spine protruding especially high above the ground. It was impossible to say what the terrifying creature had looked like while it was still alive, but one thing was certain: it was gargantuan even by the standards of the Dark Sea. This wasn't the first giant skeleton they saw during their journey. In fact, the labyrinth was littered with remains of dead leviathans, their massive bones forming natural arches and palaces throughout it. They were easy to spot because the coral formations were especially tall and dense in their vicinity, as though trying to bury any sign of whiteness in the sea of crimson. Sonny, however, had a feeling that the situation was actually reversed. To him, it seemed as though the coral was actually growing out of the old bones and spreading in every direction, slowly consuming the world. When he looked at the crimson mounds surrounding the colossal remains, he couldn't help but see them as rivers of ancient, solidified blood. He was almost sure that if they were to dig deep enough into the black mud to find the roots of the crimson forest, they would find nothing but endless layers of bones. What a scary image. Regardless of what Sonny thought about the nature of the labyrinth, the beast whose remains formed the Bone Ridge was especially large. Thanks to that, a portion of its long spine was tall enough to remain above the water during the night. That's why they had chosen it as the next stop on their journey. With the evening approaching, the next task was crucial. They had to scale the dead leviathan and make sure that no other creature had decided to take shelter in its remains. If something did, they had no choice but to try and kill it, since there was no time to retreat to their previous safe haven. The last step was often the riskiest. Coming to the base of the coral mound, the group moved around it, searching for a convenient path up. Eventually, they arrived in front of the creature's cracked, misshapen skull. With its lower jaw missing or buried under the mud, the upper formed a vast, cavernous cave. Feeling shivers running down his spine, Sonny passed beneath the terrifying palisade of teeth and entered the cave. With his shadow leading the way, they made way to the back of the creature's skull and soon entered the hollow expanse of its spine. Inside the spine, the bone surface under their feet was as wide as a road. Actually, it looked a lot like a highway running through a long tunnel, with stark beams of light falling through the gaps between the massive vertebrae. The tunnel was inclined upward, most of its length hidden behind the bend of the ceiling. When the echo entered the spine, its chitin legs produced a loud, echoing clatter. Neph's eyes grimaced. Any movement? Sonny checked with the shadow and shook his head. Changing Star looked forward and slightly lowered her chin. Let's proceed. Despite the fact that the shadow had not noticed any danger, they still summoned their swords before moving forward. It was not their first time being ambushed at the edge of safety. Luckily, their precautions turned out to be unnecessary. Nothing was hiding inside the gargantuan remains, so they were able to reach the highest point of the spine without having to cut their way through an unknown number of monsters. By the time they got to safety, the sun was already setting. The dark sea was returning, filling the inside of the sea monster's spine with the echoing sound of rushing water. Sonny took the saddlebags off the echo and dismissed it, making their camp instantly feel much roomier. All three of them were in desperate need of a bath. Leaving the girls alone to give them an opportunity to wash themselves, Sonny walked some distance away and sat down, letting his tired body rest. His shadow returned to the lower parts of the spine, watching the black, dim water slowly rise and devour the ivory whiteness. He had to make sure that nothing would crawl out of the water at the last minute. With half of his mind preoccupied with observing the rising tide, the other half was free to wander. Sonny summoned the runes and checked the number of shadow fragments in his possession. Shadow fragments, 96/1000. Not bad, he only had 12 at the beginning of all this. In less than a month, the amount increased dramatically. He was stronger and faster now. He was also more experienced. However, that still left him far inferior to even the weakest nightmare creatures of the Forgotten Shore in terms of raw physical might, even with the help of the shadow. How long before I am able to wrestle a scavenger with my bare hands? The answer was pretty obvious, not to mention extremely disappointing. Not before his own shadow core had awakened, which could only happen after returning to the real world. Sonny sighed. Soon it was his turn to wash. Taking the bottle of endless water from refreshed, rosy Cassie, he walked back to his secluded spot and dismissed the Pupitor's shroud. Cold breeze touched his pale skin, making Sonny shiver. He looked down, shaking his head at the amount of dirt, sweat, and dried blood that was covering his body. Being an awakened was not the cleanest of professions. While he was washing up, Nephi's used the remaining time before nightfall to make a fire and cook some meat. These days, they even had salt to season it. At first, the idea of using the sea salt left behind by the dark sea did not seem very appealing, but after a while they grew accustomed to it. Salt made every meal they had much tastier. They ate in silence, too hungry and tired to talk. Soon it was time to sleep. Sunny took the first watch, planning to fit in some sword practice before it was his turn to rest. Going through the motions of the basic kata, he split his mind in two. One part was concentrating on the movements of his body, while the other, smaller part, was observing the surface of the black water through his shadow. In the absence of wind, the dark circle covering the lower part of the spine was strangely calm. This was his first time seeing the black water without the constant undulation of waves, with its surface strangely flat and absolutely still. It looked like a giant mirror, one that was made of pure darkness. It was unnaturally mesmerizing. Suddenly, he felt a strong desire to come closer and take a look at his reflection. However, Sunny didn't move. He was terrified of what might look back. Chapter 61, Sea of Ash. In the morning, Sunny woke up feeling grim and uneasy. The memory of the frightening dark mirror was still fresh in his mind, making every shadow seem sinister and foreboding. He scowled sullenly. What the hell, I'm the child of shadows. Why do I have to be afraid of my own domain? But then again, darkness and shadow were not the same, even if a lot of people tended to mistake one for another. Shadows were born from the absence of light. In a sense, they were manifestations of emptiness. True darkness, on the other hand, true darkness was its own entity. In a sense, shadows shared more in common with light than they did with darkness. I mean, I guess they do they? Philosophical debates with his internal monologue were not the best way to start the day, at least as far as Sunny was concerned. His already sour mood only got worse. With a short sigh, he sat up and stretched his arms, yawning. Good morning. The sound of his voice was almost drowned by the echoing noise of rushing water. With the sun rising, the dark sea was in a hurry to retreat. Sunny was finally able to relax a little. Morning. Nephis had been guarding the camp during the latter part of the night, so she was already awake. As usual, she was meditating with her eyes closed in the absolute darkness of the night. Watching over something actually meant listening for suspicious sounds, so keeping one's eyes open was not that useful. For everyone except Sunny, that is, who had perfect night vision thanks to his attributes. Hearing him stand up, Changing Star slowly opened her eyes. A soft afterglow left behind by the dancing white flame could still be seen in their depth, quickly disappearing as her sight adjusted to the twilight of dawn. She looked at Sunny and offered him a polite smile. In the past 2 weeks, Nephis had also been training, perhaps even more diligently than him. However, she wasn't trying to improve her swordsmanship. She was actually trying to learn how to behave like a normal human. As the result, their interactions had become slightly less awkward, for the most part. Sunny was able to recognize Changing Star's efforts because they were very similar to a phase he himself had gone through many years ago. On several occasions, he had caught her intently observing how Cassie talked and behaved around them. Sometime later, Neph would randomly try to mimic small details of her friend's behavior. The results were a mixed bag, to say the least. First time she tried to greet him with a smile in the morning, Sunny panicked and almost summoned the Azure Blade. However, Nephis was very smart and persistent. Today, her polite smile looked almost natural. He had no idea why Changing Star decided to work on her social skills, of all things, during their perilous journey through the monster-infested hellscape that was the Forgotten Shore, but he didn't mind. It was actually rather entertaining to watch. Watching her torture herself every day, enduring terrible pain in hopes of learning to better control her aspect ability, on the contrary, was not fun at all. They never talked about it, but Sunny knew that every time Nephis pretended to meditate, she was actually subjecting herself to the excruciating agony of her flaw. When he thought about it, his heart ached. Sunny wasn't used to feeling such things, but he suspected that this was what other people called compassion. At least it was similar to how it was described in books and dramas. Not that he knew a lot about that stuff. After they had breakfast, Nephis stood up and looked at the beam of light falling through the nearest gap between giant vertebrae. Turning to Sunny, she said, "Let's study the surroundings." He needed to get the lay of the land and decide on their next step. Usually, that implied looking for the nearest natural features that were high enough to stay above the surface of the sea and deciding on which one they would try to reach next. Then came a day or two of scouting and hunting, followed by moving the camp to that feature. Sunny gave her a nod. All right. He summoned the Echo to guard Cassie while they were away and left the shadow behind to keep an eye out, just in case something happens. Then Sunny followed Nephis to the gap. Boosting her, he watched as Changing Star flew through the air and then seemingly ran up the wall, kicking herself off at the last moment and propelling her body even higher before grabbing onto a bone protrusion. Relying only on her upper body strength, she then climbed up and disappeared into the cascading light. Soon, the golden rope fell down, allowing him to follow. Nephis helped him climb atop the gargantuan spine and then straightened, turning to take a look west. Sunny shook his hands and did the same, expecting to see the usual picture, an endless expanse of the crimson labyrinth, dotted here and there with rare high points. However, what they saw left them both speechless. Some distance away, the labyrinth seemed to lose color. The crimson blades of coral stood gray and misshapen, as though struck by some unknown disease and drained of all life. The stone-like material looked brittle and fragile, ready to crumble to dust at any moment. A patch of dead coral spread for as far as the eye could see. Further away, the walls of the labyrinth seemed to have collapsed into a sea of ash-gray sand. This ashen wasteland looked so alien and strange after weeks of seeing only the endless crimson pathways that Sonny felt a shiver run down his spine. The fact that they didn't notice even a single monster moving through the mud beneath made him feel even more disturbed. There was only one visible high point to the west of them. Far away into the distance, the ground rose, forming a tall hill. The hill was probably the largest they had seen, easily capable of becoming a real island once the water rose in the night. Its shape reminded Sonny of a colossal barrow. Covered in the gray sand left behind by dead coral, the hill resembled a mountain of ash. That mountain was crowned by a giant tree. The tree rose into the sky like a tower, its branches wide enough to cover the whole island in their shade. The bark of the giant tree was as black as the water of the dark sea, while its leaves were red as blood. Contrasted against the gray sky, the crimson crown of the majestic tree looked incredibly vibrant and magnificent. Sonny gulped. What the hell is that? Nephi's was either thinking or had nothing to say. She just stared into the distance, a slight frown on her face. At that moment, something glistened brightly from beneath the tree. The glimmer was clear and easily visible even from their position, like a beam of sunlight reflected by a large mirror. A moment later, it was gone, only to appear again after a few seconds. A mirror. Sonny shivered, remembering the previous night. For some reason, the bright glimmer suddenly seemed to become menacing. After some time had passed, he addressed Neph again. What do you think? She lingered a bit before turning to him. While Changing Star was deliberating on what to say, he glanced at the ashen wasteland again. Finally, she spoke. This is the only way west. Sonny grimaced and looked away. He didn't like this turn of events one bit. So we are going. Nephi's turned to face the giant tree, and as though affected by its grandeur, hesitantly shrugged. Do we have a choice? Some time later, they abandoned the remains of the giant sea monster and moved west, planning to check the situation inside the wasteland that lay between them and the Ashen Barrow. Initially, they weren't planning to approach the strange island. However, things turned out to be rather unusual once they entered the wasteland. With gray sand under their feet and dead coral walls surrounding them, the group was fully prepared to face unknown danger. Despite the fact that they had not seen any monster moving through this area from the top of the Leviathan's spine, neither Sonny nor Nephi's truly believed that no one was going to attack them in this strange region of the labyrinth. There were too many ways for the nightmare creatures to hide themselves, and if there was one thing the sleepers had learned during their time on the Forgotten Shore, it was that everything here was either deadly or concealing something capable of killing them. In that regard, their first encounter with the carnivorous worms was especially traumatic. However, their common sense turned out to be wrong this time around. The wasteland was quiet and empty, completely void of any signs of life. The absence of monsters was, in theory, supposed to make Sonny feel better, but he felt even more nervous than usual instead. This whole situation reeked of danger. It was strange and unnatural. If even the monsters were afraid to approach this place, what were they doing walking deeper and deeper into the wasteland of their own free will? Were they fools not to turn around and run away immediately? Soon they reached the point where the walls of the labyrinth had crumbled into dust. Now, there was nothing but a vast expanse of gray sand between them and the hill crowned by the giant tree. Nothing could hide on that ashen flat. However, they would also be unable to conceal themselves from anyone's gaze. Sonny glanced at Nephi's. Are you sure you want to do this? Changing Star scowled and lowered her chin. Then, looking forward, she scowled and said, Let's go. Chapter 62, Hide and Seek. As soon as they left the familiar confines of the labyrinth and stepped into the vast expanse of the ashen wasteland, Sonny felt strangely uncomfortable. It was as though he had unknowingly turned slightly agoraphobic while traveling through the complicated madness of the Crimson Maze. He had grown accustomed to being surrounded by tall walls of coral, with endless tangled paths stretching in all directions for as far as he could see. Despite the fact that the labyrinth was hiding numerous dangers, it also offered a strange sort of safety. At least in the case of Sonny, who had the advantage of being able to see beyond its twists and turns thanks to his stealthy shadow scout. Now, with gray sand beneath and nothing to break the line of sight, he had lost that advantage. The idea of not being able to hide from the enemy made him feel naked. Keep cool, there's no one here. That thought, which was supposed to calm him down, had the opposite effect instead. Indeed, there were no nightmare creatures anywhere in the desolate wasteland, but why was that? What made them so eager to avoid this place? Nephi's was walking in the front of the group, with Sonny right behind her. The Echo was in the rear, moving at a slow pace. He looked around and, after a bit of hesitation, said in a low voice, I don't like this. Nephi's glanced at him with her usual indifferent expression.
Turning away, she simply said, "Stay alert." They continued forward in silence, sand squeaking under their feet. A dozen or so minutes later, Changing Star raised her hand, gesturing them to stop. Turning to Sunny, she asked, "Has your shadow noticed anything?" He shook his head. "No, there are some irregularities here and there, like small knolls or shallow pits, but nothing is moving. Mostly it just seems flat and lifeless." He turned to Cassie and asked hesitantly, "Do you hear anything?" In some cases, her keen hearing was more effective than his shadow sense. When they were caught by the Strom, Cassie had been able to sense that something was wrong long before her seeing companions noticed anything. However, this time it was of no use. She simply shook her head, indicating that there were no unusual sounds around them. Nephi sighed and lowered her head, thinking. Then she cast a gaze at the distant ashen barrow. "Let's continue." However, she did change the direction of the group slightly, aiming to approach one of the knolls that Sunny had noticed. By the time they approached it, it was already noon. The sun was right above their heads, making their shadows small and shapeless. Sunny's own shadow had returned and was now hiding beneath his feet, looking like a formless blob of darkness. This time of day was its least favorite. Nephi summoned her sword and slowly approached the knoll, trying to determine its nature. There was nothing remarkable about it except for the fact that everything around was flat, and it was not. The knoll was about as tall as Sunny, somewhat oblong and covered in the same gray sand as the rest of the wasteland. It didn't seem dangerous, but there was no harm in checking. Well, most likely. Maybe it could provide them with some useful information. Just as Changing Star was about to stretch her hand and touch the surface of the knoll, Sunny's shadow suddenly noticed something moving in the distance, back at the edges of the labyrinth where they had come from. Acting on instinct, Sunny jumped toward the echo and hissed to Neff, "Hide." At the same time, he dismissed the hulking scavenger. Suddenly losing her mount, Cassie flung her hands up and fell. Catching her in the princess carry, Sunny darted toward the knoll and lowered himself to the ground, placing the blind girl between himself and crouching Nephi's. Changing Star put one hand on Cassie's shoulder and looked at him with a silent question in her eyes. "Danger." Sunny raised one hand with his palm open, telling her to wait. His shadow was already peeking from behind the knoll, carefully observing the source of the movement. Already some distance away, the dead walls of the labyrinth rose from the gray sand. Suddenly, one of them collapsed, knocked over by a massive figure. Surrounded by the cloud of ashen sand, the figure moved forward, stepping onto the flat surface of the wasteland. 8 legs, 2 terrifying bone scythes, black and crimson carapace that looked like ancient armor that had been splattered with blood, another centurion. Sunny silently cursed. He fought these monsters twice before, and won both times. However, that was because each battlefield had been carefully prepared to stack advantages in their favor, with plenty of planning and devious scheming on their part. He wasn't sure that they would be able to kill one in a direct confrontation, at least not without suffering serious damage. Turning to Nephi's, Sunny whispered. A carapace centurion had just walked out of the labyrinth. She scowled. Cassie meanwhile lightly touched his hand and asked, "Where is it heading?" Sunny blinked, then concentrated on the shadow's vision. Soon, he exhaled with some relief. "Looks like it's heading for the Ashen Barrow. If we stay hidden behind this knoll and it doesn't change course, there's a high chance that it won't notice us." Changing Star thought for a second and then nodded. "Keep an eye on it and tell me as soon as something changes." Trying to become as small and silent as possible, the 3 of them pressed their bodies to the knoll. There wasn't a lot of space to hide, so they had to endure being cramped against each other. Well, maybe endure was not the right word. Sunny might have even enjoyed the situation in other circumstances. "What are you thinking about, fool? Concentrate on the deadly monster," he thought angrily, berating himself. But it was so hard to concentrate with Cassie's soft body pressed against his. Deadly monster. Finally able to get his mind out of the gutter, Sunny sighed and focused on observing the centurion. The hulking creature was moving through the wasteland, slowly drawing closer. Soon, he was able to see every crimson line and every spike on its weathered carapace. However, his eyes were glued to something else. Cautiously held between the centurion's scythes, a beautiful crystal was gleaming with hypnotic inner light. It was bright and strangely alluring. A transcendent soul shard. He had already seen a similar scene, back when a pair of centurions were retrieving 2 of such crystals from the remains of the giant shark-like creature. So that was their destination. Sunny glanced at the magnificent tree standing atop the Ashen Barrow. With its onyx branches and vibrant scarlet leaves, it looked striking and majestic. Like something wholly hidden in the depths of hell. He shared his findings with the group, careful to keep his whisper as quiet as possible. The centurion was about to walk past their hiding spot. Despite the fact that there was some distance between its path and the knoll, Sunny was still nervous. This was the most dangerous moment. The monster came level with the knoll, then proceeded forward without blinking an eye. He exhaled. "It's walking toward the barrow." Nephi's did not relax, still ready for things to go south at any moment. Follow it.
Sunny nodded. A moment later, his shadow slid from behind the knoll, sneakily pursuing the nightmare creature. With how much the range of shadow control had improved, he was pretty sure of his ability to tail it to the footsteps of the ashen hill. The Centurion crossed the wasteland with the transcended shard clasped tightly between its sides. Its bearing was somewhat strange, seeming almost pious. It looked like a pilgrim walking toward a mysterious, sacred site. Soon it approached the ashen barrow and suddenly stopped, as though afraid to cross some invisible line. Then the Centurion carefully placed the shard on the sand and backed away from it, its eyes turned to the ground. After distancing itself from the gleaming crystal, the massive creature kneeled. Sunny had to rub his eyes to make sure that he wasn't seeing things. He wasn't. The carapace Centurion bent its 8 legs and lowered itself to the ground, submissively placing its terrifying sides in front of its bowing torso. Noticing Sunny's strange behavior, Nephi's raised an eyebrow.
What is it? He hesitated. Wait.
At this moment his shadow, which was safely hidden some distance away from the kneeling monster, noticed a slight change on the surface of the ashen barrow. The bright glimmer they had seen from the top of the Leviathan's spine was back, only this time it was even more blinding. The glimmer rose into the air from the shadows cast by the branches of the towering tree and moved, slowly approaching the footsteps of the hill. When Sunny was finally able to discern the source of the shining, his eyes widened. Feeling a cold shiver running down his spine, he forgot to breathe. Chapter 63, Lord of Ashes. Moving through the ashen sand and piles of fallen leaves, a giant monster was coming down the hill. Sunny gulped, his expression turning dark. The creature was as large as a house, with its 8 segmented legs resembling tall pillars. Its form was similar to that of scavengers and centurions, comprised of a crab-like carapace and a protruding, somewhat humanoid torso. However, this was where the similarities between them ended. Instead of chitin, the behemoth's shell was seemingly made out of polished, lustrous metal. It was as though its whole body had been once submerged into a crucible of molten steel, emerging from it encased in an impenetrable suit of shining armor. Beams of sunlight were reflecting from the chrome surface of the carapace, creating the bright glimmer Sunny had noticed. Massive but strangely elegant, the steel monster resembled a giant knight. Sunny was ready to swear that he had noticed the shapes of 7 stars carved into its chest. However, that knight was corrupted and evil. It radiated a sinister aura, like a demon summoned from hell to sow death and slaughter. The polished armor of the creature was covered with long, jagged spikes. Its humanoid torso had 4 mighty arms, 2 ending with powerful pincers, the other 2 with razor-sharp, terrifying sides. The demon's head was more pronounced than that of a scavenger and crowned with several tall, sharp horns. Its metal face was almost human-like, but simultaneously repulsively monstrous and bestial. Just looking at it made Sunny's skin crawl.
That thing is scary.
Whatever that creature was, its rank within the Carapace Legion was clearly higher than that of a centurion, not to mention of a lowly scavenger. It was the next step in their evolution. A general or a commander, perhaps. What were they called? Legates, praetorians. Holding his breath, Sunny watched as the Carapace demon descended from the ashen barrow. Stopping in front of the transcendent soul shard, it looked briefly at the kneeling centurion. The deadly awakened monster shrank under its gaze, as if terrified of the larger nightmare creature. Sunny knew how it felt, since he did the same when the behemoth's eyes had briefly glided past his shadow's hiding place. Not paying the centurion any attention, the Carapace demon picked up the gleaming crystal and turned around. Then, it unhurriedly returned to the shade of the giant tree's branches.
Sunny slowly exhaled. Sunny, what is happening?
He looked at Cassie, whose face was full of worry and curiosity. After hesitating for a little while, he said, "There's a new threat. Stay quiet a bit longer, I'll explain later." Back at the footsteps of the tall hill, the Carapace centurion was finally ready to stand up again. Sunny was in a dilemma. He had to follow the monster to make sure that it doesn't stumble on their hiding place on its way back to the labyrinth. However, he was also extremely curious to see what the Carapace demon was up to in its lair on the top of the ashen barrow. There was no time to think things through properly. Making a hasty decision, Sunny sent his shadow sliding over the gray sand. It masterfully avoided the Carapace centurion's eyes and was already climbing the tall hill a few seconds later. "One look, I'll just take one look." Hiding in the deep shade cast by the majestic tree's scarlet crown, the shadow glided up the slope and approached the place where the Carapace demon had disappeared from its sight. On top of the hill, the ground was covered with fallen leaves. The ashen barrow was indeed larger than any high natural feature they had encountered before, vast and spacious as an actual island. However, the traces left behind by the massive creature's pillar-like legs could be easily seen. They led the shadow to the center of the island, where the obsidian tree's enormous trunk was rising from the ground, with its broad roots stretching in all directions. The Carapace demon was standing beneath the tree, looking up at its lower branches. The transcendent shard was still clenched in its pincer. "What is it looking at?" Sunny made the shadow trace the creature's gaze and noticed several round, appetizing fruits hanging between the scarlet leaves. One of them looked especially ripe. Suddenly, the demon dropped the soul shard into the sand and, completely forgetting about it, raised its body. It stretched a pincer up and gently grasped the fruit, then pulled on it. Without any resistance, the fruit tore off the branch. Holding it as something fragile and extremely precious, the massive creature slowly lowered itself to the ground. Then it carefully brought the fruit to its mouth and took a small bite. It's eating fruits. This abomination is vegetarian. Bewildered and not quite sure of what he had just seen, Sonny had no choice but to command his shadow to leave and hurry to the base of the hill. The time was up, and if he wanted to catch up with the carapace centurion, he had to act with haste. Gliding over the fallen leaves, the shadow descended from the ashen barrow and flew back in the direction of the labyrinth, soon catching up with the retreating monster.
Phew.
Feeling a lot of relief, Sonny made sure that the centurion's route would not put him on the collision course with the knoll they had been hiding behind, and finally allowed himself to relax, slightly. He waited until the scythe-wielding monster was completely gone, before slowly rising back to his feet.
It's safe to come out now.
Nephi's and Cassie stood up, stretching and massaging their limbs. Suddenly remembering how tightly they were pressed against each other while hiding behind the knoll, Sonny just barely avoided turning red with embarrassment. That was a necessary measure. He was almost glad that the carapace demon had appeared at the perfect moment to take his thought away from that situation.
What happened?
Nephi's looked at him and raised an eyebrow. For once, her expression of indifference did not look very convincing. Sonny glanced at the not-so-distant ashen barrow and shivered. There's danger ahead. We need to return to the Bone Ridge. I'll explain everything once we're safe and sound back at the camp. She opened her mouth to say something, but then thought better of it and remained silent, simply giving him a nod. The trust they had built was enough for that much at least. Sonny summoned the echo, tied the golden rope around its torso, placed Cassie's makeshift saddle back on its carapace, and helped the blind girl climb to her seat. Picking up the saddlebags, he fixed them back onto the scavenger and took a step away. They were ready to go. Before that, however, Sonny had one more thing to do. Coming close to the knoll, he used his hands to brush the sand off its surface. Soon, the onyx-black surface was revealed beneath. It was the same exact color as the bark of the colossal tree growing from the center of the ashen barrow. The knoll was, in fact, just a small portion of one of the tree's giant roots, raised slightly above the ground in this part of the wasteland. Sonny looked around, trying to calculate the size of the sea of ash. Finally, he was starting to understand what had drained all life from the giant patch of the crimson labyrinth. Back inside the Bone Ridge, they were sitting around the fire. The delicious smell of roasting meat filled the air, making Sonny's stomach produce embarrassing sounds. However, it wasn't time to eat yet. He was in the middle of telling the girls about what he had seen. After the centurion kneeled, another carapace creature came from the top of the ashen barrow. Only this one was not one of those we had seen before. It was easily twice the size of the centurion, 6 or 7 meters tall. I can't even imagine how much it weighs. It looked like a moving house. Nephi's frowned, clearly not happy to know that there was such a behemoth barring their way. What's more, its carapace is not made of chitin. Instead, it looks like some strange metal alloy. I don't think we'll be able to cut through it. I also didn't notice any gaps in that monstrosity's armor, not even around the joints. Cassie gulped, turning her head to her friend. Changing Star, however, remained silent.
Sonny sighed.
In addition, that thing has 4 arms instead of the usual 2, a pair with pincers and a pair with scythes. They're even bigger than the centurion's. Its carapace is littered with spikes and it has long horns on its head. It also looks more human-like. It almost got a face, albeit an extremely ugly one. And its eyes, well, I think that it is more sentient than anything we had faced before. Nephi's was thoughtful. After a while, she said, "It is probably an awakened demon." Nightmare creatures with 1 soul core were called beasts. The ones with 2 cores were called monsters. 3 cores belonged to a class of creatures known as demons, with devils right above them with 4 cores. Sonny gave her a nod, indicating that he was in agreement with her conclusion. Or maybe a devil. In any case, I think we should avoid that scary bastard at all cost. Changing Star stared at him, tilting her head a little. For a minute or so, there was only silence. Sonny gritted his teeth, then sighed, then blinked a couple of times. Finally, he gave her a doomed, crooked smile. "Let me guess, you want to kill it."